Hello there, welcome to my channel. If you are new, please consider liking and subscribing. It will make me feel wonderful. If you do that, thanks. An Arrow to the Knee by NeonZangetsu Uzumaki. Naruto has been known for several things in his young life: heroism, bravery, strength, and last but certainly not least, attracting buxom young women to his bed. So when he finds himself mysteriously catapulted thousands of years into the future, you'd think he'd be able to adapt rather readily. No, there's just one problem. He can't speak English. I don't own anything, adios.
Y'all Tor Shul. A thunderous belch split the starry skies of Skyrim, followed by a cascade of otherworldly flame lighting up the night like a fireworks. A dragon, its scalers blacker than any shadow, its eyes the color of blood, swooped down from Bleak Falls Barrow, roaring its fury for all the world to hear. And the world trembled. Because this was no mere mindless lizard, nor was it intent upon equally senseless destruction. This was Alduin, firstborn son of Akatsuki, the World Eater. Men, even the mighty Nords, quivered at the mere mention of his name. Women and children whimpered in fear at his passing. Unfortunately, his latest prey, lest he actually begin to think of the creature in his stomach as a worthy adversary, was neither Nord nor was he a child. Rather, he was something else. Something that was proving rather difficult to digest, and fighting him every bit of the way down. Something he was beginning to regret having eaten. "Let me out of here, dragon breath." A furious snarl erupted deep within his bowels, punctuated by another blinding haze of agony. Alduin yowled in pained surprise as something struck his stomach from within, damaging his intestine. His wings skipped a beat, forcing him to drift down toward the ground lest he collapse. He shot a withering glare at his quivering gullet, still trembling from his victim's latest escape attempt. By Akatsuki, he was a stubborn one. Nearly 3 hours now the prey had been trapped in his stomach, and still, these struggles only seemed to grow stronger with each passing attic. "Be a good Jor and digest reasonably," he snarled at his own stomach as he beat his wings against the air and tried to regain his hover. Impudent mortal. He would be digested, and then this whole sordid affair would be over. His midday meal wasn't having any of it. Rasengan. Another bout of ear-splitting agony racked Alduin from tail to snout, sending the mighty World Eater to his knees. His forehead kissed the snow-covered ground as blow after blow resounded within his stomach, forcing him to bend double just to breathe. A groan snaked between his teeth. He never should have eaten that man. Had any been present to witness him, the almighty Alduin, suffering from an upset stomach, he would have roasted them where they stood. Thankfully none were present to witness his horrid state indigestion. None but himself. And he himself despised every minute of it. This had to be the first mortal to ever survive being swallowed whole, then be able to fight back from within his stomach. Having laid waste to the village of Helgen, interrupting what might have been a splendid execution, he'd happened upon a rather belligerent blonde wandering the wilds of Skyrim. His clothing tattered, his body bloodied, and his skin marred countless wounds. At first he hadn't taken any interest in the poor fool's plight, save for the incredible power he sensed within him. That was when he'd recognized those strange, colored vestments, attire he'd seen once before, centuries ago. It had been another time, ages ago. He had been younger back then, not quite a hapless hatchling, but neither was he the almighty terror he was now. Ages before the Nords had come to these shores, in a time many had all but forgotten. But not Alduin. The beings of that time had been called shinobi, and they had proved themselves to be a most troublesome lot. He'd tried to devour the world back then, but in the end he had failed, and was driven into forced slumber by senju hashirama for countless millennia. That had been such a long time ago. The shinobi were all but extinct. Therefore, one could imagine Alduin's surprise upon encountering the member of a long-deceased race, wandering the wastes of Skyrim looking, for lack of a better term, like he'd just come out of meat grinder. A brief conversation with him had confirmed the World Eater's suspicions, as did the language he spoke, flowing syllables that only he, Alduin, could understand. Naturally Alduin had eaten him. Swallowed the man whole. After all, he was the World Eater. Even he had to eat in shinobi, as he recalled from the time of the Shodem Hokage made most excellent meals. He hadn't cared how or whence the shinobi had gained access to this forsaken future, nor did he care. He had been hungry, and so, eaten him. And he'd given the matter a second thought, until now. "Let me out." Each word was punctuated by another blow, each stronger than the last. These, Alduin could resist. What he could not stand, however, was the sensation of teeth grinding against his innards, of his digestive tract being torn asunder, ripped apart, eaten. Eaten, Alduin lurched, his eyes bugging in shock, surprise, then anger. Cruel, unholy anger. Was this Jor? This mortal? Actually trying to devour him? To take his power for his own? Already he could feel it, the almighty, god-like strength that was his own. Slowly sapping from him like blood from a leech, before being absorbed by the mortal man in his stomach, growing stronger with each passing second. Finally Alduin he could take it no more. Very well, he snarled, his words dripping with derision. I release you. Alduin gagged his massive body doubling over, his mouth producing a horrid, wretched sound. Jaws of razor-sharp teeth opened wide, fangs capable of severing plated steel creaked open as one, divulging the contents of their stomach onto snowy ground of Bleak Falls Barrow with a mighty belch. The hapless prey was sent tumbling into the snow, body still steaming from the acid of the dragon's gullet, and lay still. For a moment, the whole of Skyrim seemed to hold her breath, and in that breath, Alduin dared to hope his prey had finally given up the ghost, and in doing so, scowling, he raised a talon overhead, prepared to crush his tormentor into a bloody pulp upon the frost-covered ground. You fought well, mortal. He commended the blonde's inert form. As a reward, I shall grant you a swift death before my power takes hold. Ba dump. A hand shot up from the snow and seized his claw at the last instant, stopping him from dealing the final blow. Alduin balked, muscles strained taut, but to no avail. What devilry was this? Try as he might, he could not bring his talons to move another inch, not even a centimeter towards the man's scarred neck. Dripping in a gout of green goop, the young man, covered in digestive fluids, gasped out of breath. His clothes, what little remained of them, were rags ruined by his stay in the dragon's stomach. Blue eyes fluttered open in a pained squint. Whiskered cheeks pinched in disgusted annoyance and aggravation. And then, as mortals often did, the jaw surprised Alduin. Still holding tight to the World Eater's claw, the nameless stranger drew himself up to his full, towering height and spat an unfamiliar curse. You, asshole, he gasped, chest heaving with exertion. I coulda died. Alduin leered down at the prey with his large, red eyes. He glared at him, this human, this mortal, who had withstood his thuum, emerged unscathed from the fires of his throat, from the acid of his stomach, and dared still to mock him thus. This was absurd. Ridiculous. He was the firstborn son of Akatosh. How then, could this mere mortal survive his wrath? His long neck and head swung over to look at the human, lips drawing back to expose razor-sharp teeth, a scowl of scorn. Who are you, boy? He rumbled the question, not in the tongue of Nords, nor in the language of Dova, but in the blonde's own tongue. Blasted Jor still had hold of his claw. Alduin tried to tug his talons free, but alas, the mortal was not so foolish as to release him. Covered in foul-smelling goop he might be, but he was certainly no fool. The whiskered blonde stared at him a moment, uncomprehending. He closed his eyes and blinked rapidly, his eyes fluttering open and shut with all the rapidity of a hummingbird's wingspan. Finally, he frowned, his lips pursed into a thin line. All right, I must be dreaming. The deadpan was barely concealed. Alduin arched a scaly eyebrow. Where was the harm in indulging him? Ow. What makes you think this is a dream, mortal? To his credit, the nameless blonde did not release him. 3 things. He held up the fingers of his free hand and began to count them off, one by one. First, it's not mortal. The name's is Naruto. Uzumaki Naruto. Second, I know there's no such things as dragons. Third, and even if dragons did exist, and they certainly don't talk. Is that so? Alduin lowered his head, his snout now mere inches from the blonde's visage. You seem to be out of your element then, little Jor. Faced with his fetid breath, the blonde frowned, a touch of uncertainty creeping into his tone. Why's that? For I am Alduin, the World Eater, Alduin snarled, the words booming deep and loud in his throat. And this is no dream, it is your end. Without another word, he drew back, reared his head, and spat. Tor shul. The blonde flung up his free hand with a shout, as though he could somehow ward off the inferno. Incredibly, he did. Even as he raised his arm, the flames parted around it like the Red Seas, refusing to harm him. Alduin blinked, frowned, and shouted once more, pouring every ounce of his being into the all-consuming destruction of his thuum. Yet again the shout flowed past Naruto, refusing to touch him, melting the snow at their feet but leaving him very much untouched all the same. Alduin snapped his jaw shut, flabbergasted. This did not bode well. See, the blonde nodded to himself, still unconvinced. This has to be a dream. You can't hurt me. For perhaps the first time since hatching, Alduin felt a very real touch of fear. The blonde had taken more of his power than he'd first thought. Not even the fires of his thuum could touch him. He very much doubted the blonde suffered from the same restriction. But that didn't mean he couldn't crush him to a bloody pulp. We shall see about that. Jor, Alduin's tail snaked out, lashing the ground between them, sweeping the blonde from his feet, forcing him to relinquish his hold upon the dragon's claw. Freed from the man's hold, the mighty World Eater beat his wings in an attempt to ascend. That attempt was cut painfully short as the Jor grabbed hold of his tail. Ordinarily, this wouldn't have impeded Alduin in the slightest. He would have simply shaken him off. But this Jor was strong where others were weak, mighty where Nords faltered. And try as he might beat his wings into flight, Alduin could not escape him. Alright, Naruto groaned, standing woodenly. Not a dream. If that's the case then. He dug his feet into the snowy soil and held fast, muscles bulging from the exertion. Alduin scowled down from his hover. "What now then, boy? Then I am the reification of mankind's anger." Sapphire snapped into slitted scintillating shade of scarlet, one the World Eater knew all too well. Those eyes reminded him of an old adversary, a creature nearly his equal in size and strength, but more than his match in terms of intelligence. Those eyes reminded him of a fox. Of Kurama. That blasted creature had injured him more times than he cared to count, and the thought of facing those eerie red eyes for a second time was met with some pause. For a moment, just a moment, Alduin hesitated. It cost him most dear. Aura. Movement. Alduin had just enough time to process it, to comprehend this before the battered blonde stepped forward and hurled him over his shoulder. Over his shoulder. The world blurred like never before as Alduin felt his feet leave the snow, claws dragging against the ground, then the drifts, then empty air as his massive form hurtled through the sky like a speeding arrow and slammed into Bleak Falls Barrow. The impact itself did not harm him in the conventional sense. Stone was no match for the protection afforded by Draken scales, but his pride had suffered a mortal blow nonetheless. To be thrown by a mortal. It was infuriating. Alduin levered himself up with a furious roar, eyes ablaze with fire and fury. He beat his wings furiously, buffeting the barrow with a mighty gust, scouring the snows from the ground. Enough. No more of this. He would entertain this foolishness no longer. He would not entertain this mortal any longer. With shriek that made the heavens themselves keevier, he erupted upwards, abandoning the ground for the safety and sanctity that the heavens offered. Palak Jor, he roared in his native tongue as he took to the skies. Hin ka fen kos bonar. Arrogant mortal. Your pride will be humbled. Naruto cocked his head, and to the dragon's disbelief, it appeared as though he actually understood him. Perhaps that snack in my stomach did more than just impart some of my power to him. Alduin mused with a bit of bitterness. He may yet be able to comprehend our language now. He remained aloft a moment longer, sneering down at this impotent mortal. Mighty though this Jor was, he could not fly, and he lacked a bow, with which to harm him and, oh. As Alduin looked on, the blonde proved himself to be full of surprises. He braced himself and offered a hand to the heavens. A strange, golden glow began to emanate from him, engulfing his body, to spread outward in a shroud of golden flame. That same energy coalesced within his palm, hissing and spitting in the epicenter of his hand, forming what, from this altitude, looked like a large, round discus of sorts. The World Eater could feel the energy within that strange shape tugging at him, trying to pull him downward. He fought it with all his might, his great leathery wings beating fiercely to maintain his elevation. What the devil did that Jor think he was doing? Rasenshuriken, by some instinct, Alduin chose to swerve to the left and ascend as the blonde brought his arm back to throw. Not a moment too soon. A blur of air whistled past where he'd been hovering only an instant before shrieking through the empty air to obliterate the peak of a nearby mountaintop, eviscerating all evidence that it had ever been there. An uneasy silence passed between them, man and dragon. In that silence, the latter begrudgingly acknowledged a wary respect to the former. Such power, well, the Jor had certainly surprised him with that one, but he would not have a second chance to do so. He understood now. This boy housed another entity, a being he loathed more than this world itself. The Jor housed Kurama, the source of this ungodly strength. Interesting. Get your ass down here, Scales, Naruto shouted up at him. I'm not done with you yet. And what will you do, puny mortal? Alduin scoffed down at him. Do you honestly expect to fight me? The mighty Alduin? Even with your tenant, you stand no chance? The blonde seemed to shudder then, a chill came over him. When next he spoke, his voice was no longer his own. Nay, those words, that tone could only belong to one creature. Alduin exhaled a furious hiss as he felt and recognized the presence of his old enemy. Kurama. Two souls, sharing one body. How amusing. Fight you? The blonde sneered. No, I want to kill you. I invite you to try the next time we meet, you foolish fox. Alduin scoffed as turned and began to soar away. Now was not that time. He would satiate his vengeance later when he was recovered, when these wounds inflicted upon his internal organs had healed. He trusted his regeneration to fuel the process and make his recovery a speedy one. And if he need devour a few lives to hasten it, then so be it. Then, and only then, well after he'd returned to his full strength, would he end this beleaguered boy and his arch-rival. Vengeance would be his. Naruto watched the black dragon disappear over the mountains, refusing to tear his gaze away until he was certain it was truly gone. Then, and only then, did he allow himself to collapse. Allow his body to topple back in a heap, allow the chakra cloak to dissipate from his body like so much mist. The snow was soft and cool against his back and the starry night sky lay there to greet him with open arms. But he did not sleep, although the temptation did haunt him. He was still trying to figure out why he was here. The last thing he Ruduama going off in front of the three of them, himself, Sasuke, and Minato. Then there was a great blackness, a terrible darkness, the sensation of falling. And now he was here, having just survived being swallowed whole by a dragon. A dragon whom he'd managed to throw over his shoulder and later drive off. That he was still alive was something of a miracle, in and of itself. Where the hell was here anyway? He had the succinct feeling he wasn't in the elemental nations anymore. His body ached for comfort and begged for warmth. These tattered rags did little to provide either in any case. It's been a while since I've seen that dragon, neither did Kurama. I take it the two of you know each other? You might say that. A couple thousand years ago. Say what? Naruto nearly lurched upright, only for the pain to force him back down. He was healing from the acid burns garnered in Alduin's stomach, but slowly. What little chakra he did have left was being used just to keep his mind in a semi-lucid state. Wounded as he was, his mind was nearly broken, warring between a tenuous grasp of sanity and a full grip on madness. Kurama's previous statement did precious little to shift the balance in the former's favor. Meaning, kid, I don't think we're in Kansas anymore. The fuck is Kansas? Naruto shivered, rubbing his bare shoulders in a vain attempt to warm himself. He needed to find some warmth, and fast, before frostbite set in. The sound of iron boots crunching against the snow drew Naruto's attention, as did the growing light of a torch. Someone was fast approaching. Having been attracted by the commotion, or having borne witness to his fierce fight with Alduin. Probably the latter. He craned his neck as a figure stepped out of the shadows. He couldn't make out much with all that iron armor and posed a question toward him. What in oblivion was that? They asked, trudging forward in his direction. Are you alright? Naruto blinked. Frowned. Did you get that? Kurama shook his head. Nope, didn't understand a word of it, so apparently. They don't speak our language. Lovely. Battered and beaten, the blonde slowly gingerly picked himself up off the snow and turned his head to regard the newcomer in the torchlight. One thought pushed itself to the forefront of his mind, one all-consuming, all-encompassing inkling that demanded attention above all else. And it would not be denied. Who in the nine hells are you? I'm sorry, I can't seem to understand you. Dovahkiin. Confusion and collusion. Nani mono da? Who in oblivion are you? Their questions hung in the air a moment longer, both parties frowning at each other in confusion. They hadn't understood a word the other had said. This posed a problem. They peered at one another in the torchlight, unable to understand each other, unable to comprehend the other. Again, this posed a problem. The newcomer shifted their torch to the opposite hand and reached up to remove their iron helm, exposing a young, heart-shaped face framed by long ebony tresses, from which eyes of startling jade shone. They rooted Naruto, pierced him, held him in place. It was nigh impossible not to stare at her, for this was most certainly a she. Visage, to gaze upon her fair skin and marvel at it. She was beautiful, in a strange, exotic way. He had no way of knowing that this woman was a Nord, nor that those green eyes and dark locks hid a sharp wit and a sharper tongue. Just as she had no way of knowing the sheer amount of power this battered blonde housed inside his body. Indeed, they knew nothing of the other, and were each left to make their own assumptions. Dear Kami, she's a looker. Now's not the time for that. Naruto mentally backhanded Kurama across the head. We can't even understand her, remember? Well, don't look now, but I think your new friend is about to take her head off. His only warning was a twitch of the woman's wrist, then he found the tip of an iron blade pressed against his throat. Adrenaline flooded his veins, and suddenly, he wasn't feeling all that cold anymore. His instincts gave an angry hiss of berations, chastising himself for making such a Janine mistake. She'd never have been able to draw on him if he weren't so damnably tuckered out from his tussle with Alduin. I won't say it again. She frowned, interpreting his silence as defiance. Who are you, friend or foe? Oi, there's no need for that URK. His words ended in a strangled grunt as she pressed the sword closer, its tip pressing against his neck. Will you stop talking like that? She hissed. Speak English, man. The hell is she saying? Try as he might, Naruto still couldn't understand a word out of her mouth. Neither could she, apparently. But if she thought she could threaten him with this flimsy piece of iron, well. She had another thing coming. He made a show of grunting and raising his hands. Her eyes made the mistake of tracking with the motion. That was when he struck. Naruto leaned backwards, lashed out with his free hand and drove his knuckles into the flat of the blade, sending the sword sailing skyward, knocking it from her hand. He reached up in the same instant, his fingers wrapping around both hilt and handle, bringing it to bear before the woman even realized she'd lost her weapon. Now it was she who found herself facing the business end of the blade, its tip drawing thin rivulets of blood from her throat. All but an instant passed between them. In that moment, he thought she'd try and lunge at him. Slowly, with a force of will, she stilled herself. He watched a wary respect dawn in those jade eyes of hers. That much he could understand. Baka. Naruto chided, the words dripping with thinly veiled amusement. You really don't have any skill with this thing, do you? In that case, you won't be needing it. He raised it high and prepared to break the blade over his knee, ready to rid her of this pitiful excuse of a weapon. His desire must have been blatantly obvious, because the raven-haired lass shouted something that sounded like an obscenity at him. Hey! Naruto had just enough time to witness the strange sight of sparks crackling between the woman's fingertips. Then they struck him, scrawling over his flesh like a thing alive. Yow! Pain jolted up and down his spine like wildfire, locking up his muscles, sending his body into agonizing spasms of epileptic seizures. The shock lasted only for an instant, but it might as well have been an eternity. For a terrifying beat, he couldn't call upon his chakra, couldn't use any of his techniques. For the span of a hair's breadth, he was as powerless as a newborn babe. Then the electricity was gone and the power came roaring back. So did the anger. Why you little, he rounded on her with a hiss, sword in hand. And brought the pommel crashing down on her head, bludgeoning her like a mace. Looking back, Naruto would wonder at this course of action for years to come. In that instant he could have easily severed her head from her shoulders. Instead he'd chosen to smack her over the head. Why had he done that? The answer would not be known to him for nearly a decade. Scowling, he took one last look at his still numbed fingers and turned to survey his work. The woman had cried out like a struck puppy when he'd struck her. Now she was cradling her head, whimpering from the unexpected blow to her cranium. Naruto almost felt sorry for her. Honestly, he forgot just how hard he could hit sometimes. One look at the sword told him it could never be used again. He'd all but shattered the hilt from the strength of his strike. Now he was left gripping little more than an inch of the hand, a shadow of its former self. As if on cue, the fair-skinned lass chose that moment to cry out. You bastard! She raised her head and glared at him, angry tears brimming in her eyes. I was only trying to get my sword back, you didn't have to beat me over the head with it. And look at that, you broke it, too. Despite the language barrier, even he could surely tell she was distraught over the loss of her weapon. He could understand that much. What he couldn't understand, however, was why. Surely, there were far better swords in this world than that rusted piece of crap. But that wasn't what riled him, nor what got under his skin. What truly piqued his aggravation was the succinct feeling that he was being insulted. What the hell was that, you crazy witch? He snapped back, you just electrocuted me. Now, the woman didn't need to speak Japanese to know she'd just been insulted. If the coloring of her face was any indication, she drew herself back and rubbed the fingers of her free hand together, producing a stray spark between them. Naruto recognized the motion and immediately drew backwards, the chakra shroud boiling around him, ready to ward off whatever strange ability she was wielding. Oh no you don't. Remarkably, the armored lass didn't attack. Instead she lowered her hands and stared at him, openly gawping at his now glowing, golden form. This wouldn't be the first time someone had been startled by his newfound appearance, he mused to himself. She stepped forward to inspect him, her green eyes wide with wonder. Then they narrowed, as if remembering that she was supposed to be angry with Hai. Ahem. She held out a hand for the blade in silent demand. Naruto reluctantly picked it up and proffered it back to her, shattered pommel first. She snatched it out of his hand, glaring bloody red daggers at him. Naruto offered a sheepish shrug in lieu of an apology. She probably wouldn't have understood him anyway. Am I Ra-Bell? She enunciated the name slowly, indicated herself with some exasperation, then looked to him expectantly. Ah, he understood. Naruto, he replied. She nodded, apparently satisfied. Naruto. The blonde permitted himself a small smile, at least he didn't have to call her a witch now. He gestured slowly, indicating the sky, flapping his arms like wings. She stared at him for a moment before comprehension dawned. You mean there was a dragon here? He caught the word dragon. Thank Kami, that word was the same in their language, and finally felt as though he'd made a breakthrough. It was only one word, but hey, it was a start after all. She pointed to the skies and mimed his earlier charade to get her point across. Yes. Naruto nodded emphatically. Now we are finally getting somewhere. Morrible said something else, and pointed at him. Or not. Kurama's deadpan was barely concealed. No. Naruto facepalmed. So sudden wind swept through the barrow, reminding him of the chill. Now he remembered the cold. His massive adrenaline rush had since worn off, leaving his body to try and ward off the cold as best it knew how, shivering. Look, I still can't understand a word you're saying, but you've got to be freezing in those rags. Here. Sighing, the woman sheathed her sword and dipped a hand into the satchel at her back. Naruto watched her for a long, tenuous moment, half expecting her to whip out the sword and try to take his head off again. When she did not, he allowed himself to relax, albeit minutely, extracted some clothes from her pack. They proved to be a surprisingly full set of fur armor. Naruto frowned. She pressed them into his hands in an unspoken demand. Take it. He considered her offer a moment longer. Well, they were certainly better than the tattered rags he was wearing at present. Yosh. Naruto disrobed rapidly, first removing the frozen remnants of his shirt, then stripping off the tattered orange-black rags of his pants, leaving him clad in his undergarments. A soft squeak of surprise diverted him from donning the fur armor, returning his attention to the Nord woman who'd first given him the attire. What the devil are you doing? Mirabelle's words were nothing but gibberish, but the flush on the girl's face was unmistakable. She thrust a finger toward a nearby outcropping imperiously, her intentions obvious. "Go dress over there," Naruto would have laughed if he hadn't been freezing his balls off. Grumbling to himself, he strode behind the bulky arch and slowly, clumsily began to don the armor. It was light, for which he was immensely grateful, but at the same time it was also warm, thank Kami, and offered much more protection from the cold. He half turned to offer Morrible his thanks. That was when he saw her starting toward Bleak Falls Barrow. There was an old, determined gleam in her eye, something that said she was going in there, with or without him. Oh well. He shrugged. Not my problem, oh bugger. She turned towards him, beckoning him to follow. Come on. She waved. Helping me recover the Dragonstone is the least you can do after breaking my blade. Naruto didn't understand a word of that, but he did know she wanted him to follow. He took one look at the barrow and gulped. It felt wrong. Tainted. There were probably ghosts in there. Undead, at the least. And she wanted him to go in there? Oh no, hell no. He shook his head, but Morrible would not be denied. She continued to wave him on, and it was with reluctant steps that he found himself following. Try as he might, he simply could not bring himself to let his newfound acquaintance enter the barrow alone. As if sensing his thoughts, Morrible beamed at him. Here. She offered him an iron dagger. Use this to protect yourself. Naruto took a glance at the dagger, then one last look outside and gulped. I have a bad feeling about this. Together, they descended into the darkness. And there you have it, not my best take on the world of Skyrim, I know, but it is my first. And definitely one of the most amusing. I almost feel bad for Naruto and the Dovahkiin, they cannot even begin to understand one another, and already they have a sibling-esque relationship. Naruto breaks her sword, she uses a bit of magicka to give him a good zap. In case anyone is interested, I took the design of this dragonborn from a dear old friend of mine, who sadly no longer plays Skyrim. I had to change the name, though. Honestly, who names their female Nord to be Morrigan? It's not Dragon Age lol. It was either going to be Morrible or Isabelle, and in the end, by popular vote, the former won out. Also, for anyone who may wonder, I will be including the events of Dawnguard in this tale. I'm not quite certain about the Dragonborn DLC, as I've only just started to play it, but who knows? Chaos is set to ensue next chapter once our unlikely duo return to Whiterun, and Naruto gets to meet a certain huntress. I hope you're looking forward to it as much as I am. So, in the immortal words Atlas. Review, would you kindly? And enjoy this partial preview. We have two scenes contained within. In the first we get to meet a certain huntress. In the second, we see just how Naruto can fare against a dragon. Preview, Ayla cocked her head aside, intrigue shining in her eyes as she beheld the newcomer. The whelp Morrible, was it, had mentioned she'd be bringing a friend of hers by to join the companions. To be honest, she hadn't been expecting much. Everything changed the moment she laid eyes upon him. She took him in at an instant, blonde hair, rough bangs hanging over blue eyes and whiskered cheeks, a confident gait to each step. Ayla inhaled deeply, drinking in his scent. He smelled like an alpha. Naruto drew in a deep, ragged breath, and let the power flow. Rawr! Ayla's head snapped back and forth like a puppet's, severed from its strings. By Izmir. Golden light engulfed the blonde, warping his form into something massive. Monstrous. 9 tails of pure nascent energy sprouted from his back and flayed the earth to ribbons. Naruto, Kurama cannoned forward, slamming into the dragon like a freight train. Jaws of pure, coalescent energy closed around the beast's neck and proceeded to shake it like a rag doll. I like this one. Plenty of spirit. Ayla. Draugr, shinobi, and dragons. Oh my, fuck all kinds of duck, uchiki waffles. Naruto was spouting all sorts of incoherent gibberish as he set about himself with his knife, frantically hacking and slashing at any Draugr in sight. Undead? Why did it have to be undead? He should have known better than to follow Isabelle inside, but no, he just had to be the gentleman. And what did he have to show for it? A couple of dead bandits. Some nonsense about a golden claw. And hordes of the one thing he feared and loathed more than even Ghost or Ghoul or even Sakura Haruno. Undead. There were dozens of the things, dead, shambling bodies bearing axes and bows and swords and hammers. All manner of implements made for crushing skulls and piercing flesh. To say that they were less than pleased by their intrusion into the barrow was like calling the sky blue, or blood red. He had no way of knowing that these poor creatures were called Draugr, just as the Draugr themselves had no inclination of the complete and utter terror they inspired in him. R.O. Naruto shuddered as one of those damned things rumbled something in its odd, guttural language and came shambling towards him. Under normal circumstances, it wouldn't have been much of a threat, even with that big ol' axe hefted in both hands. But these circumstances were far from normal. Naruto couldn't think straight to use his ninjutsu or senjutsu, such was his mind gripped with paralyzing fear. Try as he might, he simply couldn't bring himself to call upon his many powers to crush these creatures back into oblivion. One of the things grabbed him from behind, its dead, pallid fingers brushing the blonde's cheek. It growled at him in its ancient, garbled language, its damp and fetid breath bristling against the nape of his neck. Naruto shrieked and bucked backwards, the back of his head caving in the nose of the desiccated draugr. It might have been a woman, once before his knife tore the creature's head from its shoulders. Even without his chakra he was more than a match for these. Oh god, here they came again. I hate the future. Naruto wailed as he lopped a draugr's head off. We didn't have any of these damn things in the past. No, you just hate ghosts, Kurama cackled, thoroughly enjoying every instant of his host's terror. And I'm fairly certain we did. You just weren't looking hard enough. I'm starting to hate you, too. Isabelle might have laughed at her partner's plight had not she herself been surrounded by legions of the undead. Damned draugr. The creatures had come swarming out of nowhere. They'd set foot in the barrow, bursting from their coffins to attack them on sight. But though she was without her sword, she was not without weapons. Flames flared from her fingertips. That brief visit to the College of Winterhold was certainly paying off now, wasn't it? Erupting from her palms in a fierce gout of fire, driving the creatures back in droves. Naruto turned to balk at this suddenly pyrokinetic display and nearly lost his head as a war axe whistled past his cheek. The draugr loosed a throaty rumble deep within its chest. It almost sounded as though it were laughing. Naruto didn't take kindly to that. Bakayuru, he roared, whirling to bury the iron dagger in the thing's skull. Konohagakure. He gave the weapon a savage twist, and Isabelle winced as she heard something snap from the violent motion. She knew it wasn't Naruto's wrist, and it certainly didn't sound like succinctive squishing sound of the draugr's brain liquefying in its skull. Snick. Well, shit. Naruto gawped at the broken handle a moment longer, then he hurtled it at the offending draugr like a missile. The handle only slowed the undead a single step, but it was enough. In the time it took for the mummified creature to stumble backwards, the shinobi clapped a hand to either wrist, touching the symbols hidden beneath his fur-covered sleeves. Chakra flowed through his veins, burning inside him like a fierce and furious flare as he closed his eyes and dipped into his mind, into the storage space that he'd never thought he'd have to use. Kachiyose no jutsu. There came a plume of smoke, momentarily blinding Isabelle with its steam and intensity. When it cleared, she found the blonde wasn't quite so unarmed as she'd first thought him to be. Quite the opposite, actually. He was bristling with all sorts of wicked weaponry, the like of which she'd never known. Knives glittered between clenched knuckles, 3 for each hand, 6 in total. A 7th was clutched between gritted teeth. A pair of long swords, katana, hung at his waist, but even they paled in comparison to the crimson cloak slung over his shoulders and the enscroll dangling at the small of his back. Aha, he cried, delighted with himself. I can still use some. Isabelle was baffled by the display. Utterly baffled. Despite the veritable armor he now bore, and those twin blades, Naruto made no move to make use of either of them, and even had he done so, she probably wouldn't have noticed in any case. Nay, her gaze was fixed elsewhere. Not on this seemingly magic display of some weapons from the beyond, nor the crimson cloak, or even the scroll at his back. It was the eyes. No longer were his irises that sweet shade of sapphire with which he'd come to identify him. They were a startling shade of saffron. He turned to look at her, and she saw that his pupils were inverted within a strange rectangular shape, his lids crested with eerie orange powder. There was something incredibly soothing about his gaze just then. She found herself half expecting him to walk over, drop the knives, and pat her on the back for her hard work. Naruto didn't do that, either. Instead he let fly with each of the knives, each coated in a seemingly invisible current of wind. Most Nords wouldn't even have noticed such a thing. Even Isabelle, with her magical prowess, was hard-pressed to find the difference. Indeed, had she not been looking for something very much like it, she wouldn't have noticed at all. But she was looking for something, anything, and so she did notice. Saw those wind-propelled knives pierce draugr by the scores, exploding out the back of their heads to drop them like so many dead flies upon the floor of Bleak Falls Barrow. Well, Isabelle blinked. That's certainly different. There was no way of knowing whether or not the belligerent blonde understood her. He simply set to work on the enemy's left flank, leaving Isabelle to contend with a draugr on her right. She rubbed the fingers of her left hand together, and a restless draugr found its wiry muscles coated with frost mere moments before another of Naruto's knives found its mark in the creature's skull. It dropped its axe with a clatter of steel and she snatched it up, her eyes darting this way and that, searching for her next opponent. There, a blur of motion registered in her peripherals and she whirled to greet it. Oi! A hand closed around her wrist like a vice, locking the limb in place. Its owner squeezed down on her wrist with gusto and impossibly, she felt pain within the iron gauntlet. The metal bent before his fingertips, bit down upon her wrist and into her grip, forcing the axe to fall from her grasp. Then she felt something very sharp prickling against her neck and jugular. When did he? Unwilling to move her neck and risk losing her head, Isabelle's eyes flicked southward. Despite her best efforts she froze, alarmed to find the business end of Blonde's knife pricking her throat. The only unarmored place on her body. Fast. She hadn't even seen him move. Fear of Draugr aside, this man was a warrior. Just like her father, may his soul live forever, and Sovngarde had been before that blasted rot finally took him from her. No one else could move with such speed and dexterity. But this man was not her father. He was an accomplished fighter, possibly even a mage more than capable of holding his own against countless opponents. And those eyes of his, not to mention, down girl. Isabel herself when her mind began to wander. As any Nord woman, she respected strength and skill, and while she did not share her kinfolk's distaste of magic, she knew this much. Naruto had strength and skill in spades. Perhaps even an inclination to magic, after what she'd just witnessed. And he was attractive, in a strange, foreign way. The thought made Isabel shiver. She'd always had magic in her blood. It came from her mother. Father never spoke much of her, he'd only ever mentioned she'd been a mage at the College of Winterhold and that she had inherited her propensity towards magic from her mother. Isabel didn't entertain the possibility of ever meeting her. She'd simply disappeared one day when she was young. Father had never been bitter about the matter. And Isabel had never wanted for a mother, never thought about it, the woman who had abandoned her. Until now. Since losing father last year to the rot, she hadn't had much time for such thoughts. After his untimely demise, she'd stayed at the homestead just long enough to bury him, then she was gone. Wandering across Tamriel for a time, making her bit of a living as a sellsword, offering her talents to any who had the coin. Ulfuric Stormcloak had paid rather well even if she didn't entirely support his cause, so she'd served under his banner for a time. Her only thoughts being of whom and how she would kill and when she'd earn her next meal. Then came that imperial ambush on the border. They'd walked right into it, and even her propensity for magic hadn't been able to save them. A blow to the head had driven her under, and when next she'd woke, they were on their way to Helgen. To the headsman's axe, nearly losing your head on a chopping block was enough to make one rethink their life. If not for that dragon attack, she probably wouldn't be standing here now. Having barely escaped Helgen with her life thanks to Hadvar, an imperial soldier, Isabel had resolved to turn her life around. No longer would she be a mere sellsword, serving the whims of others. She would find her own way, seek honor and glory, maybe even kill a dragon or two, but never again would she be a prisoner, forced to feel the cold sting of steel against her throat. Never again. Now here she stood, finding her mind drifting between thoughts of her past and this enigmatic blonde towering over her. She could feel her heart hammering in her chest, the cold chill of death trickling down the nape of her neck much like the blade upon her throat. Was this it, then? Was this where she would die? Never to see her mother? Be able to see her mother again, it was not an unpleasant thought. Just who are you, Naruto? She wondered aloud. The question escaped her lips before she could take it back. Those strange, golden eyes peered down at Isabel for what felt like an eternity to the Nord. They were cold, calculating, but not comprehending. The language barrier still stood firmly between the two of them. Naruto cocked his head aside and truly looked at her for the first time since they met. Isabel returned his stare, her emerald gaze boring right back into his own. Naruto was a good head taller than her, and she couldn't help but feel a tad intimidated as she stared into those saffron orbs. He still hadn't let go of her hand, either. He seemed to be studying it, or rather, the ruined iron glove she still wore. Slowly, he peeled the crushed gauntlet off her hand and cast it aside. She wouldn't be wearing that anymore, Isabel realized. But her mind was elsewhere. Bereft of the gauntlet, her fingers were free to feel his. Touch his roughened palm against hers. By Izmir, he had big hands. They made hers look tiny. She marveled at them. The rough calluses told her so much, and yet so very little. Here was a man, who'd used his hands all of his life. Here was a warrior, not some pansy milk drinker who couldn't swing a blade to save his life. Then Naruto surprised her. He murmured something, took her hand in his and raised it to his lips, delivering a soft kiss upon her knuckles. Isabel felt her cheeks flush 6 different shades of scarlet beneath her war paint. What in oblivion did this man think he was doing? She was not some wench to be wooed, certainly not at knife point. She jerked her hand away and fought the urge to slap him. Something told her that would be a very bad idea, what with the knife pressed against her throat and whatnot. It didn't prevent her from snapping at him, however. "Hands off, bastard," she hissed. "Do that again and I'll kill you." Naruto blinked in surprise, but he didn't have that stung expression Isabel had expected. Great. She mentally smacked herself. First interesting man I meet, and he can't even understand me. That was when she finally realized they were alone in the crypt. Scores of bodies lay at their feet, many more than she would have been able to eradicate on her own. There was a silence between them hanging over their heads like the headsman's axe had Isabel's in Helgen. Then the shinobi laughed aloud, lowered his knife, and clasped her heartily upon the back, the blow ringing solidly within her iron armor. "Deijobu, Ona." He chuckled as turned away, to begin picking the Draugr clean of their valuables. It was almost ironic, really. Whatever fear Naruto had of them while they were living certainly didn't prevent him from picking their corpses clean them while they were dead. Isabel stared after him a moment longer, finally recognized the display of camaraderie for what it was and moved to join him, the smallest of smiles dancing upon her lips. Flirtatious behavior aside. Perhaps they'd get along after all. Dozens of draugr and a giant spider later, they found themselves confronted by the wall. It bore a series of symbols etched into its surface, each representing a creature of sorts. It was a maddening puzzle, one which they'd yet to solve. Naruto didn't seem all that interested in it, but Isabelle was fascinated by it all the same. There had to be centuries of history hidden here, and she was the first to lay eyes upon it in an age. Had her ancestors walked these very steps, examined these very walls, she could only ponder the question in silence. Now, what do we do with you? Isabelle turned the golden claw over in her hands, studying the symbols etched into its surface as Naruto examined the walls of the crypt. There must be a purpose for this thing, she told herself. There must be. They'd stolen it off the corpse of a Dunmer. Arvel the swift, earlier ungrateful bastard, trying to kill them after they'd killed that spider, not to mention gone to the bother of cutting him down from its web, leaving the later to die at the hands of a shocked, but no less skillful Naruto. Apparently the man had never seen a dark elf before. Shock hadn't stayed his hand when the elf turned on them, however he'd swiftly found himself a kunai in the gut for his efforts. Naruto's skill with those things was truly unrivaled at times. Perhaps he could teach her sometime? One glance back at the blonde swiftly dissuaded her of the notion. His attention was obviously elsewhere, and besides, he could barely understand her even at the best of times. Even now Isabelle could hear him muttering to himself, apparently unable to get over meeting and killing what he doubtlessly believed to be a foreign and alien creature. Those blood-red eyes and ash-gray skin must have truly unnerved him. But to think, he'd never seen a dark elf. Oh, he was going to love Iruliet then. More and more, however, she was coming to believe this stranger wasn't from Skyrim. Perhaps he hailed from another, more distant land. If so, then that begged the question. Where was he from? Isabelle returned her attention to the golden claw, frowning at it, and the slit-like grooves in the wall. Wait a moment. She glanced at the symbols etched into the claw. Back to the wall. Back to the symbols again. That was too much of a coincidence. Slowly, tentatively, she placed the claw against the grooves, slotted it in. It fit perfectly, but the wall didn't budge. Maybe it had the symbols? Perhaps, Aura, by shore. What are you doing? Her words ended in a disbelieving shout as Naruto, wreathed in that golden cloak of his, lunged past her and slammed a clenched fist into the wall. Nothing happened. Then, much to her complete consternation, the blonde stepped forward and flicked the immovable wall with his little finger. Bakrang. A dull whump answered his retort, and with a mighty rumble, the spinning circles came apart, crumbling away to reveal the sprawling cavern lying just beyond. Naruto flashed her a triumphant "told you so" grin and started forward, up the steps and into the cavern. Isabelle frowned. Seriously, she returned the golden claw to her pack, still had to return it to Riverwood, after all, and followed after him, shaking her head. Men, they truly had no appreciation for the intricacy of puzzles. They soon found themselves in a wide, sprawling cavern, backed by a strange-looking wall, a coffin, and a chest. Bats fluttered past, sending the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. Nasty creatures. Isabelle absolutely loathed them, but she made no show of her fear, lest Naruto note it and mock her incessantly for it. Not that she'd be able to understand him, but still, she risked a glance back at the blonde as they climbed the steps leading to the coffin, her palms open and splayed, ready to produce a torrent of flames if need be. To her delight, she found a steel sword in the chest. She waved it at Naruto, but the blonde seemed preoccupied, his attention riveted upon the strange wall and its many carvings. He stepped toward it, then jerked back as if he'd been stung. He touched a hand to his head, hissing in pain, muttering beneath his breath. He spat what might have been an expletive and flung a knife at the wall. It rebounded harmlessly off the smooth stone and skittered out of sight into the darkness. Teme, he was hissing to himself in pained murmurs, his words fractured, incoherent. Isabelle likewise felt herself drawn to the wall, pulled in by the sight of that single, gleaming word. Dovahkiin. She felt a voice calling to her, pounding in her head like the drums of a great hunt, out for her blood. Closer she came, and brighter still the word grew, its radiance a blinding haze at the forefront of her mind. Dovahkiin. The voice was stronger, more insistent this time, demanding. Isabelle knew not what the word meant, nor what this voice wanted, only that she couldn't bring herself to tear her gaze away. Dovahkiin, and then the presence was simply there, rising, swelling in her soul. At long last you have come, Dovahkiin. The wall spoke to her in ancient tongue, rough and guttural, pregnant with expectancy, then confusion. No. Two Dovahkiin. Ah, yes. Dragonborn and Dragonbane. One to devour the soul. Another, the flesh as well. Yes. Guard well one another, little Dov, or all will be lost to the World Eater. And remember well this word. Foos. Isabelle's mind recoiled violently from the foreign presence just as a touch of knowledge for Bly imparted itself upon her. Foos. The word branded itself upon her brain in its ancient tongue, refusing to be forgotten. She knew not its meaning nor its purpose, only that it was imprinted upon her. She suddenly realized she knew what the wall had meant when it had called her Dovahkiin. Dragonborn. Every true Nord knew of it. The legend of the Dragonborn. It was supposed to be just that, though. A legend. Naruto looked as though he too had suffered from his earlier exposure to the wall, though whether or not he'd heard the voice remained to be seen. Daijobu? He mumbled at her. Isabel was swiftly coming to associate the word, Daijobu, with, are you alright, the more often she heard it. Teeth gritted, she managed a nod. Naruto seemed satisfied enough to take his gaze away from her. HNNH. Isabel stood woodenly, not taking enough care. What was that just now? And now that it was finally over, where was the Dragonstone? She saw no sign of it anywhere in the cavern. Perhaps they'd passed it? No, that couldn't be right. It had to be somewhere in here, anywhere. Naruto was frowning intently at the nearby coffin, as though he somehow expected the lid to pop open at any moment. Warily, he poked it with the dagger, ready for the worst. The coffin didn't so much as twitch. Naruto gave a grunt of annoyance and poked it again. Still nothing. Seemingly satisfied by its apparent inertness, the blonde turned his back on it and resumed his study of the cavern. Isabel thought it would be incredibly funny if the coffin's denizen did pop the lid open just now, just for kicks. And as luck would have it, the Draugr seemed to agree with her. Jesus mother! Naruto yelped as though he'd been scalded when the coffin's lid exploded from its hinges to slam into his back, knocking him to the floor in a heap of arms and legs. He was up again in an instant, spitting obscenities in that strange foreign language of his sword rising to meet the Draugr's war axe before it could cleave from his shoulders. The honed blade proved more than a match for the brittle war axe. Its deadly edge bit into the ancient steel and cleaved up and through the undead's weapon, leaving it wielding little more than a ragged stump. The Draugr tossed its ruined weapon aside and spat at him. Naruto threw down his sword and charged the now weaponless Deathlord, cannoning into the startled undead. They scuffled for a moment, living and dead, but in the end it was the former who gained the advantage and proved his strength and superiority. Get off! Naruto bodily heaved the Draugr Deathlord over his shoulder in a violent judo throw, slamming its wiry body into the ground with enough force to splinter the stone. Even as Isabel looked on, the shinobi raised a hand, fingers clenched into a claw. For a split second the Dragonborn to be thought the berserk blonde was actually going to thrust a hand through its gut. Then she saw it, the spiraling sphere swirling into his hand, shrieking with untold fury. She had less than an instant to comprehend it before he smashed the sphere down into the Draugr's gut. Eat Rasengan, bitch. The creature uttered a final, gurgling gasp and then it was gone, obliterated beneath the eldritch forces powering the Rasengan, dreadlight fading from its eyes as its skull, then the rest of its withered body. Something flopped away from its corpses, thudding heavily against the ground. Something large. That was it. Isabel gave a delighted cry and pounced upon it, hoisting high the tablet of stone. It was heavy, but at the same time the weight was almost worth it. Having braved scores of Draugr traps and maddening puzzles, her prize was at last in hand. And it was heavy. Naruto didn't share her enthusiasm. It looked like a boring old piece of rock to him. Why was it so important? We went through all that trouble for this. Weird. His head was still ringing from the voice's intrusion, still wondering what all this Dragonborn nonsense was about. He blinked to find the Nord tugging his arm. What you want? She tried handing him the Dragonstone. Oh no you don't. He promptly pushed it back into her hands. He wanted no part of carrying this rock. I'm not carrying that for you. Come on now, you're a man, aren't you? She thrust it at him imperiously. You're supposed to carry the heavy stuff. Naruto replied, crossing his arms and scowling. I refuse. Please. Realizing conventional tactics wouldn't work against someone as stubborn as this, Isabel resorted to the unorthodox. Her considerable feminine wiles. She feigned distress and batted her eyelashes at the blonde, removing her helm to give him full view of her visage. Naruto refused to be swayed. He'd bedded so many women back in Konoha that he'd lost count. Puppy eyes such as these no longer affected him. She didn't know that, however, and her attempts to deter him were almost laughable. No, he would not budge. Even if she was pretty damn cute. Chigao. He shook his head emphatically, more to the thought budding in the back of Hred Nord standing before him. Sure, damn you, take the damn thing already. When she tried to give it to him again, Naruto simply stepped backwards and let the stone fall right through his hands. It fell upon the floor with an ear-splitting crack, a wide fissure spreading across it all too quickly. The finger-pointing started. This is all your fault, Watashi? Naruto roared in surprise. He knew she was accusing him. Yes, you. Isabel snapped back, standing on her tiptoes to full effect. Teme, don't give me that look, Baka-onna. What did you just call me? The blonde grinned, turned on his heel and slowly enunciated the word as they exited the cavern. Baka-R. Their argument continued well into the night. They were still bickering long after they'd left Bleak Falls Barrow behind. Naruto had this much to say for Tamriel: it was beautiful. Words alone could not hope to describe the sprawling countryside laid out before him. Although he'd already seen it once before, he'd been weak and feverish then, unable to truly comprehend the majestic mountains in the distance, the great towering oaks of the forest looming over their heads through which the sun did peek its head, the plentiful wildlife. And the wolves. Did he mention the wolves? Oh yes, wolves. Apparently, in her infinite wisdom, or perhaps she was just still sulking, Isabel hadn't seen fit to warn him of the packs roaming the hills until they'd wandered upon them by accident. Now he knew. Skyrim had an overabundance of the things, and they were always hungry for food. Animal or otherwise. Naruto didn't fault them their actions. Far from it. After all, the wolves were only animals. They didn't know any better. That didn't mean he enjoyed being gnawed on, mind you. They, on the other hand, made for an excellent meal, however. He'd been forced to live off the land once during a long-term mission, forced to scrounge up whatever food could be found. As chance would have it, he'd acquired a taste for wolf meat by the end of that mission. Now he found himself wondering if this feral creatures tasted better than they're no stranger to skinning an animal. Naruto soon made a meal out of the next wolf. A quick kaiden jutsu made for an excellent roast to chew on as they walked. By the time they reached the walls of Whiterun, he found his fur armor crusting with dried blood, bandit, animal, or otherwise. He could himself in desperate need of a shower, or perhaps a bath. Something told him that the people of this era didn't use the latter. He was almost tempted to plunge himself into a nearby stream, just to see Isabel's reaction. She certainly didn't like seeing him naked now, did she? Trying to think about that only exacerbated his headache. He still wasn't sure where his feelings lay for this equally strange woman. One moment they were working together in flawless tandem, the next, they're at each other's throats. It was maddening. A very large part of him longed more than anything to peel her out of that insufferable iron armor and bang her until her eyes rolled back. The other half, well, not so much. Yes, he realized Isabel was beautiful on one hand, and yes, he wanted to get into her pants or whatever passed for pants in this day and age, but on the other, she was an insufferable wench who didn't speak an ounce of Japanese and more often than not left him second-guessing her every move. That settled it, then. Two could play this game. Naruto plunged feet-first into the nearby stream, secretly delighting in Isabel's squeal of surprise as she found herself soaked her from head to toe. Naruto didn't need a long, dramatic explanation for the hold of Whiterun. He needed only a single word. Impressive. Situated on a rising hill, it was a grand village filled with sights and sounds and activity. Children scampered past him playing a game of tag, vendors hawked their many and marvelous wares at passerby, and a woman could be seen tending a nearby forge. There were many sights to be seen here, the morning sun silhouetting the hold in its glorious glow. Guards patrolled the hold in pairs of 2 and 3s, on the lookout for any sort of trouble or, as they would put it, lollygagging. This was no Konoha to be certain, but the familiarity of it was pretty damn close. It almost made Naruto homesick, nearly brought a tear to his still damp eyes. Gods damn it, he wanted to go back. It was all well and good to distract himself by traveling with Isabel, but gradually, he became aware of Isabel's attention. Somehow, she could sense his sorrow. Naruto? He waved her concerns away, knowing she'd never understand anything he said. Abruptly, her expression brightened. Before he could ask what in oblivion she was doing, she had him by the arm, dragging him through the streets of Whiterun. Wah hey, he scowled. Where are you taking me? Just shut up and come to Jorvaskr with me. He didn't understand what she was saying, he could only make out one word. Jorvaskr? Ayla cocked her head aside, intrigue shining in her eyes as she beheld Isabel dragging a newcomer into the warm hearth of Jorvaskr. The whelp Isabel, was it, had once asked if she could be bring by a friend of hers to join the companions if she so wished. Kodlik hadn't seemed to mind, so Ayla against her better judgment had given the go-ahead. Now she found herself staring at, well, she didn't know what she was staring at. To be honest, she hadn't been expecting anyone at all. Isabel wasn't the sort to make friends. Evidently, she'd been wrong. Terribly, horribly wrong. Everything changed the moment she laid eyes upon him. Ayla took him for this was most certainly a he in an instant. Her eyes shining with intrigue and interest as they beheld the newcomer. Blonde hair, rough bangs hanging over blue eyes and whiskered cheeks, a confident gait to each step. He wasn't some milk drinker dragged off the street. He was a warrior through and through. He looked rather reluctant, however. Isabel practically dragged him across the hall, earning more than her fair share of questioning stares in the process. She flashed Farkas and Vilkas a slight smile as she brushed back, and the Nord brothers each raised a large flagon in greeting. Ayla barely even noticed, such was her attention riveted upon the crimson-clad man. There's someone I'd like you to meet. The whelp confirmed her suspicions as she elbowed the blonde forward. The whiskered newcomer made a face at her, but offered no other sign of protest. He stood stock still, his eyes narrow and intent upon his surroundings. It was almost as if he expected to be attacked at any moment. Him? Ayla arched an eyebrow. Isabel nodded and the blonde muttered something Ayla couldn't comprehend. She saw his sapphiric gaze rake across her figure, making no disguise of his interest. She'd been gawped at by men before, but those eyes of his held something more than lust. There was a sorrow in them, an ancient sadness sheathed in his heart. And then was desire, naked as any blade. Well now. Ayla inhaled deeply as well, drinking in his scent in turn. Her werewolf blood practically tingled with anticipation. This man was not what he appeared to be. He smelled like an alpha. Not just in body, but in spirit. There was an almost bestial air about him, as though he would pounce upon her and ravage her at the slightest provocation. It was in his blood, she realized. He was neither man nor beast, but neither was he a werewolf. This thought intrigued her. But appearance or not, she needed to know if he had any true skill. So she decided to test him, personally. Is he any good with a bow? She asked of Isabel. Isabel started to ask Naruto, only to pause and slap her forehead. He doesn't speak our language, or understand it. Naruto said something that sounded vaguely like an inquiry. How have the two of you not killed each other yet? Ayla couldn't quite keep the disbelief from her voice. That one drew a laugh from the whelp. Try asking me that one a few days from now. Shees did not question her ability. After all, she'd seen her strength and skill firsthand during her initiation against Vilkas. The woman was a she-devil when it came to the art of the blade. She'd nearly killed the poor man during their warm-up. Satisfied by her comrade's ability to look after herself, Ayla led the two of them out back to the yard, where a row of targets awaited. Under normal circumstances, they were utilized for sword and shield practice, but for this instance, anyone would do. Watch me, she instructed of Naruto. She drew the bow from her bag in a single, fluid motion, placed an iron arrow in the quiver, and let the world fall away. There was no hesitation, no lingering on her thoughts of the handsome young man watching her every move. The bow was an extension of herself, and she it. There was no Ayla. There was no bow. Only the arrow in her hand, drawn tight against this string. She let her world recede further still until there was only the target, only her will. Nothing more, nothing less. Gotcha. Having achieved her perfect state of focus with that in mind, as always, the huntress let loose the tension in her arm and let that arrow fly. It flew straight and true, whistling forward through the air to land dead center in the middle of a target with a solid thud. Perfect. As always, she admired her handiwork for a moment, taking fierce pride in this flawless accuracy. None could match her with a bow. Not even Isramor himself. But she digressed. Smirking, the huntress turned and offered Naruto the bow, her full lips quirked in a slight smile. Your turn, new blood. Naruto couldn't understand a word she'd said, but he could understand the unspoken challenge. Beat that. Gladly, he looked at Ayla for the span of 2 beats and slowly took the bow from her hand, laying an arrow upon its string. Who would have thought all those years with a bow would ever come in handy? He was by no means a crack shot, but neither was he an amateur when it came to the art of archery. During his brief, tenuous relationship with Tenten, he'd learned to use all manner of weapons. The bow had been her favorite. She'd spent hours drilling him on proper stance, angle, power. Now it all came roaring back. All that training, it had also been the reason they'd broken up. Training was all well and good in equal measure, but all Tenten had ever wanted to do was train. No amount of mind-blowing SX was worth that, not even for that ass. Don't you think you're getting a little off track? Kurama questioned. Not that I mind the trip down memory lane, but you haven't used a bow in at least a year now. Then prepared to be amazed. Naruto he drew the string taut, sighted down his target, pulled on the string a tad more tightly than was necessary, and let the arrow fly. It all happened so swiftly. One moment the arrow was drawn back, in the next heartbeat it slammed forward, piercing Ayla's arrow, splitting it down the middle to erupt out the other side of the hay target. And it didn't stop there. It kept going, piercing the walls behind the bale, streaking across the horizon in a black blur until it was miles away in Windhelm. A guard looked up just in time to witness an arrow falling from the sky. He tried to get out of the way, he really did. But the airborne missile was moving much too fast, and with a humorous thunk, it sank into the one place no guard wanted an arrow to land. The guard sank to the ground, screaming like a little girl. By the gods! I've taken an arrow to the knee, back in Whiterun. Naruto proffered the bow back to Ayla, oozing satisfaction. The huntress accepted it with a slight smile, amazed to find that the string had actually snapped with the strength of the arrow's release. Well now, perhaps it could be said that there was one archer who was her equal, after all. She extended her hand and he immediately reached out and clasped it. She was once more impressed, this time by the firmness of his grip. I'll speak to Kodlik, but for now, let me say this. We'll loan to the companions. Isabel practically beamed. Thank you, shield sister. No thanks needed. Ayla shook her head. Now be off with you. Go run an errand or something. Still smiling, Isabel led Naruto away. Ayla watched them go, unable to keep the smile from her lips. Who was that? Skyur had to ruin everything by approaching up behind her, scowling in Naruto's direction. Ayla bristled, because she didn't like the way the grizzled veteran was staring after the newcomer. There was a bad look in his eyes, one that she recognized all too well. There was anger in his eyes. He felt threatened by Naruto's presence. She'd had to nip that in the bud. Your new shield brother. She elbowed him in the side, ignoring his grunt of pain. I expect you to behave yourself. She decided then and there that she would have Naruto, Skyur be damned. He set her blood aflame in such a way that she found herself wanting to follow after him. No, she found herself actually following. She slipped out of Jorvaskr and set out after the whelp, careful to maintain a wide distance between them. By the look of things, they seemed to be headed toward Dragon's Reach. You see, Farengar was speaking to someone, hunched over a table as they came upon him. The terminology is clearly First Era or even earlier. I'm convinced this is a copy of a much older text. Perhaps dating to just after the Dragon War. If so, I could use this to cross-reference the names with other later texts. Perhaps some from the Shinobi era. Naruto's perked up. He was suddenly all ears. Good, the hooded figure replied. I'm glad you're making progress. My employers are anxious to have some tangible answers. Oh, have no fear. The Jarl himself has finally taken an interest, so now I'm able to devote most of my time to this research. Isabelle clamped a hand upon Naruto's wrist, slowing him behind her. She wanted to listen. Time is running, Farengar, don't forget. The hooded warrior, a woman, perhaps, pressed at him. This isn't some theoretical question. Dragons have come back. Yes, yes. Don't worry. Although the chance to see a living dragon up close would be tremendously valuable. Now, let me show you something else I found. We have Visters. Farengar looked up. Ah, yes, the Jarl's protege. Back from Bleak Falls Barrow. You didn't die, it seems. His gaze found Naruto's, taking in his fur attire. And, you brought a friend I trust. He's not a bandit? An outlaw, perhaps? Naruto bristled almost immediately. Isabelle knew he didn't comprehend their language yet, but tone. That was another matter. He knew he'd just been insulted. Before she could think to stop him from doing something foolish, his fingers found Farengar's throat. Baka Yuru. Although hindered by language, the insult remained an insult. Farengar choked in surprise. I beg your pardon? Even as he was being strangled, the sorcerer finally seemed to notice Naruto. Truly notice him, the crimson cloak worn over his fur armor. The scroll at his back and the steel hishiat wrapped firmly round his forehead. He struggled in vain to interpose his fingers between the blonde's hands and his throat, but to no avail. What did you just say? He replied in broken, slightly flawed Japanese. There was a silence, broken only by the sounds of the hearth crackling at their backs. Then Naruto laughed. It was a deep, mirthful sound, rising up from his belly, coursing through his throat to explode out his mouth. A rattling gasp left Farengar's lips as he found himself released, only for the shinobi to surge forward and clap the baffled magician across the back. You speak Japanese, he roared, elated to finally find someone who could understand him. Ah, yes, the aging mage coughed. I've been studying your kind for quite some time, but my accent is terribly rusty. Still, this is fascinating. I had no idea so many of your kind still existed in this world. He seemed to adopt a wistful expression as he looked the blonde up and down. Although, I was expecting you to be. No, Yoika were we ka? Naruto asked with a little smile. Different how? Better or worse? Isabelle's head snapped back and forth in confusion. She didn't like being left out. Alas, there was precious little she could do to interrupt them. The pair seemed most fixated upon their conversation. And just what were they talking about anyway? Worse. Farengar seemed to shudder, blissfully unaware of her praying. The last shinobi I met was hardly hospitable. Naruto felt his blood turn to ice in his veins. Last shinobi? It was several months ago, out in the reach, Farengar replied. I believe he said his name was Madara. The ice in Naruto's veins turned to tundra. Madara, Kurama hissed with hatred. I should have known. Naruto shared the sentiment. Madara was here, he was alive. This was bad. No, this was awful. If Uchiha Madara, the real Uchiha Madara, was here in the future with him and still in an immortal body. He daren't complete the thought. This changed things. This changed everything completely. Ahem. Isabelle coughed, angrily. I believe you were looking for this? She held up the dragonstone, grimacing only slightly at the strain required to hold it. Farengar brightened as she set the massive table down into the desk, its contents rattling lightly as the heavy stone creaked against the wood. What is he saying? She demanded to know. Naruto scowled and chattered something at Farengar. The mage flushed. He says he's been having a hard time off, pardon my language, not tapping her posterior. Nobody did embarrassment like the Japanese. Isabelle blushed right to her hairline and sputtered several times. Well, you can tell him. Before she could shoot in a reply edgewise, however, Ireliath was suddenly at her elbow. The dark elf's face was flushed with exertion, as though she'd just run down several flights of stairs to reach them. Naruto took a look at her and bought, the color draining from his visage. Irulia didn't seem to notice. "Farengar, come quickly," she demanded. "A dragon has been sighted nearby." "A dragon?" Farengar exclaimed. "Oh, how exciting. When was it sighted? What was it doing?" Naruto soon found himself little more than a pleasant distraction in the mage's mind as they pounded up the stairs. He caught the hooded woman's eye as he ascended the staircase, saw the slight smile she wore. Even for all his fortitude, something in the smile unnerved him. It felt as though he were looking into the eyes of an accomplished killer, one who wouldn't hesitate to waste innocent lives to get what she wanted. Naruto took a risk and followed her gaze, alarmed to find that her eyes were now locked upon Isabelle. "Oi!" He turned a bit to address the hooded stranger, but she was already gone, though there wasn't any sign of her departure. Shaking his head, the blonde allowed his mind to return to the present.
A dragon, huh? Interesting. What were the chances it was the same black dragon as before?
What are the chances indeed? Naruto was shouting at himself as he bounded backwards, narrowly evading a gout of fire. This dragon was not Alduin, its scales were the wrong color and it was Severa sizes smaller, but by no means did that make it any less dangerous. It had come down out of the mountains with fire and fury, laying waste to the west watchtower and all within only to vanish before anyone could muster a counterattack kill it. Now it had returned, just as Isabelle and Naruto and the others drew within earshot. By Izmir, what a day this is. Ayla didn't seem the least bit fazed by the prospect of facing such a beast.
If anything, she seemed excited by it. Naruto still didn't understand why she'd insisted on accompanying them out of the city to face the dragon, but Iruliath had been more than happy to accept another bow. Naruto wasn't. No amount of arrows seemed able to bring the thing down. It was even wily enough to evade the last two of his Rasenshuriken. He wasn't about to waste his third when it was almost guaranteed to miss.
Kurama's voice reverberated in his mind, bounding off the halls of his psyche. "You know we can do this, kid. We can stop it, we can kill it." Naruto nodded. "Yeah, I know. Then why are you hesitating?" "It's just, I would have liked not to be feared for a little while longer. That is a luxury we can no longer afford. Like I said, I know." Naruto drew in a deep, ragged breath. He let it out, expelling a fine cloud of steam. "Alright then, let's do this." He took one step forward, and then another and still another, until he was slowly pacing away from Iruliath and the guards of Whiterun, until Isabelle finally recognized the sinister gleam in his eye, those determined strides that carried him well past her. Naruto felt her eyes boring into his back, but he was determined to ignore them. Finally, when he could advance no further, for fear of calling the dragon's wrath down upon his head, he stopped. "Naruto?" The blonde gave no indication of having heard her. He bent double and stretched, popped his neck, cracked his fingers. She was vaguely aware of his mutterings, more of the nonsensical gibberish no one, not even the aged harbinger Kodlik, seemed able to understand, but they were deepening in pitch, almost as if another were speaking within him, alongside him. His very being seemed to hum with barely repressed energy, bulging within throbbing veins, pulsating in eyes branched with strain. "Here we go." Naruto clapped his cheeks, psyching himself up. "Here we go. Here we go, here we go, here we go." "Naruto," he heard Isabelle call his name, but the rest of her words were lost to him.
Even had they been able to penetrate the language barrier, they still would have been lost in the haze of this battle. He could feel this coming on, his blood singing as Kurama's power flooded his veins, straining his body, pushing the limits of his feeble form. It was time to ascend. He caught Ella's eye just then and he understood. She had some inkling of what he planned, of what he was about to do, that he intended to face the dragon, alone. But even she couldn't truly comprehend what he intended. No one could.
He performed a half-turn towards them, stretching his hand out to Isabelle.
"Sorry, ladies," he grinned ruefully, wolfishly. "I really woulda liked to get to know you better before I pulled a stunt like this."
"What are you?" Isabelle's expression was heartbreaking in its confusion, desperately pained in its ignorance. She didn't understand his words or his intentions, but she would, soon.
"We're going full body," Kurama warned. "We need to be solid to make this work."
"Gods, this is gonna hurt L like a bitch afterwards." "You think I don't know that?" Naruto laughed, tilted his head back. "And let the power flow, rawr." At the sound of Naruto's scream, Ayla's head snapped back and forth like a puppet severed from its strings. By Izmir, golden light engulfed him as before, but this time it didn't stop there. It shot upward and outward from him like a beacon, blanketing the setting sun in 7 different shades of crimson and saffron.
Ella looked on in helpless, utter awe as the blinding radiance took hold of the blonde's form, warping his body into something massive.
Something monstrous. Sapphire snapped into scarlet. Fangs grew where there had once been teeth, spreading his visage into the muzzle of a beast. Hair changed into golden fur and grew rapidly cover his skin, leaving him to drop onto all fours. 9 tails of pure, nascent energy sprouted from his back and flayed the earth to ribbons, Claws dug deep into the soil and ripped up great gouts of earth, flinging chunks of it into the air, one of which reduced an unlucky guard to a mere stain upon the land. All the while Naruto was growing, changing, until he towered over them, so much like the dragon wheeling high overhead.
Isabel gawped up at it, this beast that had once been a man.
The fox, for it could be nothing else, opened its mighty maw and roared. An ear-splitting cry that shook both heaven and earth. The dragon answered one of its own, dousing them in a sheets of flame and fire. Unaffected by the inferno, the beast that Naruto had become rose, standing on its haunches in an effort to appraise its winged attacker. And then it jumped. One moment it stood stationary upon the soils of the land known as Tamriel. The next, it erupted upward with a mighty lunge of its hindquarter, rising to meet the dragon in midair. It all happened so fast. One moment they hung there in the air. The next, the fox locked both paws around the dragon's wings, sending them plummeting to the ground. The earth groaned beneath their impact, sending guards scattering from their cover, uncertain as of whom to attack. Both monstrosities were up in an instant, and it was then that Isabel realized just how large Naruto's Biju form made him. He was at least twice the size of the dragon, and the great lizard seemed to realize this even as she thought of it. "Hello, lunch," Naruto growled, licking his lips. The dragon spat something back at him in ancient tongue, its eyes wide with anger, and perhaps a touch of fear. They circled one another, dragon and fox, fangs bared, neither willing to make a move. In the end, the jinchuriki did. Naruto, Kurama cannoned forward, slamming into the dragon like a freight train. There came a mighty oomph as the dragon's scaly spine slammed into the west watchtower, leaving it stunned, but not out of the fight by any means. It could still recover and continue. Naruto didn't give it those means. Even as the lizard struggled to right itself, his fox-like form was suddenly there, looming overhead like a furious and implacable kami come to wreak righteous judgment. Despite its own and fear, his opponent puffed out its chest and spat. Zuu the dragon never finished its sentence. Jaws of pure, coalescent energy closed around the beast's neck and proceeded to shake it like a rag doll. The dragon roared in surprise, bucking even as Kurama's fangs struggled to pierce its impenetrable scales. There came a great, terrible tearing sound as teeth the size of a large grown man bit down and broke into the beast's neck, shattering bones like so much glass. But the dragon did not die. It raised its long neck and opened its jaws, presenting the giant kitsune with a terrible view of the rising tide of fire in the back of its throat. "Y'all." Isabel didn't think, she just reacted. Tor. Even as the infrared built in the beast's mouth, she was springing headlong into the fray, blade drawn. Shoo, her blade burned like a brand in her hand, still she daren't let go. Even as the dragon completed its shout, she was there, thrusting her blade between the scales, penetrating the chink in monster's armor, stabbing it at its scaly heart a split second before it could douse Naruto in flames. Grar! The dragon screamed. Its entire body bucked in one final, desperate effort to dislodge Naruto, but to no avail. He bit down hard, tearing great chunks of scales from the beast's back, ingesting them and leaving the old beast to lose its final death knell. It tumbled backwards, lifeless, left to bleed out beneath their feet. Isabel dropped her blade, winced at the burning welts rising upon her palms, and silently thanked the gods for this victory. That was when it happened. Ba dump. Isabel felt it then, the dragon's life force flowing out of its body and into hers, stripping the very soul from its bones, leaving naught but a charred skeleton behind. Her mouth opened on as much instinct as anything else, and she inhaled with a deep breath, drawing the power into her very core. As she watched the power float into Naruto as well, the shards of the serpent's soul sizzling into the shape-shifting blonde. Even as she'd finished the thought, Naruto began to shrink, fur receding into skin, tail shriveling up into his back, scarlet slipping back into sapphire. He stood woodenly, gasping for breath, chest heaving. He went to her, helped her out, aided her and allowed her to stand. The guards stared at them, this unlikely pair, and gawped. Finally, one of them found their voice. "By the gods! They're the Dragonborn. And there you have it. Not my best take on the world of Skyrim, I know, but it is my first. And definitely one of the most amusing. I almost feel bad for Naruto and the Dovahkiin. They cannot even begin to understand one another, and yet somehow they've been able to avoid killing one another. We've delved a bit into the Dovahkiin's past in this chapter. Anyone care to guess who her mother is? I thought I made it obvious, but if not, you'll see soon enough. And of course, I couldn't rise the usage of the arrow to the knee joke, what with it being the title and all. And at long last we see Ayla. Naruto, as ever, hates puzzles, Draugr, and ghosts. As I'm sure you've noticed, he's a bit more of a flirt in this story than his usual self, but hey, that's part of the hilarity and romance. Farengar is, thus far, the only Skyrim character to speak Japanese, and even then it's only because he's researched the shinobi alongside the dragons. The High Elves may know a thing or two about the Age of the Golden Shinobi, but poor Isabel won't be understanding Naruto anytime soon. But answer me this. If Naruto got blasted back to the past, what, oh what, happened to Sasuke and Minato? Chew on that, a little while.
Dragonbane. Not a bad title for Naruto, Absorbing the soul and the flesh of a dragon, well, that should certainly prove to be interesting in the future.
Chaos is set to ensue as of next chapter as everyone realize that Naruto and Isabelle are dragonborn. I hope you're looking forward to it as much as I am. There's so much more to come. The College of Winterhold, not to mention finding Isabelle's mother and the Daedric weapons. Thieves Guild. The Companions. The Dark Brotherhood, and of course, my personal favorite, Dawnguard. Look forward to it all, readers. So, in the immortal words Atlas. Review, would you kindly? And enjoy this little omake. Omake. Why is that pup still following us? Kurama groused. Naruto stifled a laugh and fought the urge to turn and look over his shoulder. At Isabelle's insistence he hadn't slaughtered the last wolf pack. Merely driven them off with a few shouts and the flat of his blade. That had been a mistake, evidently. Because now they were being followed. The pack had been trailing them for the last half-mile, breaking off only as they reached the outskirts of Whiterun. All save one.
One in particular was proving to be most stubborn. It was young, barely a whelp, covered in tawny gray fur. And for some damnable reason the poor thing had been following them for the last hour, even when all of its companions had broken off and returned to the relative safety afforded by the forest. Now, Naruto didn't consider himself much of a believer when it came to fate, but even he had to admit that this was swiftly shaping up to be much more than mere coincidence.
Isabelle must have noticed as well, because she kept stealing glances back at the wolf pup. Sit, Naruto barked suddenly, turning to face the wolf. It cocked its head aside, blinking at him. Naruto growled. I said sit. The pup whimpered and lowered itself onto its haunches obediently. Naruto grinned. Stay. Naruto frowned, eyes narrowing. Stay, when it did as was told and didn't budge.
Isabelle's deadpan was barely concealed. She'd been expecting him to drive the pup off, not try to tame it. Evidently she was still sullen with him about the Dragonstone.
What? Naruto shrugged in recompense for his temerity. I always wanted a pet. Oh. Right? A slow smile crept across his lips. You can't understand me. I forgot. His smile grew an inch as he sensed her confusion, a slow devilish snicker trickling beneath his tone. You can't understand a word I say, can ya, you sweet, SXY gorgeous thing. Slap. You were saying, Kurama snickered as Naruto caressed his throbbing visage seconds later. Women tend to know when you're messing with them. Just shut up. Sigh, I am sworn to carry your burdens.
Lydia. Innocence lost. Foos. An irate Uzumaki Naruto found himself on the receiving end of another verbal push, sent onto the back foot rocking on his heels, as irritated by the shout as Isabelle was pleased. He sighed, stifled an angry retort and continued on. He refused to let this rile him. He would keep walking, keep moving, no matter how many times she decided to.
Foos. You cheeky little. Another shout rocked him from behind, sending him stumbling, his foot catching upon an upturned cobblestone. Gah! Before he could think to stop himself, nay, even as he plotted his righteous revenge upon Isabelle, he plowed face first into the streets of Windhelm, his skull knocking upon several stones, and were it not for the hishiate wrapped firmly around his forehead, he might have split it right open. As it were, he merely saw stars, whole planets, actually before his vision finally cleared. Seething he lay there, perfectly still, refusing to budge so much as another inch. He sincerely wished she would stop this little game of hers. After all, even a shinobi's patience has had its limits. Why were they in Windhelm? He wasn't sure. Isabelle was apparently interested in the Dark Brotherhood or something like that. Ferengar had been able to convey that much before the carriage had whisked them away to the Windy City. Perhaps the term, city, was a stretch. He was swiftly coming to associate them with holds, and he found Windhelm to be very, very different from Whiterun. For one, it was colder. Much colder. He'd since traded his fur armor for a more conventional garb sewn for him by the finest seamstresses in Whiterun. His outfit was vaguely reminiscent of the attire he'd worn during Paine's invasion of Konoha, all reds and blacks with his trademark cloak and scroll. Only this time, the smiths had fashioned for him the lightest layer of steel ringlets beneath. Not enough to slow him down, but more than enough to protect him against a lucky arrow or an exceptionally unlucky blade.
And here he was, dirtying his new outfit, plotting his revenge against Isabelle. She would get what was coming to her in the end. Still, her actions were almost enough to make him miss Ella. She knew how to nip these mischievous tendencies in the bud. Sadly, they'd left the huntress back in Whiterun. How he longed to return there.
Oh, Kurama grinned as they lay there, the guards staring at them. This wouldn't have anything to do with a certain redhead now, would it? Naruto nearly broke from his feigned death to snap at the kitsune. His desire to return to Whiterun had nothing to do with Ayla wanting to jump his bones. Alright, maybe it did. A little. A tad. But that wasn't truly what was important. At least not right now. Honestly, he couldn't be blamed for the reaction he'd instilled in her after his transformation. Flashback, the hour was late and the night was young. Thick with desire, pure and primal. The moon hung high overhead, waxed to its fullest potential. Just that afternoon the people of Whiterun had celebrated the triumphant and glorious return of their two heroes, the Dragonborn. There had been feasting and drinking and celebrating long into evening, revelry at its finest. But all good things must end, and so too did the festivities. Isabelle had decided to undertake a quest at this late hour with Lydia, leaving him to his own devices. Naruto, for the most part, didn't do much. He sharpened his kunai, cleaned his blades, and tried to summon Gamakichi and the other toads, but to no avail. While he could still utilize the items he had sealed away in his scroll, summon animal was apparently well beyond his ability. Probably had something to do with being cast thousands of years into the future. Naruto wasn't certain at what point she knocked on his door, only that she did. He rose to answer it, opened it, unaware that he would soon find the celebration wasn't over yet, not for him. "Oh, it's you." He blinked in surprise. "What brings you?" "Oof." Naruto grunted, not in pain, but in surprise as his back greeted a wooden beam, rebounded off of it and aside. The wood splintered beneath his back with an audible creak, an unspoken testament to the strength of the one who'd first thrust him into the abandoned house to begin with. He remembered Farengar calling it Breezehome. He'd said it was a gift from the Jarl. A reward for his part in the slaying of Milmunir. It was old, dusty, rundown, and in great need of a fixer-upper. What's more, he had to share it with Isabelle. But enough of that. Naruto had never been one to let his mind wander, especially in the presence of a woman. There could be no exception now. His gaze drifted back to the one who'd first opened the door, and all but flung him back into the house. Ayla. There was a wild look in her eye, a light he hadn't seen before, one that belied her sudden surge in strength and power. She stepped over the threshold, kicking the door shut and locking it behind her. She held up the key before her face, and then, as he looked on, slipped into her low-cut armor. Her eyes were heavy and lidded, leaving no guesses as to how she meant him to retrieve it. "You want it?" She spoke softly, but her voice, low and husky, seemed to fill the empty room, welling up from the very depths of her soul. "Come and get it." She strode towards him then, hips swaying from the motion, entrancing him. He felt his blood stir at the sight. His hands were upon her almost before he realized what he was doing, cupping her cheek, kneading her breasts, dragging her with him to the floor. They weren't going to make it to the bed, he realized. Not as she climbed atop him, into his lap and sat there, gazing at him with her wild green eyes. "Never thought I'd sense such desire from a woman again," Kurama commented within his mind. "It's been a while." "That it has." "Mine," she hissed, and even without a translator, Naruto knew she was laying claim to him. He peered at for a long moment, wondering if she was truly serious about all this. She was. Farengar wasn't here to translate, and to be frank, Naruto didn't need him. Any man with half a libido would recognize such a look. No more words were said between them that night, because none were needed. They grappled and kissed and coupled and fell asleep in one another's arms. Ayla was gone the next morning, long before Isabelle and Lydia returned, leaving the pair wondering at the faint scent of desire lingering in their home. End flashback, leaving her had been troublesome. Speaking of troublesome, do you have to keep doing that to him, my thane? Lydia asked of Isabelle, and though he could not understand her words, her tone practically oozed sympathy and concern. Naruto had only known their house Carl for a short time now. How did two thanes share a house Carl anyway? But he found himself beginning to like her already. Much like Isabelle, she favored steel armor, discarding speed and maneuverability for sheer endurance when it came time to fight. And Cammy, she could fight. He'd witnessed her skill with sword and shield firsthand on the road. Indeed, she would have made a fine shinobi in his day. But that was neither here nor there. They were coming closer now, and so he lay completely still, willing his pulse to slow. "I'll stop it when he apologizes." Isabelle gradually came up behind him, Lydia trailing on her heels. "But you might be hurting him." "Bah," she scoffed. "He's a man, he can take it." "Oh, I can take it all right." Naruto knew she would not have stopped even if she could understand him. She was enjoying this much more than she should have. She'd been busily blasting him with the newfound powers of her Thuum for fun as they wandered the streets of Windhelm, taking this perverse pleasure in repaying him for his earlier comments about wishing to tap that as soon as he was able. Perhaps he shouldn't have been so snide back during Whiterun, but he'd been in such a foul mood at the mention of Madara. Maybe it had been his mistake to make Farengar translate.
Tap that indeed. Isabelle wants sharp edge of her sword.
Indeed, she believed he deserved to be punished for such a comment, but it was his refusal to strike back that was beginning to bother her. Honestly, she was amazed he hadn't tried something already. Wait a minute, he hadn't moved for a while now. "Hey," she addressed his unmoving body, nudging it with her toe. "You aren't dead, are you?" No response. "Naruto?" An iron wedge filled her throat. Isabelle bent over him, prepared to check his pulse. Lydia caught sight of his eyes just then, saw them narrow in thinly veiled amusement. Her mouth hung half open as she realized just what her thane intended, and she slowly began to edge away from Isabel. For her part, the Nord failed to notice, she was far too focused on the prone blonde's back. A mistake on her part. One that would cost her all too dear in a couple of seconds.
Hey, now. Naruto's hand locked around Isabel's wrist in an iron vice and she realized her mistake. She'd forgotten just how clever he could be. Baka. Naruto smirked, and it was then that Isabel remembered something else. She wasn't the only one who wielded the unstoppable power of the voice. Or wa tame ni. Fool. This is for my honor. Isabel's eyes grew large as fine china saucers in the same instant that the last shinobi drew a mighty breath and let it loose.
Foos. Isabel had just enough time to cry out before the force of Naruto's shout blew her backwards, sending her sprawling across the roads.
Her forehead kissed a cobblestone in a way no woman nor or otherwise desired, and she'd just enough time to hear her companion's laughter before her skull struck the stones again. She'd made the mistake of not wearing her helm today, leaving her skull totally unprotected, against the cold stone streets of Windhelm. Lydia was there almost immediately, silent and stoic as ever.
You had that coming, my Thane. Isabel bit back a retort. Realizing her housecarl was right. She'd been acting like a spoiled child, and Naruto had given her a taste of her own medicine. She ought to be grateful it hadn't been his sword instead.
Oh, that small, perverted part of herself chuckled. Aren't we being a bit too eager?
Her face burned. Not that sword. Best to let bygones be bygones and move on. Lydia tugged at her, finally alerting Isabel's attention to the presence of Naruto and the fact that he found himself accosted by a pair of guards.
I have to ask you to stop. One of them was saying to Naruto. That shouting of yours is making people nervous.
Naruto glowered at the guard, and for a moment, Isabel thought he'd learned his lesson. Then he smiled. Shore's bones, he wasn't going to. He was. Foos. Ro da. Naruto's voice was a great deal stronger than hers, Isabel remembered, likely augmented by these many powers of his tenant.
Farengar had strove to explain that much to her upon their return to Dragon's Reach.
He'd compared this fox of Naruto's to a Daedra, claiming that it gave him great power in exchange for sharing a body with him. The poor guard didn't stand a chance. One moment he was standing across from Naruto. The next, the blonde's voice picked him up and flung him halfway across the city. She was certain she saw the poor fool falling in the direction of the hay-filled stables. A muffled grunt seconds thereafter confirmed the man was still very much alive. Growling, the shinobi turned to face his compatriot, daring him to protest.
Tsugi. Fire in his eyes, he waved the remaining guard forward. Next. All right, then. Wisely, the man turned around and went about his business, pretending nothing had happened. I'll let you off with a warning, this time. Isabel didn't blame him for his cowardice. In fact, she almost commended him for it. You would have to be a fool, a complete and utter fool, to mess with someone as heavily armed as Naruto. Which was exactly what she'd been doing moments ago. The thought brought a shamed flush to her cheeks. By the divines, she truly was a fool. Why did Naruto even put up with her? Indeed, Naruto was powerful. Ikimasho, Imoto-san. Isabel had no way of knowing Naruto had just called her his little sister, nor did he realize she was being teased. Most would have been perturbed by such a notion, disabused of their respect, at the very least.
Not Isabel. Truly, she found Naruto's powers to be fascinating. If anything, it only excited her. She considered was a challenge.
She could only make him stagger with her shout, but he could bowl her head over heels with powers she couldn't even begin to comprehend. His strength gave her a standard, something to aspire to. And she wouldn't get anywhere if she kept acting like a spoiled brat. She'd be damned if her new status as Dragonborn did anything to get in the way of that. She was honored to realize she was supposed to be the hero she'd been told of in tales, but Naruto.
She could only wonder what his thoughts might have been after they'd slain the dragon. Flashback, I can't believe it. The guards gawped at them, their mouths agape like a school of slaughterfish. You're Dragonborn, both of you. Dragonborn? What does that mean? Isabel asked. She knew the tales, as told her by her father, but this was too much to be true. Dragons were one thing, killing them and absorbing their soul, their very power and essence, was something entirely different. Thankfully, the guard was more than happy to oblige her. In the very oldest tales, back from when there were still dragons in Skyrim, the Dragonborn would slay dragons and steal their power. That's what the two of you did, isn't it? Absorbed the dragon's power. Isabel pretended to consider it a moment. You may be right. I think I am. The guard agreed. You can shout now, the both of you. That can only mean one thing. You must be Dragonborn. Dragonborn? One of the other guards frowned. What in blazes are you talking about, Hammond?
That's right, agreed another. My grandfather used to tell stories about the Dragonborn. Those born with the old dragon blood in them, like old Tiber Septim himself.
I've never heard of Tiber Septim killing any dragons, one of them disgruntled. That's because there weren't any dragons then, idiot. The now named Hammond snapped at his compatriot. They're just coming back now for the first time in, well. He flung his arms up in exasperation, forever. What do you say, Iriliath? A fourth guard of the dark who, thus far, had yet to utter so much as a word. You've been awfully quiet. Do you believe in this dragonborn business?
HMMPH, the dark elf retorted, her equally dark eyes appraising Naruto and Isabel with something dangerously close to scorn.
Some of you would be better off keeping quiet than flapping your gums on matters you don't know anything about. She turned to face Milmolner's corpse. Here's a dead dragon. Now that's definitely something I understand. Now we know we can kill them. But I don't need some mythical dragonborn, the like of which you see here. She caught Naruto's eye just then, her disdain morphing into respectful pride. Someone who can put down a dragon is more than enough for me, be he man or beast. I have the succinct feeling. We've just been praised. Kurama purred, pleased by the look in her eyes. Naruto shared the sentiment. Although he hadn't understood a word of what had been said, he did understand that these men and women did not fear him in his bestial form. If anything, they seemed in awe of him. He couldn't quite place Ayla's expression. The huntress had yet to say anything and still seemed torn somewhere between awe and disbelief. Isabel didn't share any of that sentiment. You wouldn't understand, House Carl. A guard retorted, you ain't a Nord. Isabel laughed. It was a soft tinkling sound that set Naruto's skin rippling with goosebumps. He'd never heard her laugh before. Not like this. Her body was covered in cuts and bruises from the battle. The entire length of her left arm was one big burn, and her helm had been knocked askew by the dragon's tail, and still she somehow full out. She looked like absolute crap, and yet still, she delighted in victory. Those thoughts unlocked something deep within him. Naruto couldn't help it. He smiled. There was just something about this woman. Her will was so indomitable not even a dragon could bring it down. I've been all across Tamriel, replied the elf sharply, mistaking the Nord's laughter for scorn. I've seen plenty of things just as outlandish than this. I'd advise the lot of you to trust in the strength of your sword arm, over tales and legends long since past. Her gaze traveled to Isabel as she said this, and the warrior bristled a bit at the IMLPLIED insult. But she held her tongue. The rift between dark elves and her people would not be resolved so easily, certainly not between these two, certainly not today. Duvaken, Naruto's head snapped toward the mountain's peak in the same instant that Isabel's gaze jerked toward the sky. The voices for it could only be thus continued to rumble into the distance, growing fainter and fainter with each passing second. Isabel had heard it as well. The pair exchanged a baffled glance. The hell was that? Naruto murmured, and flashback. Apparently they'd been summoned by the Greybeards. That had been nearly a week ago. At first he'd thought Isabel's sense of direction was merely convoluted, then he'd realized she had no intention of visiting these old fools. His Ferengar had translated for them, until she was good and ready. Alas, Ferengar had chosen to remain in Whiterun, and as such he longer had any way of properly communication with her. But he knew this much. Whatever this little vendetta with the Dark Brotherhood might be, came first. If it even was a vendetta. Honestly, he had no idea what she was planning anymore. Are you alright, Naruto Dono? Naruto risked a glance over his shoulder. Lightly amused to find Lydia, and not Isabel, at his right elbow. Her Daijobu could use some work. It sounded more like Dakobu, but he understood her meaning nonetheless. She had learned the hard way from the outset of their partnership. He didn't like being called a thane, that her servitude to the two of them would test her patience at the best of times and nearly strain her sanity to its breaking during others. But she did try, and her fortitude continued to amaze him. Any sane person would have given up and gone home by now. Not Lydia. She'd stuck with them throughout the last week, refusing to allow these eerie antics to dissuade her from her duty. Hi. He waved her concerns away. Then you are. How do you say it? The words cut off and her lips pursed in a thin line. Daijobu Deizu? Deizu? Naruto couldn't help himself. The force of his laugh tore its way out of him in a short, loud bark of amusement. It was too much, Lydia offered him a scowl. You're mocking me, aren't you? Nai, Chigao. The blonde stifled a chuckle. I'm not mocking you, really. I'm afraid I only understood a little of that, my thane. Naruto bit back another bout of laughter, his sides shaking from the strain. This is too much. Really, you sound happy, kid, Kurama mused. I am, well, kinda. It'd be better if she was completely fluent in our language, though. Beggars can't be choosers. Naruto agreed, though he was still having trouble coming to terms with how hard it was for Lydia to understand, let alone speak his language. He let his feet carry him through the streets of Windhelm as he struggled to recall just how she'd come by his native language, uncaring for the twists and turns as they followed Isabel deeper and deeper into the hold. Lydia. Evidently Lydia had spent so much time around Ferengar in years past, she'd actually picked up a few words here and there. This had been long before he'd ever been to Whiterun, mind you. He was beginning to realize he could actually share a half-decent conversation with the woman. What's more, Isabel hated it. She claimed she was still reading the book Ferengar had given her, but one look at her told him she wasn't the reading type. That was fine with him. They could still get their point across with the occasional hand gesture. Lydia lacked that understand, and what's more, she seemed genuinely interested in least trying to learn his language, something Isabel and Ayla hadn't even bothered to attempt. Companionship was all well and good, but damn it, he wanted to talk sometimes. This halting speech with Lydia wasn't enough for him. Nowhere near what he wanted. Bakemono. No, Nanda. In halting tones. Lydia struggled to ask him if he was leery of what others thought of him. Having changed into a giant monster before their very eyes, Naruto didn't so much as bat an eyelash. It wasn't as though he could understand their insults, anyway, so why should he be concerned about what they said? Besides, if ever someone angered him, well, he could always convince them of his point of view. And by convince, he meant pranking any poor soul foolish enough to insult him until they saw the error of their ways. But he couldn't be telling Lydia that now, could he? Meh. He shrugged, pantomimed a gesture with his right hand. It doesn't much matter to me what they think. He spoke slowly, allowing her to understand him. I am what I am. Why should I let their words change me, or what I think of myself? If I did that, then I wouldn't be me. Lydia looked at him for a long moment, admiration shining behind her hazel eyes. They were a lovely shade of auburn, he thought to himself. A man could get lost in them. Naruto, what are you two talking about? Isabel was suddenly there at Naruto's left, flanking him, frowning at their conversation. Nanaga? Naruto tilted his head, feigning ignorance. Talking about what? That was then they heard it. Their little conversation had taken them through the streets of Windhelm, heedless of the snows falling around them. Now, Naruto bid them halt as they came within sight of a dark elf and a young boy, the latter looking to be only 10 years old. They were positioned just outside a large house, arguing emphatically. Naruto couldn't understand a word of it and felt his frustrations beginning to boil. This was, well, it wasn't annoying, but he was sad as it might be beginning to grow resigned to the impassable language barrier standing between him and the people of Skyrim. It must be so frustrating, shinobi, that you are forced to associate yourself with these lesser beings. Naruto froze. He literally stopped in place, ceased all conscious movement, because he's suddenly aware of the voice, this luminous presence settling upon his psyche. That hadn't been Kurama's voice just now. Within a touch of dread he reached out for the old fox, but in the Ancient One's place he felt an unfamiliar presence, bright and warm against his senses. It was as though he were staring into the twilight. The silence itself was daring him to speak. And speak he did. What the hell is this? What indeed? A faint, tinkling laugh rewarded him for his efforts. Alright, he thought out around a frown. Who are you? What the fuck are you doing in my head? Why can I understand you? And where the hell is Kurama? My name is Azura. That same, lilting voice replied, seemingly unperturbed by his coarse language. Daedric, Princess of Dusk and Dawn. I have been watching you for many days now, Time Walker. Your exploits have intrigued me, to say the least. There was a pause. I would speak with you, Walker, if you were willing. As for your tenant, I have simply excluded him from our conversation. You will be able to speak with him once our business has been concluded. We may speak freely here, Time Walker. I am quite knowledgeable of your language. Time Walker. Despite the growing ache in his frontal lobe, Naruto almost laughed. Don't you have anything better to call me? You have strode across the currents of time, thousands of years in the past, to this era. Azura was nonplussed. What else would you have me call you? I'd prefer my name, to be honest. Very well then. Naruto East, Azura did. Will you hear me out? I don't suppose I have a choice now, do I? And what's with the suffix? Not really, no. He caught a flicker of movement in his peripherals as his world stilled, slowing to accommodate just the two of them. If you're thinking of alerting your companions, do not bother. They are quite unaware of me. Alright then, speak your piece. I wish for you to complete a task for me. Retrieve my star. Find it, and cleanse it of the taint within. Do this, and I will be willing to assist you with your language problem. And others as well. Baka Matai. Naruto scoffed. Are you stupid or something? As if you could do that. You claim to be all-powerful, but really, you're just another voice in my head. Your doubt is to be expected, Naruto-kun. Azura replied in flawless Japanese. Her words like soft velvet against his ear. Allow me to dispel it. Behold. The hell? The blonde cringed as the pressure on his mind abruptly intensified, only to abate just as swiftly. What was that? Consider it a gift. She purred demurely. You will be able to understand the language of Tamriel for a single day, perhaps even speak it in time, but my blessing is not a permanent one and will not last you more than a day. You must seek out my shrine in Winterhold and speak to my priestess, Urania. Then we will discuss your language problem at length there. A vision flickered before his eyes, a giant statue of a woman, clad in diaphanous robes, holding aloft a sun and a moon in the winter wastes. This is where you must go. I look forward to your arrival, my champion. Oi, I never said anything about being your champion. And then she was gone, leaving Naruto utterly baffled. Daedric princess? Dozens of questions pounded at his mind, Kurama's well-being chief amongst them. Tentatively he reached out for his tenant, fearing the worst of what might have happened to him. The first thing he felt is irritation. That, and nausea. I have such a hangover. The Kyuubi all but groaned. Did anyone get the number of that bus? What did I miss? Oh, nothing, just a Daedra. Kurama cursed. Which one? He asked, the words laced with dread. Please tell me it wasn't Boethia. She's probably still pissed at me after all these years. Nah, she said her name was Azura. Hey. You knew about this? Indignation flooded him, coloring his cheeks crimson. About the Daedra? And you didn't warn me? The kitsune gave the mental equivalent of a shrug. They've always been around, even in my time. Never thought they'd take an interest in you, though. Well, obviously one of them did. And is that a bad thing? Azura's always been a good girl, if a tad haughty. She won't betray your trust. Now Boethia. Watch out for that one. She's a sly little bitch. You say this like you know her. There could be no denying the embarrassment he felt from Kurama. Not this time. I admit nothing. Lydia provided a halting translation for him, as best she could. She didn't need to. Naruto suddenly found he could understand the pair. It was as though a switch had been flicked somewhere in his mind. He knew it did not have any chance of lasting, but he took the opportunity to smile. Then it's true, what everyone is saying, the boy asked. That Aventus Aretino is doing the Black Sacrament? Trying to summon the Dark Brotherhood? Oh Drimbar, always with the nonsense. The dark elf woman with him shook her head. No, of course not. Those are just tales. Fine, the boy countered. Then I'll ask him to come out and play. He lives right over there. I'm going to knock on his door. No, child. She abruptly reversed her stance on the matter. Wait, that boy, that house, they're cursed. Ha, he crowed. Then I'm right, I knew it, he's trying to have somebody killed. Alright, I won't deny it. What you heard is true. But Aventus walks a dark path. His actions can lead only to ruin. Now, enough. We will speak no more of this. I am the only friend you need. Naruto watched them pass by, until he felt the hairs on the back of his neck begin to prickle. Sure enough, when he turned around, and before he could think to stop her, Isabel was picking the lock. Oi! Naruto reached out to grab her shoulder. Chato Mat, they couldn't just break into someone's home. Blah! Isabel stuck out her tongue and defiantly broke the lock, thereby opening the door. You're the one who shouted a guard halfway across the hold, remember? She gave him a final, defiant look and shouldered her way inside. Sawed off, she didn't need to speak to tell him that. Naruto waited after a moment longer, then, exhaling a long-suffering sigh, followed after. Lydia followed, her stoic silence mirroring every bit of anxiety he felt when they stepped into the dimly lit darkness. He could faintly hear a child's voice. Sweet mother, send your child unto me, for the sins of the unworthy must be baptized in blood and fear. Grelod, you old crone. You'll get what you deserve. The Dark Brotherhood will see to that. Then, more softly. Please, how long must I do this? I keep praying Night Mother. Why won't you answer me? Isabel chose that moment to step around the corner and make herself known. It's you? The boy undoubtedly Aventus started in surprise, practically squealing with glee. You come at last, I knew you would. Naruto glanced at Isabel. He had a bad feeling about this. Seconds later, his suspicions were confirmed. Riften? Days later, Naruto's first impression of Riften wasn't a pleasant one. Not by any means. Not only had the guard tried to extort them at the gate for which he was now nursing an arrow to the knee, but the place looked as rundown as any other hovel. He scented fish in the canals below alongside fear and awe in the guards as he passed them by. Evidently their reputation as Dragonborn had already made them well known. Although the language of Skyrim escaped his tongue, he was pleased to find that Azora's blessing still sustained itself. He could understand everyone now, but replying remained beyond him. It was as if an unseen force stayed his tongue, denying him the chance to speak Tamralids. Clever, Azura. If she'd made her blessing permanent, he wouldn't have had anything more to do with her. By leaving him able to understand, to comprehend, but not reply, she was practically forcing him to seek her out in Winterhold. But for now, according to Isabel, they had a matron to kill. Naruto wasn't sure how he felt about that, killing an innocent in cold blood. All that changed when they stepped inside Honor Hall Orphanage. Fear. He didn't need to speak so much as a lick of English. He could taste the fear and oppression in the air. He could see the bruises on the children's faces, the sorrow in their eyes. When he dipped into sage mode, he nearly went mad from the raw emotions swirling around him. Anger, hate. And then he saw her. Grelod. She was an old woman, her voice raw and scratchy as though she'd been inhaling smoke all her life. Her very presence was steeped in foulness and hatred. The very sight of her caused him to be irate. What she said next made him want to lash out and flay the flesh from her bones. Those who shirk their duties will get an extra beating. Do I make myself clear? Yes, Grelod. The children replied despondently. And one more thing. I will hear no more talk of adoptions. None of you riffraff is getting adopted. Ever. Nobody needs you. Nobody wants you. That, my darlings, is why you're here. Why you will always be here, until the day you come of age and get thrown into that wide, horrible world. Now, what do you all say? We love you, Grelod. They answered softly, sadly. Thank you for your kindness. Kindness? Naruto felt this blood boil, seething in his veins like so much hot steam. That's better. Now scurry off, my little gutter snipes, before I. The rest of her words dissolved into meaningless gibberish as Zora's blessing had finally worn off. That didn't matter. He'd heard enough. He caught Isabel's eye and jerked his chin in the deer. Was a moment of silence between the two of them as she caught his meaning. Follow me. Then he turned his gaze upon Lydia and indicated the door. For a moment it looked as though the housecarl might protest, but then she realized he did not wish for her to leave, but rather, stand guard. In the end she merely nodded and stood watch at the door, distracting Constance from the dark deed that was about to be done. Constance, for her part, spared only a passing glance at the heavily armed strangers that strode into the orphanage. Oi! What are you going to do? What needs to be done? Naruto calmly stepped past Constance and towards Gerloid, ignoring the latter's words. He slipped into the outer hall, followed the old hag towards room, discreetly locking the door behind him. Having accomplished this task, he paced after her, his footfalls fleet upon the floor. Isabel slipped after him, not nearly as stealthy, but in the end it didn't matter. Oi, Ona. Naruto barked at Grelod. Hey, woman, by shore. What do you want? She grumbled at him. Don't tell me you're here to adopt one of those brats? Her wrinkled face narrowed in anger and contempt. Well, I won't have it, Something snapped inside of Naruto. Almost before he knew it, he was strangling her. His fingers were wrapped white-knuckled around the old hag's throat, squeezing with such force he thought her eyes might burst like ripe grapes. But they did not burst. Instead they began to bulge, growing larger and larger as he lifted her up off the floor. Teme. His words were a bleak, barren hiss. I swore I wouldn't kill an innocent, but you. You're not an innocent. You're too foul. Too set in your ways, too old, too cruel, too everything. He began to shake her, then rattling her frail form with such force it was a miracle he didn't simply shake her apart. Grelod's mouth was working wordlessly, her face purpling as she struggled in vain to draw air into her lungs. She did not succeed. Her feet kicked feebly against his chest, but to no avail. He was seeing red now, great, unholy red as he wrenched the life. Isabel snapped her fingers together and a blue glow engulfed Grelod. Soul trap. Naruto had just enough time for this thought before the lithe Nord bounded forward and thrust her sword deep into Grelod's stomach. A dull crunch greeted her steel sword as it thrust upward through the old woman's ribs and emerged out the other side. The silence was deafening. Naruto bit back a growl. He knew Isabel hated Grelod, but damn it, she was being greedy. This was his kill, it was his right. A sickening crack heralded the end of a life, a wrecked soul sent to the void. One that no one would miss. Grelod dropped to the floor in a lifeless heap, bleeding profusely from where she'd been stabbed, her head lolling uselessly aside. There could be no doubting it now. Grelod the kind was dead. Naruto had no doubts of this as Isabel ripped her sword free in a blinding flourish and began discreetly cleaning the blood from her blade like a true professional. She didn't seem to care that she'd gotten blood on her face, or anywhere else for that matter. He watched her rip a piece of cloth from Grelod's dress and wipe it across the steel, unfazed by the ever-growing puddle of blood at their feet. Oi! Isabel did not respond. Oi! Naruto tried again. Still no response. Oi! Naruto glared bloody red daggers at her, but she refused to meet his gaze, seemingly intent upon her weapon. Finally he sighed, produced a wet cloth, and stepped forward to begin to clean her face. Isabel started at his touch, her eyes growing large and wide, but she did not shy aside. She was quivering, he realized. Her fingers worked woodenly at her battered blade, scrubbing uselessly upon the now clean steel. Tears stood in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall, and for the life of him he couldn't understand why. Then he did. Realization dawned upon him like a thunderclap. Isabel had never killed in cold blood before. Females, Kurama snorted. Why do they always go lily-livered on us at the worst times? Beats me. Naruto wasn't sure when or why he embraced her, only that he did. His arms drew her close, hands pulled her face into his shoulder, fingers stroked at her dark tresses. She murmured something that sounded a great deal like nonsensical gibberish and he couldn't understand a word of. Not knowing what else to do, he stroked at her back, trying his utmost to soothe her. Yosh, it'll be okay. Incredibly, she seemed to understand him. Her sniffles softened and slowly, gradually, she seemed to compose herself. After a long instant she finally wriggled out of his grasp and looked up at him. Jade-pierced azure, held it, pinioned it to the ground. And Isabel wondered, how long had it been since someone had seen her cry? Too long. The last time she'd cried had been at her father's funeral. She considered herself a hard Nord, a true daughter of Skyrim. She'd sworn never to cry again, not until she found her mother. And yet here and now she found herself quivering like a little girl. railing against the knowledge that she'd killed an unarmed woman in cold blood. Granted, Grelot had probably deserved such a death, but Boethiah's ass, she hadn't thought she'd feel this guilty. Daijobu. Isabelle knew that word. It's alright. Naruto was smiling that resigned smile of his, saying it was alright, that he would take responsibility for her kill. By sure, how did he put up with her? She had once asked herself the same question days before, and now she found herself asking it again. What does he see in me, that he would stay by me so? Almost before she knew what was happening, she was reaching for him, her fingers cupping his whiskered cheek. Naruto. That was when the door flung itself open, revealing a sheepish-looking Lydia. Before either Dragonborn had a chance to inquire as to her presence, someone stepped up behind her and shoved their house Carl forward a half-pace, all but thrusting her from the doorway and into their arms. Halt, in the name of the Jarl. Behind her stood a score of Riften guards, and behind them one could clearly hear the children celebrating Grelot's death. Naruto's attention remained fixated upon the former, rather than the latter. Well now, in all of the excitement, he'd completely forgotten what might happen if the guards were alerted. And they most certainly were alerted. Out of the corner of his eye, he could see Constance ushering the children into their rooms and away from the commotion, placing them safely out of harm's way. Well, this certainly makes things easier. Naruto chuckled and raised his hands. So they'd been caught after all. No matter. Now that Constance and the children were out of the way. Can I just say one thing? Isabelle asked softly. Aye, and what might that be, lass? One of guards replied. Isabelle exchanged a pointed look with Naruto, her intent blatantly clear. Ah. The blonde grinned a devilish grin and Inhalred mightily in the same instant as she. The guards had all but an instant to realize what they had in mind, what they meant to do, and in that instant, Naruto and Isabelle yanked Lydia behind them, turned back toward the guards, and exhaled. For what reason does man persist? What motivates him to arise in the morning and take up arms against what opposes him? Is it his reputation? Nothing so hollow. Is it his innate sense of direction? Hardly viable and widely unreliable. So why does man continue to move forward? Simple. It is for the glory of overcoming any obstacle he encounters. Let the enemies raise their weapons in defiance. Let fate deal out all it can. For man will not stop moving. And without a challenge there is no glory. Silence, my brother, sleep well. 4 years ago, Naruto would have bolted out of the bed with an angry hiss. He would have woken with a bolt, demanded an explanation for his abduction, screamed and sputtered until he gained his answers, all the while demanding to know how this woman spoke his language. But he was no longer the impulsive fool he'd once been. Fighting the war changed you. Made you think. Rationalize. When he opened his eyes, he realized what his younger self wouldn't have. Panicking would get him absolutely nowhere. So instead of throwing a fit, Naruto levered himself up on his elbows and rose from the bed, moving with an exaggerated slowness, flexing his fingers and toes, testing them for full range of movement. He found himself peering up at a woman in the rafters of what appeared to be a shack, her body wreathed in dark garments, her face hidden by a cowl. Her left leg swung lazily over the edge, taunting him as she hung just out of what would have been a normal man's reach. Thankfully Naruto wasn't normal, but attacking and hog-tying the woman were the furthest things from his mind at present. Well, not entirely. He'd have a mind to take this young woman over his knee and spank her for drugging him, hard. Oh ho, I like the way you think. He didn't need to look to see Kurama's grin. I wouldn't mind teaching her a lesson, either. This is the last time we sleep under the stars. Naruto chastised himself. Amen. Upon escaping from Riften, the guards hot on their heels, they'd successfully returned to Aventus in Windhelm and informed him of Grelot's unfortunate demise. After singing his praises of the Dark Brotherhood, the boy had rewarded the three of them with a family heirloom, which turned out to be nothing more than a fancy silver plate of little to no real value. Isabelle had spoken precious little upon completing that quest, much to their chagrin, but she'd been vehement that they returned to Whiterun. Killing Grelot had shaken her somewhat. Naruto had seen in his every glance. Isabelle was accustomed to honorable combat. Fighting against a worthy and armed foe, not killing an unarmed albeit wicked old crone of a woman. Naruto hadn't lost so much as a wink of sleep over it. When you were born and bred to defend your village at any cost, you accepted that sometimes a few dirty deeds had to be done were necessary to keep the people safe. No shinobi was she, that Isabelle. She had been vehement that they returned to Whiterun, but with the latter being several days away, they were eventually forced to make camp in the wilderness. Naruto had volunteered for first watch while the women slept, opting to spend time with the fire and his thoughts than his companions. Shortly after twilight, something had stirred in the undergrowth, just on the edge of the firelight. Unthinking, he'd gone to investigate. No sooner had he done so than he felt a sharp prick in the neck. Whatever drug it was, it must have been a potent one. He hadn't been able to fight it off, but he had been able to holler before it drove him under. And now here he was. Naruto finished his subtle inspection of his body, pleased to find that whatever he'd been drugged with had long since run its course. He could feel chakra thrumming through his veins. ready to be unleashed in the less than likely event that this meeting took a turn for the worse. He took in his surroundings at a glance and confirmed his suppositions, found himself in a small shack for which he most certainly didn't have the key, but was otherwise unencumbered. He rose from the bed and reached for his weapons, regarding the cowled stranger with wary eyes and a warier smile. Her eyes creased slightly behind her cowl, a sign she was regarding him just as warily. She made a slight move with her right hand, reaching for a hidden knife, perhaps, but otherwise showed no sign of distress as he reclaimed his swords and scroll, buckling them onto his belt. "I'm afraid you have me at a disadvantage, miss." Astrid, the woman on the beam, supplied. "I assume you're the Dragonbane everyone's been talking about." Ah. Naruto felt a cold knot of dread begin to form, deep within his stomach. "You'd be correct then. Now, mind telling me why I can understand you?" "I see I've gotten your attention." He thought he saw her smile behind the cowl. "It's thanks to this little trinket." She reached beneath her jerkin to reveal an eerie-looking ebony necklace with nearly a dozen blood-red jewels etched into its facets. "I found it in some Akaviri tomb when I was a little girl. It's fascinating, really. With it, I can speak any language I desire. Within reason, of course. Unfortunately, it also seems to be cursed by them." Astrid tugged at it for a deliberate emphasis, and sure enough, the necklace didn't seem to budge. "I can't seem to take the damn thing off." A shrug within the dark ended her explanation. "Does that answer your question? Thanks for the history lesson." Naruto grunted. "Am I to assume you've taken my nakama captive as well?" "Them?" The assassin laughed. "Oh no, I have no interest in those two. A killer who weeps for her victims and a servile house carl are of absolutely no use to me. You, however, the way you strangled that woman in broad daylight without pause or preamble or even a care." Suddenly, she shivered, seeming to convulse from head to toe. It was so inspiring. Inspiring? Yup. We've got a good god, Naruto thought to himself, and here I thought Tobi was batshit crazy. But in the end, crazy really didn't matter. She may have separated him from Isabel and Lydia, but so long as he could move his body, so long as he had total access to his chakra, he was more than a match for this kidnapper. This weird woman who'd spirited him away in the middle of the night. He just had to keep her busy for a few minutes until he could plan his escape. "Is there a particular reason why you've kidnapped me?" "Does it matter?" Astrid asked. "You're warm, dry, and still very much alive. That's more than can be said for old Grelod." Despite himself, Naruto cringed. "You know about that?" "Half of Skyrim knows," she replied. "Old hag gets butchered in her own orphanage. Things like that tend to get around." "Oh, but don't misunderstand. I'm not criticizing. It was a good kill. Old crone had it coming. And you saved a group of urchins, to boot. Ah, but there is a slight problem. The last shinobi and undead Madara didn't count." Felt his smile twist into a frown. "Not sure I like where this is going. You see," Astrid continued, ignoring him, "that little Aratino boy was looking for the Dark Brotherhood. For me, and my associates. Grelod the Kind was, by all rights, a Dark Brotherhood contract. A kill. That you stole, from us. A kill you must repay." "Let me guess." Naruto scoffed. "You want me to kill someone?" This time, there could be no mistaking the smile behind her mask. "Well now. Funny you should ask. If you turn around, you'll notice my guests. I've collected them from. Well, that's not really important. The here and now. That's what matters. You see, there's a contract out on one of them, and that person can't leave this room alive. But, which one? Go on, see if you can figure it out. Make your choice. Make your kill. I just want to observe and admire a shinobi at work. After all, this is my first time seeing one of the Akaviri's ancestors up close." "Akaviri? You didn't know?" Astrid cocked her head. "My dear boy, you really are out of touch. If I didn't know better, I'd say you weren't even from this era." Pretty much, to himself. "Funny, I didn't think you were that much of a coward." Naruto bristled. He didn't care whose ancestor he was, no one talked to him like that. Without so much as a backwards glance he took them in, 3 hooded individuals, a man, a woman, and what the devil was that? A cross between a man and a cat? "I'll have no part of this lunacy," he hissed. "Let me leave, or I'll go through you." "Oh, but you will," Astrid replied, leaning forward on her haunches. "I know you. Killing's in your blood. Why try to resist it? It's not as though these 3 are innocents. They've each done terrible things in their lifetimes. Murder, mayhem, betrayal. One might even say they all deserve to die. Oh, and before you think about trying to escape, or simply breaking down the front door, I should warn you I've spelled this entire cabin against your chakra. Any attempt on your part to escape will result in quite the nasty backlash." "TCH. You don't believe me?" she challenged. "Fine, go ahead, try." "Gladly." Naruto spun around and cannoned into the nearmost wall as hard as he could. It was like striking steel. Ordinarily this wouldn't have posed a problem. He'd shredded far worse with his bare fists before, and he expected to do so again. The seemingly flimsy wall did more than hold. He bounced off it and crashed to the floor. He was up again in an instant, spitting his fury, Rasengan in hand, driving the sphere into the door. He succeeded only in producing the smallest of cracks before the sphere snuffed itself out of his hand. What the, told you? Astrid radiated smugness. You're welcome to try as many times as you like. Bitch. Naruto spit. Why, thank you. That's it, he all but snarled. Fuck this. Naruto dipped into Kyuubi's chakra cloak without a second thought. It was far easier to sense ill intent in this form than it was without. His gaze roamed the three figures, narrowed upon the one that looked to be more of a cross between a man and a cat. Strange creature, that. But his eyes were drawn elsewhere, to the malignant aura of ill intent surrounding the strange being. Cruelty. It stained the man like a second skin, seeping from his fur like a thing alive. Wicked. Malcontent. Evil. Naruto let the dagger fly without a second thought and the Khajiit fell, gurgling as the kunai sank hilt deep into his throat. Done, he snarled. Now let me out of here, Astrid laughed. The conniving Khajiit. Cat like that was sure to have enemies. It's no wonder you chose him. Didn't have much of a choice. Naruto groused to himself, but he didn't dare tell Astrid that. So who is it? Who had the contract? Oh, no, Astrid shook her head. Don't you understand? Guilt, innocence, right, wrong. Irrelevant. What matters is I ordered you to kill someone, and you obeyed. It felt good, didn't it? Holding one's life in the palm of your hand, deciding whether to live or die. Right. Ya crazy bitch. So, I'm free to go? Of course, she replied with a slight tilt of the head. And you've repaid your debt in full. Here's the key to the shack. Naruto's hand rose to snatch it up even as she tossed it at him. But why stop there? I say we take our relationship to the next level. I would like to officially extend to you an invitation to join my family. The Dark Brotherhood. In the southwest reaches of Skyrim, in Pine Forest, you'll find the entrance to our sanctuary. It's just beneath the road, hidden from view. I'll even present you with a map in your language, if you're so inclined. Who knows, you just might be able to find your friends again. But enough about those weaklings. When questioned by the Black Door, answer with the correct passphrase. Silence, my brother. Then you're in, and your new life begins. That's it. Naruto raised a hand to catch the map hurled at him. Sure enough, it was written in his language. Excellent. With this, at least he had a vague sense of direction, rather than being forced to flounder about in the wilds until he happened upon some civilization or something. That's it. Astrid confirmed, leaning back upon her perch. I've lowered the wards around the cabin. You're free to go. I'll see you at home. Right, then. Naruto peered at her for a moment longer, before finally turning his back on Astrid and advancing upon the remaining captives. He couldn't just leave them here after all. They certainly weren't innocent, but neither did their sins warrant death. He felt a touch better about himself as he undid their bindings as they, the man and the woman, blubbered their thanks and recompense in unintelligible gibberish. Nodding, Naruto unlocked the door, so as to allow them to leave first. Neither dared glance at Astrid as they passed outside. That woman hanging in the rafters obviously inspired more terror than any shinobi save himself possibly could. What do you think? He asked of Kurama. I think I'd like to give this Astrid woman a paddling. Naruto scowled. I didn't ask that. Well then, if you're wondering about this Dark Brotherhood, I'd say join them. What could possibly go wrong? I dunno. Everything, oh ye of little faith? Oh ye of too much faith. Naruto snapped back. This is always happening because of you. Or sure, blame the fox. I am blaming you, Bakakitsune. Oh, and one more thing. What? Naruto roared, whirling to face Astrid, irate at her interruption. It saved his life. I've changed my mind, she announced abruptly, rising from the beam in a fluid motion. I think I'd like to see your skills for myself firsthand. Why you little blighter? Naruto was already in motion, his head lurching forward just as the knife flew from her fingers. He caught the deadly blade between his teeth, its point dangling mere millimeters from his tongue. Even as he spat it into the floor, Astrid was flying at him, her body a blur of red and black as she descended from the beam. She was fast, for a woman. Her blade actually grazed his cheek, actually sapped a bit of life force from him before he backhanded her with his offhand, flinging Astrid halfway across the shack. Damn, but that felt good. Watching her tumble, he raised an arm and beckoned with one hand, much like a certain bushy-browed shinobi once had. Come to daddy, he called after her. Astrid landed in a tangle of arms and legs, but she was tenacious. Even as she struck the floor, she bounded upright, using the nearby wall as a springboard to launch herself at him. But this time, Naruto was ready. His body glided out of the path of her blade and struck down in the same instant, chopping at her blade arm with a bare hand, preventing the deadly dagger from touching him a second time. Astrid hissed in surprise, the breath emerging as a soft snarl, transforming into a sudden whoosh and an explosive retort as the blonde's fist, his remaining hand cannoned upwards and into her stomach, the chakra-enhanced punch shearing through her leather jerkin, bending her body double, as though it were made of cardboard. Oof. What, is that it? Naruto chuckled, his breath warm against her ear as he reached down for her and drew her over his knee. I expected more from the leader of the Dark Brotherhood. Ordinarily he took no pleasure in such things, but this woman needed to be taught a lesson, of the most severe sort. He wouldn't kill her. Oh, no, that was far too merciful. He would embarrass her. Before Astrid could guess at what he was up to, he swatted her right on the ass with his open palm. Hard. Astrid surprised him. He'd half expected her to bid her tongue defy him with her silence. Instead, the leader of the Dark Brotherhood, she squealed like a little girl receiving a spanking at the hands of her father. It was almost laughable. No, it was laughable. So this is what assassins are reduced to in this age. Kurama scoffed. Pity. Although I must admit, she had that coming. You've been a bad girl, Astrid. He mocked. Now I'll have to punish you. Astrid bucked then, the back of her head smashing into his nose, shattering cartilage. Naruto laughed. Laughed even as blooded guan poured into his mouth. There was some fight in this one after all. Tasted blood in his mouth. He let her go and she lunged at him, driving her knife home for the kill. Too slow. Both arms came up, locking around her in a vicious vice, ripping the blade from her hand and sending it clattering across the floor. He drew her close with a sharp tug and the mouth of her cowl flopped back from the motion, laying bare her face for him to see. Huh. She was younger than he'd expected her to be, somewhere in her mind to late 20s if not early 30s. He was still mulling the matter over when she kissed him, her lips jarring violently against his. Naruto had all of an instant to register the sudden lip lock before he tasted an unfamiliar burn against his lips. Poison. He jerked back as if he'd been burned, jarring himself free from her and shoving himself against the nearest wall, chakra already burning through his veins, working to purge his system of the taint. Hers was a powerful poison, but even it paled in comparison to Kyuubi's chakra. Half of it had burned away by the time he'd shoved Astrid. Once he'd reclaimed his footing, all save the faintest of traces had been purged from his body. Inwardly he swore. Why was it that every man, woman, and beast was trying to kill him? It was enough to make a man think he was unwelcome in these parts. Clever bitch. Kurama commended. Another 3 seconds and her toxin might have had us there. Too clever. Naruto replied, leering at Astrid. We'll have to do something about her. By sigh this. Astrid pulled back, breathless. You really are something, Dragonbane. Be it swordplay or poison, I cannot hope best you. You truly are worthy of your title as shinobi. She must have read the anger in his eye because her expression became wary. I trust you haven't taken offense. I just wanted to test your skills. Nothing personal. Naruto did take it personally. You tried to kill me, well, there is that. She sniffed. But I only wished to test your abilities. Had I been trying, you would have sustained more than a mere cut. And had I been trying, I would have shoved a Rasen Shuriken up your ass. Well, I have no idea what a Rasen Shuriken is, but I'd very much appreciate it if you didn't. Besides, she stepped to him light as an errant breeze. Killers of our caliber have to stick together. Her lips touched on his cheek, a feather's brush, meant to irritate and provoke. It almost worked. Naruto bristled and prepared to make good on his threat. You, as I said before. See you at home. When he turned to address her, she was gone in a swirl of shadow. Another bit of eldritch magic at work, no doubt. HRMPH. A grunt from his tenant confirmed his suspicions. I get the succinct feeling we haven't seen the last of her. For my sake, I hope you're wrong. Naruto grunted as he stalked aside. Great, now he was hungry and horny. He swung open the door, and found himself presented with an unfamiliar sight. Miles of wilderness stretched out before him, leaving him staring in sheer peaks and towering forests eclipsing the rising sun. A river roared several yards away, adding an almost surreal backdrop to the early morning. Naruto couldn't help himself. He gawped. This place stood to be a far cry from the sprawling plains of Whiterun, its warm, humid air a stark contrast in the face of the mountains and their chill. To be honest, he didn't even know where he was. One thought leapt to the forefront of his mind. Where the bloody hell am I? A mighty roar answered him in the distance. Naruto spat, shading his eyes against the rising sun. Sure enough, a dragon's silhouette could be seen overhead swooping down towards him. For a split second he thought it might be Alduin, but no, this dragon was smaller, if only slightly so. Regardless, it was certainly larger than the last. Had he known anything of the dragons themselves, he might have realized his peril, understood that this beast was an elder dragon, second only to Alduin himself. Its rust-colored scales glinted like fire as the sunlight splayed across them, and judging by its trajectory the beast was well aware of him. And it sounded to be more than a little hungry. Well then, two could play that game. Are you thinking what I'm thinking? Come to think of it, he hadn't had a meal in several hours now. That broth Isabel fed him had done little to settle his stomach. Even now he could feel it growling. And what better meal than a dragon? Naruto licked at his lips and drew his blade, leaving time for only 3 words before the beast swooped down upon him spewing fire and flame, and they weren't fus aro da. Time for dinner, A.N. And there you have it, not my best take on the world of Skyrim, I know, but it is my first. And definitely one of the most amusing. As you can see, I took a sharp turn from the norm here, as Astrid kidnapped Naruto and offered him a place in the Dark Brotherhood. She also knows a great deal about the Akaviri, which, surprise surprise, are Naruto's descendants, that is to say, hailing from the shinobi themselves. Alas, our favorite blonde now finds himself separated from Isabel and Lydia left to fend for himself, wandering in the wilds of Skyrim. What could possibly go wrong? In the infamous words of our hero. Everything, he's barely on his own, and already he's run into a dragon, deadly winged beasts aside, if you thought Naruto was a troublemaker before. Just wait, till you see what he does next chapter, unsupervised. Chaos is set to ensue as of next chapter with the Dark Brotherhood, Daedra, and the Thieves Guild. I hope you're looking forward to it as much as I am. There's so much more to come. The College of Winterhold, not to mention finding Isabel's mother and the Daedric weapons. Thieves Guild. The Companions. The Dark Brotherhood. And of course, my personal favorite, Dawnguard. Look forward to it all, readers. So, in the immortal words Atlas. Review, would you kindly? And enjoy the preview. 'Tis a surprise, sorry if it's rough. Preview. The full moon hung over a massacre. Fus ro da. The raiders had just enough time to register the sound of the Dragonbane's voice before he shouted them apart. His very words flinging them from their perch atop the wagon, dashing them upon the unyielding earth below with all the force of 1,000 hammers. One of the marauders, an Imperial, managed to reclaim his footing just long enough for an arrow to sink into his knee. The buffoon dropped like a sack of potatoes, all but squealing his agony to the 8 divines for allowing this to happen. My knee, he blubbered, why is it always my knee? Another arrow lanced out of the dark, ripping into his throat, silencing his cries in the dark. One down. What an oblivion was that? An orc growled, just before a third shaft sank into his eye and leapt out the other side. His body bobbed back and forth for a moment, as though it couldn't decide which way it ought to fall if at all. Finally it pitched forward into the snow and lay still in an ever-growing puddle of black ichor. 2 down. Where is this one hiding? The lone female of their group, a mangy-looking Khajiit, wheeled this way and that, thrusting her torch before her like a burning brand to ward off evil. Something large dropped down on her from behind and ripped her into the treetops before she could utter so much as a scream. Her lifeless corpse dropped seconds later, bearing a grisly slash across its trachea. Someone screamed as they saw her, sucking in a gasping breath before the shadow swooped back up into the trees a second time. 3 down. Show yourself, creature. Their leader, a swarthy-looking Nord in steel armor, demanded of their unseen foe. There was a silence. Then, Yald Tor Shul. A tidal wave of flame roared out of the darkness and rushed over the remaining bandits, setting their fur armors afire. Several flung themselves shrieking into the drifts in a desperate effort to quell the flames. Others burned where they stood, the flesh liquefying from their bones, leaving Naadans behind. The leader fared better than most. He'd been able to make it to the drifts before the others, and as such he had just enough time to witness the slaughter of his men. It was as if a shadow drifted amongst them, unaffected by blade or spell. The shade dealt death whenever it struck, sparing none. Something dropped down on the Nord's back, driving his face deeper into the drifts. Strong hands locked around his neck and began straining ligaments. No, wait, he begged. Mercy, I cannot best you. Too little, too late. A savage twist sent him to Sovngarde. The last thing he heard was the man's swelling shout booming all around him. Fus ro da. Those few that survived that verbal abuse soon met their end at the blonde's blades. Heads rolled, limbs flopped away, innards were spilled into the snow. The battle, if it could be called such, ended in an instant. Naruto took a long moment to survey the scene of the masses, taking in the slaughtered souls with a wary glance. They hadn't stood a chance. Blood, none of it his own, stained the snow crimson. Bodies lay strewn about in a grisly parody of broken bundles. The sight of it did a number on most, but not Naruto. He simply shook his head at their loss and continued on his way. A soft, snuffling sound drew his attention, brought him up short. Naruto craned his neck toward the sound. It was coming from the carriage. But how could that be? It was little more than a pile of timber, slashed to bits by the bandits. Padding forward, the last shinobi holstered his bow and blade, made as if to reach for the door. Imagine his surprise when it swung open of its own accord. There, huddled inside the ruined remains of the carriage, was a child. But not just any child. An elf? Naruto shook his head, vaguely recalling what little he'd seen of them. This continent truly was a strange place. This was a high elf barely on her 5th year. He peered at her and she gazed back at him with large golden eyes full of fear and wonder. Remarkably, she didn't seem to be hurt. She chattered something at him. Sure enough, he didn't understand a word. Naruto stared at the elven girl for a long moment before scratching the back of his head. He couldn't understand a single syllable she'd said. Well now, he wondered aloud. What the devil am I going to do with you, little one? Well now, what am I going to do with you? Surprised, the full moon hung over a massacre. Full and brimming with sorrow, it bore witness to a crimson slaughter, the like of which was quite common in the waste Skyrim. But this massacre had taken an unexpected turn, because a certain blonde had just so happened upon it. He'd seen the bodies in the snow, the scarlet stains bleaching the snows a deep, cherry red. Naturally, he'd reacted as only a new dragonborn could. Fus ro da. The raiders had just enough time to register the sound of the Dragonbane's voice before he shouted them apart. His very words flinging them from their perch atop the wagon, dashing them upon the unyielding earth below with all the force of 1,000 hammers. One of the marauders, an Imperial, managed to reclaim his footing just long enough for an arrow to sink into his knee. The buffoon dropped like a sack of potatoes, all but squealing his agony to the 8 divines for allowing this to happen. My knee, he blubbered. Why is it always my knee? Another arrow lanced out of the dark, ripping into his throat, silencing his cries in the dark. One down. What in oblivion was that? An orc growled, just before a third shaft sank into his eye and leapt out the other side. His body bobbed back and forth for a moment, as though it couldn't decide which way it ought to fall if at all. Finally it pitched forward into the snow and lay still in an ever-growing puddle of black ichor. 2 down. Where is this one hiding? The lone female of their group, a mangy-looking Khajiit, wheeled this way and that, thrusting her torch before her like a burning brand to ward off evil. Something large dropped down on her from behind and ripped her into the treetops before she could utter so much as a scream. Her lifeless corpse dropped seconds later, bearing a grisly slash across its trachea. Someone screamed as they saw her, sucking in a gasping breath before the shadow swooped back up into the trees a second time. 3 down. Show yourself, creature. The bandits' leader, a swarthy-looking Nord in steel armor, demanded of their unseen foe. There was a silence. Then another shout, this one recently earned, ripped through the night. Yald Tor Shul. A tidal wave of flame roared out of the darkness and rushed over the remaining bandits, setting their fur armors afire. Several flung themselves shrieking into the drifts in a desperate effort to quell the flames. Others burned where they stood, the flesh liquefying from their bones, leaving naught but charred skeletons behind. The leader fared better than most. He'd been able to make it to the drifts before the others, and as such he had just enough time to witness the slaughter of his men. It was as if a shadow drifted amongst them, unaffected by blade or spell. Not man nor beast, but ghost, a creature not of this realm. The sinister shade dealt death whenever it struck, sparing none. Not even a single soul was granted recompense from the judgment of his blade, nor the might of his strength. The bandit leader had just enough time to force himself up onto his elbows. Before it found him, something dropped down on the Nord's back, driving his face deeper into the drifts. Strong hands locked around his neck and began straining ligaments. No, wait, he begged. Mercy, I cannot best you. A string of gibberish hissed into his ears. Had he been able to understand them, he might have heard. You deserve no mercy. No further words were spared. A savage twist sent the bandit to Sovngarde. The last thing he heard was the man's swelling shout booming all around him. Fus ro da. Those few that survived that verbal abuse soon met their end at the blonde's blades. Heads rolled, limbs flopped away, innards were spilled into the snow. The battle, if it could be called such, ended in an instant. Naruto took a long moment to survey the scene of the masses, taking in the slaughtered souls with a wary glance. They hadn't stood a chance. Blood, none of it his own, stained the snow crimson. Bodies lay strewn about in a grisly parody of broken bundles. The sight of it did a number on most, but not Naruto. He simply shook his head at their loss and continued on his way. It was like this everywhere he went, if not bandits, then wolves, if not wolves, vampires. Everything in this god-forsaken world seemed to be intent to kill him. Was it too much to ask for a little kindness? Was it really so difficult? A soft, snuffling sound drew his attention, brought him up short. You hear that? Kurama hissed. Aye. Naruto craned his neck toward the sound. It was coming from the carriage, but how could that be? It was little more than a pile of timber, slashed to bits by the bandits. Padding forward, the last shinobi holstered his bow and blade, made as if to reach for the door. Imagine his surprise when it swung open of its own accord. There, huddled inside the ruined remains of the carriage, was a child. But not just any child. An elf. Naruto shook his head, vaguely recalling what little he'd seen of them. This continent truly was a strange place. This was a little girl barely on her 7th or 8th year. He peered down at her in disbelief. And she gazed back at him with large sapphire eyes full of fear and wonder. But she didn't look entirely elfish, either. Whatever the case, she didn't seem to be hurt. Now, where did you come from? Naruto murmured. She chattered something at him. Sure enough, he didn't understand a word. He stared at the elven girl for a long moment before scratching the back of his head, a gesture of futility. He couldn't understand a single syllable she'd said. Well now, he wondered aloud, what the devil am I going to do with you, little one? I can't understand you, and no doubt you haven't understood a single word I've been saying. But let's get you cleaned up. She did not squirm when he began to clean her face of blood, scrubbing at her gray dress. Apparently she was still in shock. And why shouldn't she be? She'd just lost both her parents to marauders. It was a small miracle those same bandits hadn't taken her life. Poor thing. If he hadn't happened by just now, she would have been dead. Or worse. One so young didn't deserve such a fate, she didn't. Gods, I'm so pissed right now. Watch it, brat. My chakra is leaking out. Asterisk and %. Asterisk. The little one asked something as she saw his red eyes. Impossibly, she wasn't afraid of this sudden change. With an effort, the blonde calmed himself, willing his eyes to return to their sapphiric shade. She was still staring at him, her head cocked aside, one hand parting the long curtain of her raven tresses. The hell am I gonna do with you? Naruto wondered aloud. You can't understand me, and I sure as hell can't understand you. Remarkably, her stomach chose that moment to growl. Grr. The shinobi and the elf stared at one another in disbelief. The silence didn't last long. Well now, that I can understand. Naruto chortled to himself. Let's get you something to eat, shall we? As misfortune would have it, the bandits didn't have any food on them. Plenty of gold, but nothing to eat whatsoever, not even a speck. This didn't daunt Naruto in the slightest. Years as a shinobi had taught him to forage for food under harsh conditions. It wasn't long before he had a pair of rabbits for them both. A meal so scrawny as this would barely amount to a snack for him. But it was more than a meal for her. With that in mind, he set to work building the fire the only way a shinobi could. Lacking flint and or tinder to utilize, he simply gave the ground a good stomp, creating a small divot in the snowy earth, which he began filling with sticks and encircling it with stones. Deeming his work satisfactory, the Dragonbane inhaled deeply and uttered a single word, imbuing with his will and focus. It might have been wiser to simply use a fire jutsu, but ever since acquiring it, he'd been dying to use his new shout whenever the opportunity arose. Besides, it was cool. Y'all. The little elven girl jumped in surprise, her bright eyes jarred sight, flicking to the sudden flames flicking across the branches. Within moments they had a strong fire growing. The blonde tended to it as best he could, stoking the flames high. Might have spooked her a little there, boy. What? Naruto frowned. It's just a fire, not need to panic. She continued to eye him warily. It wasn't until he began preparing dinner that she finally took her attention off of him. A few minutes of skinning and cooking them over the fire rendered the rabbits good enough to eat. He offered her a haunch, extending the leg for her to take. You gonna eat this? He mimed chewing on his own leg. A gesture that did not go unnoticed by the little lass. She needed no further encouragement, snatching right out of his hands and digging in with a ferocity that surprised him for one so small. She dug right in, teeth sinking into the meat and tearing with all her might. It was quite the sight. Now that he looked at her, he realized she wasn't a high elf at all. Her features were too human, barring those curved ears and bright eyes. And her skin was remarkably pale, not the jaundiced color of a pureblood. As if she hadn't spent so much as a single day in the sun, more like a cross between human and elf then, he surmised. A hybrid? Just thinking about this made his head hurt. It didn't matter whether she was part elf, human or otherwise, he wasn't about to let harm come to her. I'm sorry about your parents. Naruto didn't know why, but he found himself apologizing again as her little mouth worked around the meat. Maybe if I'd made it sooner. The half-elf blinked at him with her large, sad eyes. Right. He facepalmed, forgot about that. You have no idea what I'm saying. Look, in any case, I'm going to need something to call you, until we reach the next town. Maybe I can find someone to take care of you there, but first things first. Naruto. He pointed to himself, slowly enunciating each syllable. Naruto. There was a silence. Naruto? She repeated his name slowly, the foreign syllables sounding forced and harsh on her tongue. Arwen. The girl replied, finally understanding. Arwen. Arwen. He repeated. Arwen. A nod. Naruto. They both smiled, and despite himself, the Dragonbane laughed. Kid, I think you and I are gonna get along just fine. And there you have it, not my best take on the world of Skyrim, I know, but it is my first. And definitely one of the most amusing. As you can see, I took a sharp turn from the norm here, as Naruto found himself separated from his fellow Dragonborn and Lydia, leaving him to strike out on his own. For those of you who are Lord of the Rings fans, I'm sure you recognize the name Arun. No, it's by far my most favorite elven name, and though this little one is merely a hybrid of human and elf, the name just stuck somehow. Hope you liked it. Chaos is set to ensue as of next chapter with the Dark Brotherhood, Daedra, and the Thieves Guild. I hope you're looking forward to it as much as I am. There's so much more to come. The College of Winterhold, not to mention finding Isabel's mother and the Daedric weapons. Thieves Guild. the companions, the Dark Brotherhood, and of course, my personal favorite, Dawnguard. Look forward to it all, readers. So, in the immortal words Atlas. Review, would you kindly? And of course, enjoy the preview. Preview, Naruto glanced down at the map, then back the monument again. His winter furs ruffling softly in the breeze. He risked a glance down at his charge. Despite his offer to carry her, the little half-elf had been adamant to follow him on her own up the mountain. It was almost humorous seeing her struggle through the snow. Although they still couldn't understand one another, there were such things as silent communication. But even a means of communication meant nothing when it came to the blonde's sense of direction. He'd been headed for Marthal in search of the shrine, but now found himself on the fringes of Winterhold. They'd encountered vampires, werewolves, bandits and all manner of beasts and natural disasters, but still, until this very moment, he had thought himself hopelessly lost. But no longer. They'd been headed in the right direction all along. Because there it was. The shrine. The cold nipped at this nose, threatening to gnaw it off if he didn't keep moving. Arwen was faring even worse. Sprightly little thing that she was. She'd been struggling after him for what felt like an eternity, refusing to leave despite knowing Winterhold was only a few miles in an opposite direction. Her determination was almost admirable. Like having a kid of your own, Kurama chortled. Despite the blizzard raging around them, the blonde flushed, his attention falling once more upon little Arwen. It was true that he'd come to think of her as more than just a stray over the last month. Many things had changed, and just his facial hair. Gah, who knew sporting a beard could be so damned itchy. But regardless, Arwen had become his ward of sorts. He'd even grown to care for her. And Naruto. She whispered through chattering teeth, his name a silent plea for him to slow down. The blonde did more than that. With a sudden and about face he trekked back towards her, reached down, and scooped the shivering elf into his arms, warming her with his strength in spite of her shivering. She squirmed a moment longer before finally recognizing the futility of her efforts, contenting herself to snuggle close to his warm chest and soak up as much heat as she possibly could. Arwen. He used her name to get the girl's attention, preventing her from squirming. She peered up at him from within her furry cloak, blue eyes petulant. Naruto flicked her in the nose, earning a harsh puff of steam from her mouth for his efforts. Bah, ka. She stuck out her tongue in quiet defiance. Naruto resolutely ignored his ward and, still carrying her, returned his attention to the summit. Yep, he murmured. This has gotta be it. If all went well today, he just might be able to shatter this infernal language barrier. Or not. He strode up the steps to the shrine with long, strong strides. In Hindi SGHT, he didn't make it very far. He'd only just cleared the stairwell itself before they saw the priestess kneeling before the shrine in silent benediction for her Daedric mistress. He'd just enough time to realize she was a dark elf before a thunderclap struck him, his entire world fading to black and gray. Greetings, mortal. A familiar voice resounded in his mind. I am pleased to see that you made it to my shrine safely. As is my sister, Nocturnal. She appears to have taken an unhealed interest in you and your continued progress. And you seem to have picked up a stray since I saw you last. Despite the trepidation Naruto felt, he managed a sarcastic smile. Hello yourself. Azura. But your journey is not yet over. Speak to my priestess. She has a task for you. Once you have completed it, I will grant you that which you seek. The Dragonbane's deadpan was barely concealed. There's always a catch, isn't there, Papa? Blooded Arwen did not like the snow, nor did she enjoy the mountains for that matter. They were cold, inhospitable, uncomfortable, not to mention teeming with wolves and bandits. Arwen didn't like them much, either. Bandits were responsible for the loss of her parents, and wolves. Well, she was practically a snack for those large dogs of Skyrim. That she had not yet been eaten, or killed, or worse was something of a miracle. Her salvations owed as much to their fear of her protector as the powerful albeit unstable magics she herself wielded. Alone, one would be enough to make them wary. Together, almost invincible? But even the relative safety afforded by the large man's presence wasn't enough to drive the cold from her flesh, nor the nip from the air. The little half-elf resolutely pushed the snow out of her dark tresses, seeking to smooth her ebony locks in spite of the frosty atmosphere. A cold breeze chose to nip at her cheeks in that very moment, the bitter wind cutting almost to the bone in spite of the heavy fur coat she wore. Papa had been kind enough to procure it for her before they made their journey. Not her old papa, the one now buried WTH Mama in the frigid plains, her new papa. Naruto. Nearly a month had passed since this enigmatic man had rescued her from the burning caravan, since he'd buried her parents and laid them to rest. In those 30 days he'd spoken to her almost every day, trying nigh but impossibly to impart some knowledge of his language between his attempts to train her. 28 days ago, she hadn't known how to defend herself without magic, let alone wield a weapon. Not anymore. Idly she fingered the hilt of her knife, her small fingers wrapping around its worn handle. Naruto might not speak a word of English or Elvish, but in all other things he was a quick study. For example, a month ago, he looked at a forge in wonderment and awe. Now, 30 days after the fact, he was a master smith, adept at all but the most masterful intricacies of crafting weapons and armor. This steel dagger at her waist was but the first of many creations his gift to her so that, should the worst come to pass, she would have a way to protect herself. Arwen had cherished the knife ever since. Arwen didn't know how she felt about that. Granted, her attitudes had shifted over the course of the last 4 weeks. She no longer viewed the blonde as a vagabond who'd abandon her at the drop of the hat but rather a guardian of sorts. More than that, a protector. Papa. She didn't know how to convey that to him with this barrier between them, the insurmountable wall that their differing tongues had erected. Naruto had tried utmost to teach her his language but it was slow going. Arwen knew only a few words. Stop and go chief amongst them. Oh, and there was also danger. Arwen yelped as an iron arrow whistled past her head, its harrowing tip opening a thin rent in the snow-white flesh of her right cheek. Already she could feel the wound beginning to burn with the telltale signs of poison, the pain causing fresh tears of pain to spring to her eyes. But her cry had garnered Papa's attention, and even as she shimmied backwards, the blonde was bounding forward into the pass, bellowing like a bear. His harsh roar froze the men where they'd hoped to ambush unsuspecting travelers. But Naruto was no base prey. Y'all, Tor, Shul, the Dragonbane barked thrice, the deep boom of his voice rippling through the mountains, and the bandits burned. One man leapt, screaming from where he'd been crouched behind the boulder, swatting ineffectually at the fires spreading across his flesh. Others howled and threw themselves into a drift to extinguish the flames, and still others failed entirely, their bodies vanishing in a shroud of flame as the blonde spat yet again, a swath of angry orange sweeping them down to their doom on the mountainside. Of the band of 10 that had chosen to assault them, only 5 remained. A small part of Arwen realized these men were about to die, and yet she couldn't muster up any pity for them. In her mind's eye, these men were no different than the marauders who had taken her parents away. There had been no offer of parley then, and there would be none, now. It was a frightening thing for a young girl to think, let alone a half-elf, but these were her thoughts as Papa strode forward, knives in hand. What had he called them? Kunai? Whatever the case, Arwen couldn't bring herself to look away as he set upon their would-be killers with those deadly daggers and began the slaughter in earnest. He looked like a sledgehammer in red and silver, brawling his way to victory with the savage swings of his arms. Slipping through shields and shunting aside swords as though they were made of wood, he ended 2 men before the remaining 3 realized what was happening and managed to regroup. But by then it was already too late. Arwen had watched Naruto for an entire month now and she knew these 3 were dead. It was a simple matter of skill. These 3 were already dead. All that remained was to make it happen. The first, a Dunmer, tried to snap off a bolt of lightning in her direction, his first and last mistake. Naruto's reaction was as subtle as it was immediate. He flung 2 fingers forward, snaring the deadly current upon his fingertips. Then, even as the ex-mage balked at this sudden turnabout, Naruto flung it back at him with gusto. Poor Sod didn't even have time to scream before the jagged line of energy opened a hole in his chest. The second, a lightly armored Khajiit, sought to use the moment to pounce. His cat-like reflexes garnered him a chakra-enhanced knee in its abdomen. The tremendous blow from the shinobi shattered its needle-like teeth into dozens of pieces, the sound not unlike hurling a cheap wine glass into a brick wall. Continuing his momentum, he rode the broken-faced beast down until it heavily crunched onto its back. The cat fought to draw in breath despite Naruto's armored knee ramming into his chest, but the miserable thing only succeeded in sucking its own broken fangs into its throat. Naruto didn't give it a chance to choke on them. Rasengan in hand, he brought his palm down and ended the Khajiit's suffering in swift succession. The last, a Breton woman, threw down her weapons and began to beg. But to no avail. A knife to the gullet sought to end her pitiful diatribe, but she managed to twist aside at the last instant. It was in that instant that Arwen acted, drawing upon her magicka and bending it to her will. Ice. She enforced the directive upon the boundless energy surging through her small form. Spike. Just like that the woman toppled over, dead. Never knowing what had ended her, yet cold and deceased all the same. It was not her first kill, all things considered. Deep blue eyes cut to her, the only acknowledgement of her action. It was subtle things like this, body language, that allowed them to converse without going mad. In those eyes she read approval, and yet at the same time also sorrow. He did not wish to expose her to such things, and it saddened him that she was forced to hone her skills in such perilous conditions. Naruto Papa could have done without her help just now, just as he could have dropped her back in Dawn Star, but Arwen knew, just as she knew as he reached down to tussle her hair, she would never leave him. Nor he, her. After all, Naruto was Papa. She wouldn't have it any other way. Naruto glanced down at the map, then back the monument again, his winter furs ruffling softly in the breeze. He risked a glance down at his charge. Despite his offer to carry her, the little half-elf had been adamant to follow him on her own up the mountain. It was almost humorous seeing her struggle through the snow. Although they still expressed difficulty understanding one another, there were such things as silent communication even in this era. But even a means of communing meant nothing when it came to the blonde's sense of direction. He'd been headed for Marthal in search of the shrine, but now found himself on the fringes of Winterhold. They'd encountered bandits and all manner of beasts and natural disasters, but still, until this very moment, he had thought himself hopelessly lost. But no longer. They'd been headed in the right direction all along. Because there it was. The shrine. The cold nipped at this nose, threatening to gnaw it off if he didn't keep moving. Arwen was faring even worse. Sprightly little thing that she was. She'd been struggling after him for what felt like an eternity, refusing to leave despite knowing Winterhold was only a few miles in an opposite direction. Her determination was almost admirable. Like having a kid of your own, Kurama chortled. Despite the blizzard raging around them, the blonde flushed, his attention falling once more upon little Arwen. It was true that he'd come to think of her as more than just a stray over the last month. Many things had changed, and just his facial hair. Ga, who knew sporting a beard could be so damned itchy. But regardless, Arwen had become his ward of sorts. He'd even grown to care for her. "And Naruto," she whispered through chattering teeth, his name a silent plea for him to slow down. The blonde did more than that. With a sudden and about face, he trekked back towards her, reached down, and scooped the shivering elf into his arms, warming her with his strength in spite of her shivering. She squirmed a moment longer before finally recognizing the futility of her efforts, contenting herself to snuggle close to his warm chest and soak up as much heat as she possibly could. Arwen. He used her name to get the girl's attention, preventing her from squirming. She peered up at him from within her furry cloak, blue eyes petulant. Naruto flicked her in the nose, earning a harsh puff of steam from her mouth for his efforts. "Ba, ka." She stuck out her tongue in quiet defiance. Naruto resolutely ignored his ward and, still carrying her, returned his attention to the summit. A massive statue could be seen looming in the distance, carved in the likeness of a woman, offering up the sun and moon in benediction. Something flashed through his mind at the sight of her, this regal woman, draped in robes of stone. The shrine. Azora's shrine. By Kami, he managed to deny but blunder his way here after all. "Yep," he murmured. "This has gotta be it. If all went well today, he just might be able to shatter this infernal language barrier once and for all. Or not." He strode up the steps to the shrine with long, strong strides. In Hindi SGHT, he didn't make it very far. He'd only just cleared the stairwell itself before they saw the priestess kneeling before the shrine in silent benediction for her Daedric mistress. He'd just enough time to realize she was a dark elf before a thunderclap struck him, his entire world fading to black and gray. "Greetings, mortal." A familiar voice resounded in his mind. "I am pleased to see that you made it to my shrine safely. As is my sister, Nocturnal. She appears to have taken an unhealed interest in you and your continued progress. And you seem to have picked up a stray since I saw you last." Despite the trepidation Naruto felt, he clutched Arun tighter, managed a sarcastic smile. "I didn't come here for a critique. Azura. Quite the contrary." Her voice radiated amusement. "I approve. She suits you. But your journey is not yet over. Nay, it has only just begun. Come, speak to my priestess. She has a task for you. Once you have completed it, I will grant you that which you seek." The Dragonbane's deadpan was barely concealed. There's always a catch, isn't there? Which was how he found himself here, in Dim Hollow Crypt. The priestess, blessed with the gift of tongues for the duration of their conversation, had been deliberately vague in her description, but she'd suggested going to Winterhold all the same. Unfortunately, she, much like the Daedra herself, underestimated Naruto's inaptitude to follow directions. When told to go left, the blonde often went south. Should he need to veer right, he'd stick to the south. Perhaps it was the climate, or his inability to read a map. Perhaps he'd simply gone the other way solely out of spite. After all, he was nobody's errand boy. Whatever the case, he found himself standing before the entrance to the crypt, and he scented blood on the wind. Dead flesh. And something more. Something ancient, old, something. Vampires. Kurama gagged, disgust flaring through their bond. "I should have known they'd still exist in this era. You know what, I don't even want to know anymore." He'd left Arwen outside under the watchful gaze of no less than 3 shadow clones, promising to return. Granted, the girl could look after herself, but something told him that the threats lurking within this cave were beyond even her prodigious skills. Turns out he was right. The vampires of this era were every bit as real as the fox claimed, and just as deadly. But they died just as easily when you set them afire, as you shoved an errant kunai through their rotting hearts. Ironically, he found a survivor amidst the carnage, a human male near the entrance, beaten to within an inch of his life, face a bruised mass, eyes nearly swollen shut. He blanched at the strong smell of blood emanating from him. He didn't have long for this world. Despite all his lack of tact, he just couldn't find anything snarky to say about the man's sorry state. No one deserved to suffer like this. "He's got one foot in the grave. The observation didn't come as a surprise to him. "I can see that." "No, you don't. What are you talking about?" He froze, dreading what he might find. Yes, there, on the edge of his neck. 2 puncture wounds. Red and sore. Recent. Precise. Intentional. Only one conclusion: bite mark. Pale fingers wrapped around his wrist in a death grip. Naruto recoiled violently, half expecting the vigilant of Stendar to rear up and bare his fangs at him. When he failed to do so, the last shinobi allowed himself to relax, albeit marginally. The fingers were pale from blood loss, not from being turned. Not yet. Dark eyes peered up at him wildly, broken chest hitching with breath, bloody fourth working at the edges of his lips. That grip of his was iron tight, refusing to relinquish its hold despite and all, despite his struggles. The man did not release him. Instead he rasped out but 2 words. "Kill me." Impossibly, Naruto understood. It was as though here, in his last moment, the man's very soul was crying out to him. He wanted to die as a man, not a monster. Naruto quietly considered this for a moment before he'd felt his head nodding. With a solid push, he thrust the iron dagger through the unnamed vigilant's heart. The man shuddered once, a ghost of a smile waning upon his lips, then was no more. Naruto brushed his eyes close with a hand and stood, willing himself not to tremble at the man's resolve. "What are you going to do?" Kurama rumbled in question. "Ain't that obvious?" With a heavy heart, the Dragonbane set out to butcher. And done. Naruto resolutely ripped his kunai from the throat of the last vampire, thrusting its body off the blade with his boot. He had traveled deep into the crypt, encountered resistance both from natural denizens and intruders alike, fought his way to this very chamber. It was massive in scope, the center day unadorned save for a small platform and a series of braziers. But the former called to him, silently demanding a closer look. Naruto did something incredibly stupid just then. He decided to touch the spike rising from that platform. It stirred at his touch, prickling at his palm. Was it just him, or did the device seem colder, somehow? "Oi, I wouldn't touch that if I were you," almost as if. "Fuck," the shinobi hissed in pain and surprise as that deadly edge shot upward, impaling his hand, coating it in blood. With a pained growl he tore his hand free from the spike, just in time to witness a trickle of blood worm its way through the cracks of the mortal edifice. He was left staring at the gaping hole in his hand, silently swearing as the gaping orifice began to knit itself shut. Depulverized more than a few bones in his hand during its ascent, and as he'd learned, bones were a bitch to regenerate. Warned ya. Satisfaction swam within his tenant, prickling at him as the marrow set itself. "Oh, shut up," Naruto hissed, forcing himself not to cringe as each bone snapped back into place, fingers twitching as sensation swept back in. Within minutes the flesh had been mended, pink skin replacing the mottled and ragged tissue that had been the bane of his existence mere moments before. "You're a glutton for punishment, you know that?" Kurama chortled. "I tell you not to touch something and you touch it, I swear, it's shiny." "Hey, I take offense to that statement," the blonde chirruped. But the damned fox just wouldn't let the matter drop. "All I'm saying is..." Quiet, irate, he gave one of the nearby braziers a kick, unintentionally sending the steel sliding along the track to lock into place odd. He hadn't been able to move them beforehand. Not at all. Baffled, he booted another of the strange contraptions another nudge, this time sending it skidding to the south. Indeed, his blood had done more than just slick the gears. Something was stirring. Pure pillish light streamed outward, touching one of them and subsuming it in its ethereal glow. Beneath his feet, the floor began to rumble, a silent harbinger of end times to come. Naruto frowned. What in the world? Still the strange aura spread, the purple haze moving to surround him entirely. Unbidden, Naruto felt his eyes drawn to where he'd booted the first brazier, its liquid emanating a clear glow. A combination, then? What the hell? After a few minutes of fiddling with said braziers with varying degrees of success, the sage successfully did the unthinkable. He solved a puzzle for the first time in his life. He'd never really been one for riddle or a game when he was younger, but knowing that he'd successfully sussed out the brazier's purpose without breaking anything filled him with an inexplicable surge of pride. That was when all hell broke loose. The ground gave a sickening lurch, the entire chamber trembling. He looked on with morbid curiosity as the effects became clear to him. The strange liquid seeped into the ground, the stone itself rising then parting like the Red Sea. Daring to lay a hand upon it, he was startled to feel the stone shift at his touch, sliding backwards then inwards to offer up the contents within. He half expected gold or some sort to come pouring out. What he did not expect, however, was a woman. As in female. The fairer SX. Well, this was certainly unexpected. Dark hair framed a heart-shaped face, those ebony tresses eclipsing pale skin and ruby-red lips. Her attire was positively ancient, and yet she filled it out in all the right places. Beautiful. Dazzling. So many words lunged to the forefront of his mind, each clamoring for a foothold, each demanding his undivided attention. Uzumaki Naruto froze. There could be no other word for it. His brain simply ceased functioning for an instant. By the time it started to function again, she had begun to stir, life returning to her in slow, angry fits. Naruto blinked, idly wondering about the scroll perched upon her back. Ah! The young woman tumbled out of the sarcophagus and into his grasp, barely catching herself in time. She latched onto him almost immediately, pale hands clutching at him with surprising strength for one so slight. He held her for a moment, careful to support her weight with his. Her eyes fluttered open in that instant. Glowing red coals held him, not crimson like Kurama's, but a rubaceous bloody red. He lowered her slowly, helping to the floor when it became apparent she no longer needed his support. She lay there for a long moment, crouched tight to the masonry, crimson orbs shifting this way and that. Finally, they fixated upon him. "Where is? Who sent you here?" she murmured in soft, dulcet tones. "Nobody," he found himself replying. "I sort of blundered in here on my own." "Hey, wait." "Yes," another frown. "You can understand me?" "Of course I can understand you." She scoffed at him, as though it were the most obvious thing in the world. "It was your blood that broke the seals that were, well, sealing me." "Well, that makes this easier," Naruto murmured. Kurama hissed his agreement. "Convenient. I was expecting someone. Like me, at least," the you-named woman continued. "Oh, boy." He felt his fingers twitch toward a kunai, but managed to still himself. Barely. This lass had done nothing to attack him. Yet, if she did, she'd end up join her kin on the floor, dead for a second time. Her eyes strayed to his weapon, but no action was made on her part. As if she were waiting for him to collect himself. At length, he gathered his mind enough to speak. "Are you a vampire?" "Yes." The young woman folded both arms across her bosom, sniffing softly. "Isn't that obvious?" Naruto opened his mouth to protest, and promptly snapped it shut as he considered his answer to whomever this young woman was. She certainly wasn't any ordinary vampire. Her eyes were different, the way she held herself almost regally. There was no dread hunger in those orbs, only an idle curiosity, tempered by sorrows unseen and untold. Different, yes. But for better or worse. "Why were you locked away like this?" he found himself asking, resisting the impulse to simply end her here and now. "That's complicated," she replied, "and I'm not sure if I can totally trust you." "That did it." "Ahem, who just let you out of the coffin?" The blonde's deadpan was barely concealed. "I could have just left you in there, ya know. And believe me, I'm grateful." The vampire dithered a moment, considering. "It's just, we barely know each other. Would you trust me with all of your secrets?" Naruto's mind immediately strayed to Arwen, waiting for him outside the crypt. No, he probably wouldn't have trusted her. Sighing, the blonde created a cage bunchen and instantly dispelled it, relaying its information to the trio of clones still guarding her. Orders were orders, and they would now follow from a distance. He still didn't know what if any surprises this crypt had in store for them. He managed to claim a handle on his little ghost phobia for the time being, but he wasn't relishing the idea of facing more Draugr or Kami knew what else in this hell. Tisking, he created yet another clone and kept this one by his side, just in case. Better to be safe than sorry. The woman arched an eyebrow at his stunt. "What did you just do?" Naruto couldn't quite keep the smile from forming. Add that grin to that of his doppelganger, and you had quite the intimidating scene. "No secrets yet, remember?" Sarana stared at him for a long moment, torn somewhere between bemusement and outright disbelief. "Look," she relented at the last, "if you really want to know the whole story, help me get back to my family's home." When he made no move to interrupt, she reluctantly continued. "They used to live on an island to the west of Solitude, out past the banks. Castle Volkihar, if remember the name right. I would guess they still do." "Yeah, gonna have to say no to that." "What? Why?" "I'm not about to walk into a den of bloodsuckers, thank you very much." Just the thought of it made Naruto shudder. "You won't come to any harm, I promise. Look, lady." "Sarana." "Beg your pardon?" "My name is Sarana." The vampire corrected, steel in her gaze, flint in her tone. "And as I said, you won't be in any danger. Besides, you can just send that." Here her gaze did stray unto Naruto's clone. "With me if you really don't want to enter the castle. My father wouldn't dare harm you, I think. Your confidence is so reassuring." "Hey, I've been under for a few centuries, alright?" Sarana returned, accidentally exposing her fangs in her own agitation. "I'm trying to be civil here." She paused, suddenly realizing she didn't know his name. "Naruto." Sarana sighed at that, her blood-red lips quirking in the slightest of frowns. "Look, I know we got off on the wrong foot here. Try the W trying to ask for your help, here." She finished, exasperated. "I have absolutely no idea where I am, or how to get where I need to go." Her ruby-red orbs pleaded with his. "Please?" Naruto faltered a bit at that one, his resolve wavering in the face of her desperation. Kurama didn't share his feelings on the matter. "Shana. Kit, it'll just be for a few days, alright?" She's a vampire, and you're a demon fox. As far as monsters go, I'm not seeing the comparison here. Alright, he decided, I'll take you to this castle, wherever it is. Her eyes lit up at that, but still, he couldn't quite quell the niggling feeling of guilt in the pit of his stomach. Had he made the wrong decision just now? It remained to be seen, he realized. Until Arwen caught up with them, he could only fidget uncomfortably. Why'd I have the feeling this is going to come back and bite me in the ass? Literally, A.N. And there you have it, not my best take on the world of Skyrim, I know, but it is my first. And definitely one of the most amusing. As you can see, I took a sharp turn from the norm here, as Naruto blunders into Dim Hollow Crypt and meets Sarana. If you think his interactions with the Dragonborn were funny, you're going to love the next few chapters. Any ideas, folks? I'm more than willing to hear you out. Who knows what might happen? Chaos is set to ensue as of next chapter with Dangard, Daedra, and the Thieves Guild abound. I hope you're looking forward to it as much as I am, and of course, there's still so much more to come. The College of Winterhold, not to mention finding Isabel's mother and the Daedric weapons. Thieves Guild. The Companions. The Dark Brotherhood. And more. We'll finally get to see just what Dragonborn is up to during Naruto's adventures across the whole of Tamriel. As I said, I'm open to ideas. Look forward to it all, readers. So, in the Immortal Words Atlas review, would you kindly, and naturally, enjoy the previews? I'm sure you'll love them. Preview, Harkon sniffed irritably. And who is this rabble, Sarana? Naruto's grin would have put Akatosh to shame. Harkon, right? Indeed, and you are. Impossibly, his grin grew. Someone who's about to kick your ass 7 ways to Sunday. Naruto frowned, pausing on the threshold of his inner room as he stepped out. He'd finally found his way back to Whiterun after all this time, and was looking forward to nothing more than a long nap. With Arwen quiet and tucked into her bed, he was free to extend his senses to the full of his room. Farengar's recently endowed enchantment would work for a while yet until he tracked down the Star of Azura, and perhaps that was why he caught the slight creak of moving wood. Instantly alert, his eyes snapped down the stairs. The door was slightly ajar. He slammed it open, instantly sprinting to a hooded figure standing in front of his home. His weapon made its way to their neck, causing the person to go rigid against the blade. You have 3 seconds, he hissed in Japanese, infusing each word with anger, to explain what you're doing here, in my home, before I lop off your head. Please, stay your weapons, they said in a soft, raspy, yet soft voice. I mean you no harm. I was told the Dragonbane could be found here. Naruto frowned, reluctantly lowering his weapons and stepping back. The person turned, their hood hiding the majority of their features and their slate-colored skin. A Dunmer then. But her eyes were different. No, they were the color of amethyst, not the scarlet orbs for which her race was usually known. He drawled, you'd be right about that. Now, is there a reason you've broken into my house in the middle of the night? My name is Carlia. The dark elf introduced herself. And I desperately need your help, Dragonbane, choose. Unbroken at long last, winter had come to Skyrim in all its chilly glory. Snow long come down from the mountains crunched now heavily beneath their boots as they trekked west from Solitude, the steady fall of white impishly impeding their progress as they weaved their way through the woods and all those who inhabited it, dodging frostbite spiders and other, more dangerous creatures that would otherwise seek to do them ill. But for whatever reason, all but the most foolish of beast and bandies were sure to steer clear of the trio. Perhaps it was the scent of magic that lingered in the air around the little one. Perhaps it was the well-armored man, his body bristling with all manner of weaponry. Perhaps it was the pale-skinned woman with her dark hair, glistening crimson eyes, and sharp fangs. Wait a moment. Fangs? Whatever the case, a single, well-placed arrow to the knee was more than enough to dissuade any further attempts at curiosity. Woe to the foe who ambushed these fearsome 3. The lone highwayman who dared to try and accost them found himself staring at the pearly gates of Sovngarde. Most stayed clear of the troublesome trio after that one. This was a pleasant change of pace, Naruto thought, to know where he was going for once. Most pleasant indeed. Instead of wandering around the world as was often his wont in the past, he found that his guide and by definition Arwen and himself knew exactly where they were headed. Indeed, there had been no detour. Sarana proved to be an unfaltering compass when it came to direction. There was certainly something to be said about pure-blood vampire. Even as a creature of the night, Sarana was beauty personified. Her pale skin seemed to shimmer in the light of the setting sun, ruby-red eyes keen with intelligence and a dry wit. Her every step carried a brief, transient grace, one that transitioned to every part of her body, from the gentle, undulating sway of her hips carrying the Elder Scroll on her back, all the way up to her AAAAND. This, ladies and gentlemen, is why I need to stay away from females. He shook his head ruthlessly, dispelling the tantalizing image hanging before his eyes. By the 9, what was wrong with him? He was certain she wasn't charming him. He was immune to any such magic. Illusion and charm spells didn't affect him, so why, oh why, could he not stop staring at the swaying backside only a few feet ahead of him? It wasn't as though he was a green genin anymore, he knew full well what it meant to be attracted to a woman. His rough night with Ayla some weeks ago stood as fine example of what he thought of strange woman. That was different, though. Ayla was alive. Warm. Human. He'd felt her pulse when they'd made love, long into the nights. Perhaps that was it, then. On some instinctual level, did it bother him that he was attracted to this gorgeous creature of the night? Hey, I don't mind staring. Not with my eyes, you don't. No, that couldn't be it, he told himself. Vampire though she may be, Sarana was as a person. Her skin might be cold and she might dislike the sun, even going so far as to insist that they travel at night, but she was still his friend. He'd not have made it half as far without her guidance. And truth be told, he was beginning to enjoy her company. Hell, he'd even managed to get a smile out of her in the week that they'd spent traveling together. She was an amicable traveling companion of a sorts, not at all bad once you got to know her. Contrary to her imposed of silence, she'd broken down and started talking to him on the first night of their journey shortly after they'd made camp. It had also been the first time she'd taken his blood. Slow going aside, he was beginning to see and understand the strange company he kept. From a vampire who would rather travel at night than during the day, to the little half-elf with whom he had become so enamored. Speaking of which, Naruto, behind him, Arwen sniffed quietly, irate at being so long dismissed. Hey, I'm not ignoring you. He soothed at the little lass, smoothing her dark hair with his fingers, only to flinch slightly under the girl's smoldering stare. I'm just, focusing on the trail. Yes, that's it. He seized upon the words like a drowning man would an anvil thrown to him in a lake. And he sank like a stone. The trail. Nah, Ru, too. By the gods, how could one word his name no less express so much anger? And now Arwen, there's no need for too late. He only barely managed to duck as a tiny fireball whistled over his head, caroming off the damp trunk of a tree before soaring harmlessly into a snowdrift where it fizzled out. She may not be able to speak his language to properly convey her anger, but damn if she wasn't vocal in other ways. But if looks could kill, Naruto would have been a smoldering pile of ashes. Or a frozen iceberg. He really wasn't sure which anymore. His daughter seemed to improve daily now, that once tentative grasp on her magic's only a few shades short of being an outright adept when it came to sorcery. And as he'd begun to learn, Arwen wasn't above using her powers to express her displeasure at her father when he didn't pay attention to her. A finer lesson had never been learned. Keep the girl happy, and he got to keep his head. You are so whipped. Kurama snickered, those throaty chuckles reverberating through the halls of his mind, and by a little girl no less. I'm not, or so, as if to punctuate that statement, an ice spike flew over his head. Naruto yelped, more for comedic effect than anything else. If Arwen knew he could swat her spells out of the air, she was much more likely to call upon her more destructive arts. And that was something no one wanted. So if he had to play the fool to keep his daughter happy and smiling, then he would gladly pretend to be a jester for all the rest of his days. Strange, just how swiftly he had become bonded to this little terror. As though sensing this very thought, Sarana chuckled sensuously ahead of him. Having trouble? Naruto snorted audibly. Don't I know it? I could tell you what she's saying, if you'd like. She offered, those smoldering red irises half regarding him over his shoulder. What? Naruto whipped around so swiftly she could have sworn he left an afterimage in his wake. The hope in those eyes was so bright it was almost painful to look at, searing her so much like the sun's uninviting gaze, only she couldn't hope escape this stare. You mean, you can actually do that? Of course. The vampiress seemed to preen under his smoldering stare. I may have slumbered for a few centuries, but the language really hasn't changed all that much since. At the blonde's silence she feared she'd nearly given him an aneurysm. Before the thought had too much time to germinate, however, her musings were interrupted when his quiet voice hesitantly asked, "Will you?" There was such humility in those words. He was all but begging her to grant him his request. The notion was oddly enlightening. Perhaps he did have his serious side, after all. Very well. Sarana turned and piped a question to the little halfling, to which she chattered something that sounded a great deal not like an insult but rather, an affirmation. A delicate dark brow quirked and thinly veiled amusement masked only by the slight frown the woman now wore. She says she doesn't like it when Papa ignores her. A pause as the girl added something in her own language. She also wishes to be held. Naruto very nearly choked on his own spit. What, like a piggyback ride or something? Pretty much, came the confirmation. Well, tell her I'll consider it after she stops trying to impale me, he replied snarkily. Sarana glibly translated, and behind them, Arwen's scowl turned into an adorable, if not petulant, pout. You truly are a strange one, aren't you? You have no idea. HMMPH, she snorted, a rare smile slipping through her stoic facade. If you think you have family issues, just wait until you meet my father. Ah yes, Harkon. The insufferable be your father, and yet you're so nice. Are you sure you're not adopted, Sarah-chan? I just don't see the blood resemblance. Her resulting expression was almost enough to make the time traveler roll on the ground in sheer laughter. But the way her gaze lingered on him now, the longing in those eyes, oh dear. Speaking of blood, Naruto frowned, edging away from her. Oh no, don't you start that with me, I know that look. That look is nothing good. He had come to know one of its cousins very well over his time in Skyrim during his time with Lydia and the Dragonborn, and it was always would be associated with pain. More specifically, his pain. The pure smile only broadened, and the former shinobi slumped in defeat. I just know this is gonna come back to bite me. I don't know how, and I don't know when, but I just know it. Don't tell me, you're thirsty again, aren't you? He bemoaned. By the 9 Sarah-chan. I gave you blood this morning. It's not my fault, she protested, her voice peaking into a whimsical whine. You're very potent. I'm not even going to remark on what you just said. What? It's not like I star. There was a pregnant silence between them. Okay, so maybe I stepped into that one. Alright, just make it quick, Naruto sighed, pulling his cloak aside to expose the tan flesh of his neck to her wanting eyes. We don't have all day. It was either this, or allow her to defeat from Arwen. The alternative was unacceptable. That didn't mean he wanted to become a human blood bank anytime soon, however. Are you sure? Her eyes strayed toward his neck in wanting. Hey, regeneration, remember? Now that he'd resigned himself to being bitten again, his mind was as calm as the flat sea in the distance. Those crimson orbs widened slightly. He knew she must have been staring at his jugular. Because that tongue flitted out between her pale lips unbidden. She'd first started taking his blood only 2 days before at his own insistence, when it became apparent that she simply wouldn't be able to go without. Then she'd made the comment about his exquisite tasting blood yesterday. Something about it being irresistible. Already it seemed that she preferred it to that of the occasional bandit or misbegotten animal. Naruto almost pitied her dependence on the stuff. Really? He pitied himself, too, for allowing her to do this over and over again. Admit it. You enjoy this. I have no idea what you're talking about. Be still. She wrapped her arms around his neck with a pleased purr, burying her nost into the groove between his collarbone and shoulder. Naruto stiffened. He willed himself to be calm, nesting his face in her hair, enjoying the chill of her cool skin on his cheeks and the smell of her dark hair in his nostrils, her teeth brushing his skin. Chomp. Naruto shuddered out a raspy gasp as her fangs sank into his neck, her mouth instinctually seeking a vein and suckling from it like an infant from the teat. He wouldn't claim that Sarana's bites weren't pleasurable, but the sensation was just too strange for him to derive any enjoyment from it. She could drink from him for minutes on end and he'd be just fine, easily regenerating whatever blood or fluids he lost. They'd swiftly learned he was all but immune to the turning unless he wished it so. Otherwise anything she did to him was instinctually rejected by Kurama's presence on a physical scale. However, there was one aspect to being bitten that he still wasn't entirely prepared for. He'd fought it off 13 times now, twice each day and once this morning. Each time had proved even stronger than the last, an immutable hunger that stirred at the depths of his very bones, powerful enough to override common sense. Desire. He barely had time to feel Arwen's eyes on his back before the urge took him. Lust crashed over him in a wave for Sarana. He was struck by the consuming urge and utterly lost to it in an instant. He hadn't laid hand on a woman since Ayla back in Whiterun. That, coupled with the flaming desires her bites always provoked in him, finally overrode his better judgment. That settled it. He could take it no more. He wanted her. Here. Down on the ground. Her body laid bare in the moonlight. The tension had been building between them for the last 7 days, like the strings of a violin stretched taut. But no more. In that instant, something snapped. Naruto broke. Stop. Why? He hissed, eyes flashing scarlet and slitted. Why the hell do you do this to me? He shouldn't be doing this. Not with Arwen so close. But the moment she took her fangs from his neck, the wound sliding shut even as she shifted against him, he felt it coming on. He clung to her, clinging to her arms in a futile attempt to stave it off. But to no avail. Something deep and dark broke free within him, shattering its cage with fury and fire before swarming over him, wresting away control of his arms and legs. Stop. Almost before he knew it, her cool hand was there, cupping his cheek, cradling his whiskered face as though it were made of fine china. Sarana was certain that, were she still human, her heart would have been pounding out of her chest. As it were, she wore a subtle expression of shock on her face as she returned his gaze, her expression turning into something unrecognizable as she leaned in and pressed her lips to his. Stop. Her eyes danced, glinting with fear and confusion as his lips neared hers, touched hers. Stop. Naruto grabbed her by her blouse and pulled her towards the nearest tree, holding her there. She choked softly, eyes bleary as he sheared his lips from hers, his large body pinning her slight frame against the tree. Her breath misted out between them in short, tiny gasps, her pale skin slick with sweat, her hips bucked against him in silent need. In that instant she looked so vulnerable, he thought, so kissable. Stop. The words were his and his alone, Hoarse, rough, and ragged. Not here, not in front of Arwen. Sarana stared at him for a moment in dubious disbelief, her eyes still half-lidded from the pleasure of their kiss. At length, she blinked, following his intent gaze. The little girl wasn't even looking at them now, making it a poignant point to stare away from the two enamored adults, both of whom looked to be seconds away from shagging one another. Reluctantly she realized that whatever desires she'd been holding in check would not be welcomed so long as the young elfling was nearby. Were those tears glimmering in the young one's eyes? Ah, crap. Naruto, father figured that he was pulled away from her and went to Arwen's side the moment he saw them. Trembling, Sarana let him go. Even now she wanted to reach out and drag him back, claim his lips with hers. And that frightened her. He made her cold heart throb with desire, the dead organ pulsing with feelings she daren't give voice to. She watched him place Arwen on his shoulder and a pang of jealousy stabbed at her breast, a petty anger she didn't understand. What in oblivion was happening to her? She didn't even understand why she'd lost herself in the first place. Until now Naruto had been nothing more than an ear for her to talk off. Someone who would listen to her disdain for her father and her quiet fears of what the Elder Scroll might contain. She'd be the first to admit she'd found him attractive at first glance and he had excellent blood, but she had thought it to be a passing fancy. She did not love. She didn't even think herself capable of lust. It wasn't that she thought herself above those emotions, she just wasn't capable of them. Or so she'd thought. Why was this happening to her? How had those silent brushes against one another at camp led to this? The moment she'd laid her lips on his, it was as if a veil had been torn away from her eyes. She couldn't look at him and not be drawn in, and she liked it. Perhaps that was most terrifying of all. That was unexpected, he muttered, coming over to her at last. She purred softly, averting her eyes, staring studiously at the ground. Even then she swore at her. It seemed the youngling was jealous. Did she fear she'd take Naruto away from her, whisk him away to some destitute castle and make him hers? Perhaps. That wasn't very far from the truth. A vampire Naruto might never be, but Sarana couldn't deny that Thurkus had flamed the spark of attraction between the two of them. By the nine, what was she going to do about this? Harkon would sooner kill her than let her be with a mortal man, so why couldn't she stop trembling? Thankfully, however, his words jostled her. We should get going. Sarana blinked, shook herself. Yes, that would be wise. They continued the remainder of their journey in silence. Not a word was spoken between them. But he could feel it. Something had changed. The strange dynamic that they'd once had before was gone, replaced by an uneasy silence. It lasted until they reached the shore, until they finally saw the tiny wharf that was their destination. There it is, she pointed, indicating the small boat and the dock to which it was tethered. Sure enough, he could just see the vaguest outline of a castle in the distance. Sighing, Naruto bid them pile in and pushed the boat away from the wharf. Castle Volkihar was as dark as it was imposing, Naruto thought to himself. It certainly lived up to its name. High stone buttresses loomed up over their heads in silent defiance of modern architecture, stone gargoyles leering at them from the perches atop the bridge. An open and sprawling expanse, open and unthreatening, just daring them to cross and see what would happen. He half expected these brutal beasts to lurch to life as they had back in Dim Hollow Crypt and attack them on sight. Well, if they tried that again, they'd be getting a Bijudama to the face, the lot of them. But they didn't strike. Nay, their scowling faces remained unflinching in the face of his animosity. Even then, he could have swore the damned things were watching him. He kept one hand on Arwen and the other on a hilt, just in case. Sarana strode across with purpose, her pale visage betraying nothingness. Homie, isn't it? His deadpan was barely concealed. She turned, regarding him nervously. Hey, so, before we go in there, you'd like to profess your undying love for me? He muttered mutinously. What? If it was possible for a vampire to flush, Sarana would have been crimson. As it were, she spluttered helplessly, unable to meet his gaze. No, I wanted to thank you for getting me this far. But after we go in there, I'm going to go my own way for a while, I think. I know you'll probably want to kill everything in there, but I'm hoping you can show some more control than that. Unless, of course, she swiftly amended at his thunderous expression, my father does something stupid. Barring that, once we're inside, just keep quiet for a bit, and let me take the lead, please? The last word was a quiet, tender plea, one he reluctantly acquiesced to. Fine. Scarce had he spoken than the watchman crowed. Lady Sarana's back opened the gate. The portcullis rose, admitting them to the wide doors stretched beyond. Arwen whimpered from her place atop his shoulder, and there was such fear in her voice that he very nearly trembled himself. It was enough to make him pause and lay a hand upon the nearest wall. A faint sheen fled from his palm, taking the form of a Hiraishin seal. A quick escape, just in case. He only prayed he wouldn't have to use it. Naruto. Somehow, Naruto couldn't help but agree with her. As luck would or Murphy's Law would have it, guiding Sarana home did come back to bite him in the ass. Hard. Naruto had never thought to consider the consequences of entering a vampire's den, but as he saw all the eyes following him, tracking his very movement, he realized something. He couldn't fight this many. Not in this form. Not when he had to protect Arwen. If things went south, and they very well might, there was a very real possibility that he might have to resort to the imperfect cloak if he wanted to get out of this alive. Oh, joy. How dare you trespass here? Wait. Sarana? Is that truly you? I cannot believe my eyes. Before Naruto could think to stop him, one of them darted toward the balcony in a flurry, shouting, "My lord! Everyone, Sarana has returned. She has returned, I say." Vampire and shinobi exchanged a glance. "I guess I'm expected," she said in lieu of translation, starting down the stairwell ahead of him. Naruto made to follow her, only to find his path blockaded by the man from earlier. He didn't understand a word the fellow said, but it was more than enough to see what he intended. And then his gaze strayed toward Arwen, those dark eyes shimmering with hunger as they alighted upon the child's pale flesh. Naruto really couldn't be blamed for what happened next. Really, he couldn't. No one threatened his little girl. No one. He let Kurama's chakra flood him, fill him to the brim, revealing the monster beneath. Sapphire felt a scarlet, rounded pupils become slitted, his features darkening in apocalyptic anger. Then he hissed, focusing the full weight of his malevolence upon the poor fool who dared to bar his path. It was priceless, really. The man, whomever he was, didn't stand a chance. One moment he was eyeing Arwen like a piece of meat. The next he toppled backwards, foaming at the mouth. Naruto quietly stepped over his slumbering form, carefully keeping Arwen within arm's reach. None of the others dared to SOTP him. "My long-lost daughter returns at last." A rich, cultured voice called to them from across the hall as he descended the steps. "I trust you have my Elder Scroll?" Naruto instantly disliked the man. Hearing about Harkon and his misdeeds was one thing. Meeting him was another entirely. He wasn't quite sure how he could understand the man by the blood, perhaps. But whatever the case, he felt his blood boil at the sound of that distinctive speak. Anger instinctively simmered within him even as he moved to stand by Sarana's side, his eyes trapped on the corpses lining the tables, bodies upon which they were feasting. Human bodies. Arwen gulped and sought shelter behind his leg. In the blonde's mind, he traced the Hiraishin seal, ready for fight or flight at a moment's notice. A memory plucked at him just then. Hadn't he made a Hiraishin seal back in Whiterun? On his and Isabel's house? He wasn't entirely certain, but he could feel the presence of another, more distant seal. Perhaps that would be wiser to flash to, in case the vampires swarmed after him once he reached the doors. "After all these years, that's the first thing you ask me?" By the time he came back to himself, Sarana looked to be on the verge of spitting. "Yes, I have the scroll." "Can you kill him?" The thought that popped into Naruto's head was, unsurprisingly, not his own. Telepathy? Well, that was a new one. "Can't say I mind, but why? Just do it." He could feel her resignation through the blood. "Quickly. Before I change my mind." He hasn't changed in the slightest. He's still obsessed with the prophecy I told you about. If he has his way, you know what will happen. "Fine, just look after Arwen." Harkon sniffed irritably. "Of course I'm delighted to see you, my daughter." Her father soothed at her, his words veritably dripping with faux emotion. "Must I really say the words aloud? Ah, if only your traitor mother were here. I would let her watch this reunion before putting her head on a spike." He paused then, as though only just becoming aware of the stranger standing at his daughter's side. "Now, tell me, who is this stranger you have brought into our hall? And why does he smell like a fox? Who is this child with him?" Naruto felt the hackles on the back of his neck rise as the vampire turned that cold gaze upon him. "This is my savior." Was it just him, or did Sarana seem to preen as she laid eyes upon him just then? "The one who freed me. He is. They are. Important to me." A dangerous smile pulled at Harkon's face. "For my daughter's safe return you have my gratitude, stranger. Tell me, what is your name?" They put Akatosh to shame. "I go by many titles in this world. I am a killer of men, slayer of dragons, butcher of bandits. And you are?" "I am Harkon, lord of this court." "I too go by many names." Oddly enough, the elder vampire seemed inclined to humor him, if only for a moment. But enough of this banter. "Who are you, truly?" Impossibly, his grin grew. "Someone who's about to kick your ass 7 ways to Sunday. By now, my daughter will have told you what we are." "Yeah, bunch of bloodsuckers." "Ah, but we are not just any vampires, we are the oldest and most powerful of." Naruto resolutely tuned the man out as he began his self-styled imposing rant. He had no interest in accepting this gift Harkon so espoused. He was already a monster of a different sort, one many times the match of any vampire. What need had he of becoming a lion amongst sheep, when he was already a demigod in human form? No, he liked the idea of being able to wait a second. Was he transforming? Vampires shouldn't be able to do that, even an ancient one? "Perhaps you still need convincing," Harkon scoffed, his body disappearing in a shroud of black blood, giving rise to a creature straight out of nightmare itself. "Behold the power!" the vampire lord roared. "This is the gift that I offer. Now, make your choice." "Well," Kurama murmured, genuinely at a loss for words, "that's new. There is no way in hell that I'm going to be that good. If you accepted that gift, I'd beat you black and blue." Naruto laughed then. It was a deep, throaty sound. "Why oh why would I want to become a vampire? When I can do this?" There was a moment of silence as his eyes flashed red and slitted. Then he became something more. Something else. One moment a man was standing there, the next he exploded in a torrent of energy, a being of cruel crimson tearing itself out of what had once been a human body. It was like no other beast he had ever seen in all his many years. 4 tails of sinister scarlet thrashed menacingly behind it, the open maw that was its jaw creaking wide to release the most sibilant of hisses, white eyes narrow and brimming with such bloodlust that the vampire lord within him actually quailed in fear, shrinking away from the brooding beast standing before him. And then it laughed. Somewhere in oblivion, Morlock Balg cackled with him. When the creature spoke, its voice was a deep, throaty rasp. "Let me show you a real monster, bub." A crimson arm whipped backwards, elongating like a whip. Something snapped and abruptly Harkon's mind, once calm as a lake of glass, was left in complete and utter turmoil. Then wind was rushing past him, and the castle face was moving farther and farther away from that which had been the throne room. What? Had he not been inside? Mere moments before, he was falling, he realized. The creature had somehow blasted him right out of the castle and flung him to the shores below. That was his first and perhaps last thought before a spear of red struck him from on high, that giant claw swatting him to the earth as though he were no more than a hapless fly. Bone hit rock and shattered into 1,000 shivering shards. Senses became muted, in the crashing melody surrounding him, and this time the pain was chillingly familiar. It could numb anything ever felt before in its intensity. It sapped his strength like a merciless leech. It felt like he was being burned alive. Fire. He knew this pain. He was burning. It was the pain of death. The thought made him cold despite the night, and it was that allowed him to regain his sense of self in an experience that put even oblivion to shame. His fingers writhing helplessly around the gaping hole that had once been his chest and stomach. Even as he clambered to his feet and tried to dissolve into a swarm of bats, it was too late. The beast was already there, spearing down into him like a comet flung from on high. It grinned down at him with maddened mirth, taking hold of his wings and shearing them off like they were so much paper, cackling as his victim screamed in agony. In moments his legs joined the wings on the ground, still twitching in gory viscera. "What's wrong?" Naruto rumbled down at him. "I thought you said you were powerful. All I see is a weak old man cowering in a castle." "You, impudent little gaw." Trying to drain life out of the creature only brought him more pain. Whatever this abomination was made of only made his wounds burn even further. Wait. Something wasn't right. His entire body was burning now, all of him despite his best attempts to heal. He couldn't even sustain his transformation. The power deserting him as the creature continued to claw at him. What madness was this? Where was his strength? His power? It was gone. Stolen? Wrested away from him? "Do you know," the beast began amicably, taking hold of his shoulders angrily, "what the boiling point of water is? 100 degrees Celsius. That's when it starts to boil. Any higher and it begins to evaporate. That includes blood, of course, you see, but as a vampire, I'm sure you can appreciate the meaning behind that." Harkon choked out a rasping gasp of pure agony, words themselves beyond him as his body's internal temperature continued to rise, slowly boiling the undead lord from within. Hellish didn't even begin to describe this torture. It put all of the Daedric lords to shame. "It hurts." The beast's grin became just large enough to be seen as predatory. "Yes, that's perfect. That's the look. I find that pain is the best teacher, don't you agree?" Harkon growled and tried to snap at him with his fangs, trying to at least maim him. The fox scowled and took in arms in recompense for his temerity. "Now, you die," it rumbled. Harkon's pained glazed gaze sought out the bridge, where none of his followers stood. Had they abandoned him, or had the beast above him cut them down like so much cattle? He didn't know. Didn't care. All he saw was one, a lone figure standing there, framed in the moonlight. A young girl lay cradled in her arms, a hand pressed over the child's eyes and safeguarding her from any and all harm. "Sarana." Imploringly, he stretched out a battered hand towards his progeny, hoping, pleading for her to come to his aid. "Sarana. My child," he choked out, blood frothing at his lips, "help me." His daughter stood there a long moment, pretending to consider. Then she did the unthinkable. She turned her back on him. She walked away. He was forced to watch helpless as she left him there to die the death of a coward, powerless, when the creature's burning claws descended upon his head. And that was when he knew. There would be no timely intervention on the part of Morlock Bal. No intervention from outside forces. Dread agony filled him as the claws shore into his neck, slowly, painfully ending his life. All his plans, the prophecy, made for naught. Nothing could save him. Naruto stood with a gasp. the cloak deserting him to expose his scorched skin. Angry growls and snarls filled the night, the sound of irate vampires already reaching his ears. Tugging on the seal he'd first planted upon the gate, he flashed up to the bridge, where a baffled Sarana and Arwen awaited him. The latter squirmed into his arms the moment she saw him, uncaring for his burned body. "Naruto. You actually did it. You actually killed him," Sarana gawped, frowning only when she recognized the horde of angry vampires come to swarm around them. "I hope you have a backup plan, though." Naruto blanched. That's our cue, exit stage left." He grabbed hold of Sarana and Arwen, flinging his mind out the marker and releasing himself to the pull. There was no time for thought, only action. He gave himself to it, feeling time and space stretch around him in a blur of infinitesimal proportions, all the world dissolving in a yellow flash and then nothingness. Existence. Space and time unfolded violently around them, bodily ejecting the unlikely trio in Breeze home. Only moments thereafter, they landed in a tangle of shouts and limbs. Tumbling haphazardly amidst the renovated home, he soon realized the sudden explosion of movement very nearly sending Sarana to her doom in the warmth hearth as a whole. Naruto wasn't so lucky. Scarce had they landed then he bucked backwards, accidentally sending himself tumbling into the flames. "Hot!" The poor blonde yelped as his rear landed right on the hot coals, nearly searing through his pants. His pain was short-lived however, as a swift blast of cool air from Sarana chilled his burning backside. Isabel had upgraded the place a bit while he was away, it seemed. Likewise, little Arwen perked up the moment she laid eyes on their new home. Dark eyes glittered with excitement. The chaos her father had created back in the north all but forgotten in her eyes. Eschewing her hold on him and her confusion for joy, she took in her surroundings, realizing there was a child's room upstairs. She had a bed, an actual bed. All was forgiven in her eyes. Her squeal of delight was overshadowed only by Naruto's own groan. Gasping as he struggled to sit up, it was almost enough to make him smile, really. "Ow, okay. Kurama's chakra and Hirishin. Long distances. Bad idea," he hissed, clutching at his chest. He could feel the organ pounding heavily behind his heart, threatening to burst open at any moment. Using the duo in such close tandem had very nearly been the death of him. He may very well be able to travel long distance using the Hirishin, but to use it in Kurama's chakra in the same vein, at the same time. Certain elements were not meant to mix, he supposed. "Cozy little place you have here," Sarana mused, sidling up to him, eyeing the warm hearth appreciatively. "It'll do, I suppose." Her lips graced his cheek on a sudden, a chaste kiss lingering on his whiskered visage. Naruto's head snapped around with enough force to give himself whiplash. He was suddenly reminded of their scorching liplock only hours before. Ramen above, he'd have to do something about that. "Wait, what, Naruto?" Arwen bolted down the steps with a gleeful giggle, taking hold of his hands and tugging him up. "Naruto, Naruto, Naruto." There was a bit of bouncing involved. A great deal of bouncing. She chattered at him excitedly, forgetting in her delight that the blonde couldn't understand a word she was saying. Yet again he was all too painfully reminded that he couldn't understand his own adoptive daughter without translation or aid from Sarana. It galled him. To not be able to speak with her, not express the joy of this moment. It hurt. All he could do was nod and try to be happy for her, wait until she'd tired herself out. "She really is fond of you," Sarana mused, no kidding. By the time he'd finally tucked her in and laid her pretty little head to rest, he'd made up his mind. "That's it, I'm going to see Farengar." Naruto was back. Ayla could smell it in the air, even taste it in these subtle eddies of power that filled the evening, a heady, familiar scent that sent her blood tingling with unrestrained warmth. It had been many months since she'd seen him last. She'd since assumed that he had gone his own way, as most travelers often did. She'd thought him to be long gone, vanishing out into the plains, like so many other warriors, never to be seen again. So many visited Whiterun, only to seek their fate and fortune elsewhere. But he hadn't. His return had been enough to wake her from her dreams. Like a thunderclap in the night. If she weren't so damnably ill and weary, she would have fled the hall of Jorvaskr and leapt into his arms without so much as even a second thought. As it were, she was too weary, the state of her once strong body too frail to even consider the notion. She was certain it would pass, given time, but by wise grammar, she swore she would have him take responsibility for the hell she'd been through in his absence. He would be shocked, of that much she was certain, but perhaps she was looking forward to that. Sighing, the huntress resigned herself to slumber, and for all her pent-up anger and aggression, it came quite swiftly. She'd be paying him a visit on the morrow, that much was certain. Achoo! Naruto frowned, pausing on the threshold of his inner room as he stepped out. Every fiber of his body ached. Traveling long distance with the Hirishin had put a monumental strain on his body as a whole, tearing both his muscles and rending bone as well as taxing his reserves to their limits. He'd borne all of the burden himself, sparing Sarana and Arwen any of the discomforting effects of being flung from the north of Tamriel back to the center. all in less than an instant. Having thus enabled Ferengar to place a temporary speech enchantment on him for the time being, he was looking forward to nothing more than a long nap after his arduous journey. With Arwen quietly tucked into bed and Sarana roaming, he was free to extend his senses to the full of this room. Ferengar's recently endowed enchantment would work for a while yet until he tracked down the Star of Azura, and perhaps that was why he caught the slight creak of moving wood. Instantly alert, his eyes snapped down the stairs. The door was slightly ajar. He slammed it open, instantly sprinting to a hooded figure standing in front of his home. His weapon made its way to their neck, causing the person to go rigid against the blade. "You have 3 seconds, he hissed in Japanese, infusing each word with anger and wrath, "to explain what you're doing here, in my home, before I lop off your pretty little head." "Please, stay your weapons," they said in a soft, raspy, yet soft voice. "I mean you no harm. I was told the Dragonbane could be found here." Naruto frowned, reluctantly lowering his weapons and stepping back. The person turned, their hood hiding the majority of their features and their slate-colored skin. A Dunmer then. But her eyes were different. No, they were the color of amethyst, not the scarlet orbs for which her race was usually known. Fascinating. If only she hadn't broken into his house. He drawled, "You'd be right about that. Now, is there a reason you've broken into my home in the middle of the night?" "My name is Carlia." The dark elf introduced herself gently, "and I desperately need your help, Dragonbane." "Yeah, I'm kind of tapped out on favors at the moment." The blonde deadpanned. "Who sent you, anyway?" "My Lady Nocturnal informed me that I would find you here," she admitted, appropriately chastised. "And you thought it would be a good idea to break into our home? Threaten our family?" Sarana was suddenly at his side, a ghost in the night, standing at his elbow. Her red eyes shone with a rare emotion. Anger brimming in those smoldering crimson orbs. Wrath and fury. Fangs stood bared in a scathing hiss, promising pain if she wasn't answered promptly. Carlia bristled only slightly at the sight of the Nightwalker before her. Sapphire eyes cutting back to Naruto nervously. The blonde, however, blinked. Not at what his Sarana had said. He didn't mind the idea of her considering them to be family, but at Carlia's earlier words. Nocturnal. He vaguely recalled Azura mentioning her sibling on the mountaintop. Something about a sister deity. Well, this complicated things. Maybe you should start from the beginning. And there you have it. Not my best take on the world of Skyrim, I know, but it is my first. And definitely one of the most amusing. As you can see, I took a sharp turn from the norm here, as Naruto has ended Harkon, claimed Sarana, made his way back to Whiterun, only to find even more trouble awaiting him at every turn. And, what business is this with Ayla? If you think his interactions with the Dragonborn were funny, you're going to love the next few chapters. Any ideas, folks? I'm more than willing to hear you out. Who knows what might happen? Thieves Guild next chappy. Here we go. Chaos is set to ensue as of next chapter with more Dangard, Daedra, and the Thieves Guild abound and galore. Let's not forget the College of Winterhold. I hope you're looking forward to it as much as I am. And of soon much more to come. The College of Winterhold, not to mention finding Isabel's mother and the Daedric weapons. Thieves Guild. The Companions. The Dark Brotherhood. And more. We'll finally get to see just what Dragonborn is up to during Naruto's adventures across the whole of Tamriel. As I said, I'm open to ideas. Look forward to it all, readers. So, in the immortal words Atlas. Review, would you kindly, and naturally, enjoy the preview? I'm sure you'll love it. Preview. Oof, Naruto grunted, the air rushing out of him in a mighty oomph as someone in heavy steel plate slammed into him with all the force of a mammoth, almost bowling him head over heels. He very nearly slipped on the 7,000 steps leading up to High Hrothgar, nearly took an angry tumble down the mountain before righting himself at the last instant. Then his sword snapped up, caroming harmlessly of a hardened shield even as it swung at his head. Metal clashed against metal, the ebony blade grinding angrily against the nigh impenetrable shield. However, that left him with a free hand. Even as she swung down at him with her blade, so too did he swing upwards, the Rasengan smashing his foe full in the chest, shattering the breastplate like so much glass. An indignant shout graced his ears, as the spiraling sphere dashed her body against the mountainside. He thought he was prepared for that much. He was not, however, prepared for her to stand up again. "You insufferable bastard." Naruto balked. Oh, he knew that voice. "By sure, you never make things easy, do you? Just look what you've done to my armor." She tore off her helmet with an angry shriek, glaring emerald daggers at him. With the language barrier now torn away by the power of Asura, that voice was possibly the most beautiful thing he'd ever heard in all creation. It also terrified him beyond belief. "Naruto, Isabel. Wait, I did what?" Verboc Naruto exhaled softly into the morning, his breath momentarily causing the flames of their hearth to flicker, ever so slightly. "So let me get this straight," he murmured to himself in Japanese, quietly pinching the brow of his nose in a vain attempt to stem off his aggravation. Well, wow. Sorry. It's just a lot to take in. Is it just me or are all the guilds here royally fucked up? He was seriously beginning to think that. Between the dread ways of the Dark Brotherhood and the treachery of the Thieves' Guild, everyone short of the companions seemed to be steeped in bloody and foulness. And even they were a touch on the violent side. Not that he cared, mind you, it was just startling to resonate with him that this place wasn't so different from his home. Naruto. Arwen uttered his name imperiously from her perch, nestled in his lap. It was a quiet demand, one he recognized even with the language barrier still firmly between them. Almost absent-mindedly he reached down to stroke the girl's head. She purred like a contented kitten, her pale face glinting in the early light of the sun. The sight was almost enough to make him laugh. It reminded him just how far he'd come over these last few months. For all his gripes about being flung through space and time, he was making a real impact here. Arwen stood as a stark example to that. She wouldn't have survived if not for him. Hate to interrupt your musing there, kid, but she's staring. Right. Best to get down to business. Back to what I was saying. He replied, bright eyes fixing Carlia with their piercing gaze once more. So Mercer Frey basically killed the man you loved, screwed you to hell and back, took the guild over and made all of your guild mates think you were the one behind the death of Gallus. The dark elf just stared at him with those mournful blue eyes, uncomprehend ng. Oh, right. He bit back a sigh of his own. The spell must have finally worn off. She couldn't understand him anymore. Sarana? He turned, glancing at the ebon-haired woman. She gave him a look of her own, pausing in her drink of tea. It was actually a cup of distilled blood, but he didn't feel like explaining that to Carlia. They had enough trouble without revealing the presence of another immortal in Whiterun. Thankfully, said Vamp was quick to provide a translation for what he just said. Basically, he's willing to help, or not. Hey, now, I didn't say. But he has one condition, she continued. Star first, guild second. He can help you after we get rid of this damned language barrier. Sarana, will you just star? Carlia blinked. You wouldn't happen to be referring to Azora's star, perchance? Sarana provided a translation. Yeah, why? A hand dipped into her pouch. My dark lady said that this item might be of use to you. Withdrawing her arm, she revealed the item in question. Arwen gasped. Sarana swore in the ancient tongue. Naruto found himself looking at Azora's star. Broken and battered, weathered and worn down, yes, but still very much the item he'd been seeking for all these months. Carlia offered it to him without want of reward or repayment, her dark hands briefly lingering over his as she pressed it into his palms. Naruto could have danced with glee. As it were, he settled for grabbing her hands and giving them a firm squeeze. Even with the stark language barrier burning between them, she could see the joy dancing in those pools. Hear the enthusiasm in his words. Arigato. Carlia went red. She could feel her face burning as she hurriedly looked away and desperately tried to formulate a coherent sentence. Beg your pardon? He says thanks, Sarana replied with a bemused smile. Indeed. Carlia nodded and tested her knee yet again, the one Naruto had nearly shattered last night. This time she was able to stand without any pain at all, to which she breathed a sigh of relief. All that remains is for you to purify it at her shrine. She nodded at both of them, trying not to let her eyes linger too long on Naruto, who was looking at her intensely. There was a fire in those eyes now, one that threatened to strip up a host of emotions long since buried. Her mind inadvertently bristled. Down, girl. Focus on the mission and not the eye candy. Yosh. Without warning he let go of her hands and jerked to his feet, nudging Arwen off his lap and into Sarana's arms. Whatever else he said was too rapid for her to comprehend, not that she would have had the chance anyway, and then he vanished in a flash of yellow light. Gone. Carlia blinked, expecting a spell of some sort, but no, he was well and truly gone. Sarana offered a bemused smile at her confusion. That did precious little to soothe the thief herself. Had he used an invisibility spell? Was this an illusion of some sort? Her mind conjured up countless answers, none of which made sense. Blinking she rose, searching for any sign of him. None was to be found. Where did he? Wait for it. Sarana held up a hand, forestalling the inquiry. Seconds passed. Minutes. Carlia frowned. I don't see what we need to wait for. Ooh, that is so much better. By the dark lady? A very unladylike yelp leapt from her lips as Naruto flashed back into existence less than a foot away from her face. What foul sorcery was this? She started backward and would have fallen backwards into the fire had he not caught her arm at the last instant. He tugged her forward gently, and she spun into his chest. Strong arms steadied her. Blue eyes met blue. Her heart skipped 1, 2, 3 beats. Hello. Was all Carlia could try to say, all she could manage as she stared up into those deep, sapphire blue orbs. Hello yourself, milady. When he spoke now it was in the common tongue, his every word was made known to his ears. She shivered, her lips parted to speak. Naruto, the blonde, jolted away from her with an explosive oomph of a sound, his voice dissolving into laughter as Arwen cannoned into him. very nearly spearing him to the floor in her enthusiasm. She chattered rapidly at him in Elvish and he responded immediately in the same tongue. Ah. Now she realized what had happened with the cleansing of Azora's star. What blessing had been bestowed upon the blonde. She had given him the gift of tongues. He probably knew almost every language there was to know in Skyrim and beyond at the moment. It only made the scene before her that much more heartwarming. You can talk. She came back to herself just as that delicate, bell-like chime of her Arwen's voice sounded once more. Watching him wrap the fair-skinned child up in his arms. More laughter followed. Further proof the horrible barrier between parent and child had been completely stripped away. She wasn't quite sure what events had conspired to bring the pair together, only that the child clearly saw him as a father figure. He was a kind and gentle soul, this Naruto. He really, truly did remind her of Gallus. A natural leader, one with a heart of gold. He'd make a fine nightingale. I could always talk, he grinned, mussing her hair. Ah, this is perfect, alright, so everyone can understand me. About time, Sarana muttered, smiling. I was getting tired of translating She sniffed suddenly, her nose curling in disgust. By the 9. What is that smell? Is there a wet dog outside or something? Once more, Carlia found herself at a loss for words. Smell? She didn't smell anything of the sort. Naruto inhaled. Hey, that smells like whatever else he might have said trailed off as a harsh thud echoed on the door to their home. Before anyone could think to answer it, that very same door flung itself open. Carlia started slightly, one hand straying to a knife in her belt almost without thinking. Was it possible Mercer had finally tracked her down? But no, it was a woman with fierce eyes and bright red hair, not Mercer Frey, that stood there framed in the door, one hand planted firmly on a shapely hip. Bright green orbs raked across everyone and settled upon Naruto. Well, she began sternly, hey, long time no see, huh? How've you been? Naruto was already halfway to the door by the time he realized something was wrong. Behind him, Sarana offered a faint hiss of her own, a sharp and hot exhale of breath. It seemed the ancient animosity between vampires and werewolves still persisted. He'd have to be careful to make sure the two didn't come to blows. Then he saw her stomach. Crap. For once, he and Kurama shared the same thought. To the untrained eye it wasn't very noticeable, at first. Had she been wearing her battle armor, he might have missed it altogether. But there outlined in the faint green tunic she wore it was utterly impossible not to notice. There was an unmistakable bump in her belly. He didn't need the Byakugan to know the truth of what he was looking at. Pregnant. Ayla was pregnant. That word threatened to stop his heart altogether. Dear Kami above and below. He'd gone and knocked her up. Naruto drew in a deep preparatory breath. Exhaled. Forced himself to look her in the eye. I suppose we do. He sputtered. Oh, Sarana connected the dots almost immediately. She looked at Naruto as though she wanted to melt into a puddle on the floor, her eyes wide and apologetic. I didn't mean to. Nah, it's good. He waved her off. Mind looking after Arwen and Carlia for a bit? His gaze strayed back to Ayla. We really do need to talk. Without so much as another word he walked outside, leaving the warrior to follow in his shadow. But not for long. Wordlessly, she matched his stride only a moment later, appearing at his elbow. He didn't protest when she moved to link an arm with him, though he had the distinct feeling she'd tear that arm off if he tried to move away. They walked together in silence for a long moment, leaving Naruto's home behind. A few passerby glanced at them but none dared to utter a word in Ayla's presence. She willfully led the blonde well past the bannered mare before turning a hard right and ascending a flight of steps. In almost no time at all she guided him to a bench. Dragging him down, she forced him to sit. Then, and only then, did she relinquish her hold upon his arm. Naruto could already feel the bruises forming. He was pleased to note, however, that the Elder Gleam had been restored to its former glory since he'd seen her last, her many branches rippling afresh with blossoms, offering them a semblance of shade from the noon heat. It seemed Isabel had been most busy after they'd parted ways. So, he began. Are you going to say anything, oof? The air rushed out of his lungs as her elbow sank into his unprotected stomach, doubling him over. All right. He gasped, massaging his stomach and straightening a moment later. I deserved that. Damn right you did. Huh? Kurama mused quietly, resting his head on a paw. I actually agree with her. Quiet, Baka Fox. It seems you found your tongue since I saw you last. Ayla said, quietly marveling at his newfound powers of speech. Your voice is deeper than I expected. Her gaze strayed to the star of Azura hanging around his neck, but if she was at all perturbed by the presence of the infinite soul gem, she did little to show it. Instead, she sniffed. This is all your fault, you know. Rather of fighting for honor in the fields, I'm stuck in Jorvaskr with this thing. She nudged her stomach quietly. All your fault. Naruto knew humor wasn't the appropriate response, but in that moment, he couldn't help himself. Oh, he gave her a crocodile grin. Weren't you the one who jumped my bones? Her pale cheeks colored. I seem to recall you were all too willing. Willing and more. An awkward silence stretched between them after that. At length, she exhaled. You're leaving again, aren't you? It wasn't a question. The pain in her voice made him cringe. Yeah, well, be more careful this time. Why the sudden interest in my well-being? He challenged. I just don't want? Ayla muttered something caustic in her native language. Naruto chuckled. That blessing really was handy. I just don't want to lose you. Idiot, she added almost as an afterthought. I'm not asking for marriage or anything, but I expect you to take responsibility for this, whelp. Of course. The reply seemed to catch her flat-footed. Oh, had she been expecting him to refuse her? You couldn't lose me if you tried. Naruto looked down into her beautiful jade green eyes and raised his other hand to her cheek, cradling her face in his hands like fine china. Then he decided that he'd push the advantage he had. Slowly and without breaking eye contact, he leaned down and pressed his lips against hers, finally getting the kiss that had been stolen earlier. Ayla seemed to melt into his embrace. He felt her wind both arms around his neck as she went up on tiptoe and kissed him back, her mouth opening against his as she groaned hungrily and pressed herself against him. He slid his hands down her body to her waist, pulling her tighter against him as she made another soft sound. It was a kiss that was every bit as mind-bendingly passionate as the one they'd shared all those nights ago, but there was also something warm and inviting in the kiss that made him wonder if his feelings for Ayla truly went well past that night of lust and physical attraction. Her lips were soft against his and her body firm. As the kiss deepened on, he felt her tongue slide sweetly against his like velvet. Even then he couldn't quite bring himself to stifle his moan of appreciation. He wanted more than just one kiss, so much more, but with the knowledge that they were in public, he restrained himself. Slowly he broke the lip lock and pulled away, tightening his hands on her waist to hold her steady as she lowered her heels back to the floor, her eyes dazed through the sudden passion of the kiss. She sucked in a breath and stared up at him in surprise, the look in those jaded eyes one that Naruto swore he would remember for the rest of his life. As she looked up at him, Ayla started to smile and her cheeks flushed with a different kind of heat than when she'd come in a few minutes ago. Desire. I hate you so much right now, she murmured. Reluctantly, she released her hold on his hand and allowed him to rise. Try not to die out there. Naruto laughed, darting down to give her a last lingering peck on the lips. She groaned. Now I really hate you. His response was decidedly cheeky. Love you, too. With that said, he took a long jaunt back to his home where the others were waiting. What followed next was a series of extensively long and terribly annoying quests. Decoding the journal was easy enough, thanks to his newly learned language of all things. From there, it snowballed. Worse still, as he learned, he'd be doing it without Arwen or Sarana to back him up. Carlia's quest soon led him to Riften. And ended deep under the ground. But hey, at least he got to steal a few things along the way. And there were other perks to it. So, this is the Nightingale armor. Naruto mused softly to himself as he held up the outfit. Yes, came the hesitant reply. Are you nervous? PFTF. He snorted. I got a giant demon trapped in my stomach. Hey, so I'm probably already going to hell. So I'll be keeping my soul regardless. Thank you very much. His words reverberated across the hall as they slipped out of their clothes and into the deadly-looking robes. At a glance, it was rather intimidating even when you weren't wearing it. Every inch of him seemed to be shrouded in shadow as he tugged everything on. Pants. Boots. Gloves. Not a single inch of skin was meant to be exposed. He felt like a shinobi again. Every inch of him seemed to blend with the shadows, as if they were but an extension of himself. The cowl and cape were a nice touch as well, he thought. He might just keep this as his default outfit. The blade was a nice touch, too. A weapon that leached life and stamina out of your victim and gave it to you instead. Fine sword, that. And here I thought orange was your favorite color. Hey, I can aid a dragon bane, Carlia said behind him. Thanks, I guess. This blade belonged to Gallus, you know, she continued. I pray that you fare better than he did. You didn't have to. Naruto turned, and caught a flash of ashen skin. The dark elf was still in the process of dressing herself, having already donned the lower half of the tunic and boots before pulling the rest. While her posterior would have normally drawn his attention, his gaze was instead drawn to her back, where a series of pale lines marred her shoulder blades, coiling down her back to disappear into the dark fabrics. It looked as though someone had taken a blade to her back. Several, in fact. Despite what he'd seen in his day, the sight of those old wounds made him wince. How'd you get those? Carlia turned her head at the inquiry, those violet eyes shining like gemstones in the gloom. She did not snap at him for seeing her nakedness, though an arm did curve to protect the modest swell of her breasts from view. A pregnant silence hung between the two of them, broken only by the sound of her soft breathing. This close, and with the cowl gone, there was nothing to restrain her hair. Those dark brown tresses seemed alive somehow, shifting in the swaying light. At last, when it became clear he wasn't going to let the matter drop, she relented with a sigh. When Mercer first framed me for the murder of Gallus, I was distraught. In my rage, I attacked him. As you can see, I did not escape unscathed. There was a beat of silence. What of yours? What about them? He turned, grinning impishly behind a mask of stoic severity. The dark elf sputtered. Bright eyes wandered, lingered on his chiseled torso. Naruto bit back a chuckle. Kurama had done much to heal him over the years, but he couldn't always rid him of the scars. His body was a latticework angry lines and other, uglier wounds. A memento of his years as a shinobi stared back at him in the mirror nearly every day. He still had the nasty divot in his chest where Sasuke's Chidori had nearly taken a lung, dozens of tinier spots in line where Haku's needles had pierced him, as well as other, more unsettling wounds. He'd expected them. What he didn't expect was the awe with which Carlia now spoke. How are you still alive? She murmured. Dunno. He shrugged. Lucky, I guess. Her face adopted an odd, pensive expression then, luck. We've each got our own scars, lass. Damn it. Naruto sighed and started tugging on the rest of the armor. Way to ruin the mood, old-timer. The blonde risked a glance briefly at Brynjolf, considering those words in the darkest depths of his being. The man was an ally now that they'd decoded the contents of Gala's journal and discovered Mercer's treachery, but he wasn't entirely sure he trusted him. Events were moving quickly now, spiraling toward the center. If someone had told him that he'd be making a pact with a second Daedric Lord in as many days, he would have been hard-pressed to believe them, but now. You'll get used to it. He heaved a soft sigh. Yes, because that is so much better. Come, she cut them off tersely, we must begin the ritual. Naruto watched Carlia walk towards the dais with her decidedly SXY hip-swinging stride, wondering if he'd just made things harder or easier on himself. The woman clearly had a chip on her shoulder with the death of Gallus hanging over her head, but she had never said anything about it. Until now. She wasn't seething with the desire to avenge him. Oh, no. That anger lay frozen under a lake of ice, beneath layer upon layer of frigid and numbing hatred. He hoped he wasn't encouraging her to do something that would turn her into a ruthless avenger like a certain uchiha. He'd seen enough lives destroyed because of petty hatred already. Damn, he shook his head. Focus. Gotta keep focused. Taking his place on the western reign, he waited for something to happen, anything. Carlia cleared her throat quietly and began to speak. Her arms spread wide and apart, her head tilted back to the cavernous ceiling stretching overhead. I call upon you, Lady Nocturnal, Queen of Murk and Empress of Shadow. Hear my voice. For a terrifying moment, there was silence. And then the darkness moved. Instead of a dark blue flame as one might have expected, a flock of crows emerged. Naruto stiffened, cold fingers of dread clamping down his spine, throttling him. One of those crows perched on his arm, and suddenly, someone was with them in the chamber. She was a woman of unmatchable beauty. Nocturnal was, pale skin glinting in the light summoned by her presence. Dark robes and long sleeves framed her flawless porcelain-skinned body, perked breasts and curves all captured completely despite the relative state of her undress. Dark, inhuman eyes roamed across them. Full lips quirked in a smile. Ah, Carlia. The dark mistress that was Nocturnal answered, her sultry voice echoing across the chamber. I was wondering when I'd hear from you again. Lose something, did we? My lady, the dark elf bowed, prostrating herself before the Daedric princess. She hadn't expected her to appear in person. I have come before you to throw myself upon your mercy and accept responsibility for my failure. Nocturnal frowned. You're already mine, Carlia. Your terms were struck long ago. What more could you possibly offer me now? I have two others that wish to transact the oath, and here she did gesture to Naruto and Brynjolf, to serve you both in life and death. You surprise me, Carlia. This offer is decidedly weighted in my favor. Ah, and I see you have brought me the Dragonbane. She drifted closer like a wraith in the murky cave, her feet not touching the floor. Those dark eyes roaming across him with an emotion that wasn't quite lust, but neither was it hunger. Most weighted indeed. Hey now, Naruto protested. I'm just doing this as a favor, once. I'm not so keen on selling my soul. I suppose I can make an exception for you. She sighed at last. You'll come to me soon enough, my nightingale. But what of you, Carlia? My appetite for Mercer's demise exceeds my craving for wealth, your grace, came the answer. Revenge, she purred, touching a finger to her lips in excitement. How interesting. Very well. The conditions are acceptable. You may proceed. Lady Nocturnal, we accept your terms. Carlia began solemnly. We dedicate ourselves to you as both your avengers and your sentinels. We will honor our agreement in this life and the next until your conditions have been met. At the apex of her chan, she and Brynjolf knelt before her, leaving Naruto stand alone before the Lady of the Night. Very well. Nocturnal nodded, sweeping an arm over them each in a strange semblance of knighting them. I name your initiates Nightingale, and I restore your status to the same, Carlia. And in the future, I suggest you refrain from disappointing me a second time. And as for you, Dragonbane, those full lips quirked in a smile. I look forward to speaking with you again. In a swirl of shadow she vanished. So, what now? he asked. Now, Carlia's voice is grim. Now we go after Mercer. Easier said than done, because Mercer Frey was a master swordsman. Even with the legendary eyes of the Falmer slowing him, he still proved himself a formidable foe. For all of 30 seconds, Naruto learned that the moment he crossed blade with the Master Thief. It wasn't the strength behind those blows that gave him pause, it was the artful mastery with which he wielded his twin swords. The slightest cut would sap at your strength, the tiniest opening and he'd gut you. Unfortunately for him, Naruto didn't play by the rules of the swords. He was also a good deal faster than even the most enhanced human. A feint and he was under the man's guard, driving his signature technique home in a devastating strike to the gut. Rasengan. Breath burst out of Mercer's lungs and staggered him. Remarkably, he didn't sail across the room. Fascinating. Some magical protection must have been involved. The Rasengan usually ground Histe. I wonder. You won't take me, the traitor shrieked, foaming at the mouth. Do you hear? I don't care who you are but you will not take me. Naruto growled as Mercer turned invisible moments later, vanishing before his eyes. Invisibility was always annoying, but not without flaws. Thankfully this rat's spell had caused Carlia and Brynjolf to be forced to fight one another and were focused completely on that. God, I haven't used this in ages. Wait, what are you? Oh? He could hear the thought slot home in the fox's skull. Clever. Why, thank you. Cracking his knuckles, the Dragon Eater brought his hands together and in a plume of smoke, gone was the form of the ninja and in his place was a nude busty blue-eyed blonde girl with outrageous curves. There were a few thin strands of smoke that left some parts of her body to the imagination, but not much. Her movements caused too much bouncing in all the right places. Mercer clamped his hands as blood shot out of his nose at the sight and crimson fluid gushed out from between his fingers. At the sight of the free-floating burst of red, Naruto smirked and lunged at it, driving the sword that once belonged to Gallus Desidenius into the still invisible thief, changing back as he did so. Mercer sputtered in quiet surprise as he started to choke on his own blood. Nam was his only thought. He felt his body grow cold and heavy and his vision faded to gray. He choked and sputtered, desperately trying to find one last breath, only for a savage wrench of the weapon to end that attempt. Naruto withdrew the sword from Mercer's body and the corpse toppled to the ground. On the plains of Oblivion, the Daedric Prince of Madness, Sheogorath, howled with laughter and fell over, clutching his sides as his ribs ached and he couldn't breathe. Ho! He liked this guy. Quite the hellion. He'd need to pester Azura for him, that was for sure. Back on the mortal plane, with an irking hand, Naruto, after digging through Mercer's stuff, called to Carlia. You two okay? I've got the key and both the eyes. As Carlia and Brynjolf, who now had control of themselves again, turned to their companion, a wave of magic issued from Mercer's body and the already crumbling chamber to shake as the old pipes were ripped apart, water gushing into the room. Brynjolf, the door, the dark elf shouted. The male thief slammed against it in an attempt to get it open, but the arcane blast must have damaged the already crumbling tunnels, because it wouldn't budge. Brynjolf and Carlia jumped down as the chamber started filling up with water, landing next to Naruto. As the water rose, and they started swimming to try and keep their heads above water, cursing that the enchantments on their nightingale armor didn't include the water-breathing alteration spell. But the chamber was filling up fast and they were literally running out of breathing room. As the liquid rose up past the head of the statue, they heard the sound of shifting stone and looked up in time to see a chunk of the roof fall away and the trio saw it lead to a caver and they could smell fresh air. Lady Luck, huh? She sure lived up to that name if you ask me, Naruto said, as they furiously swam to it. The three of them reached it and wrung the water from their attire and headed through the passage and found themselves standing atop an iced-over lake. As Naruto rubbed his arms against the chill, something pricked at the edge of his mind. Dragonbane. Naruto froze. That voice. This luminous presence settling upon his psyche. This ancient presence, bright and warm against his senses. As though he were staring into the twilight, all his world stilled, slowing to accommodate just the two of them. He knew it. Azura? Naruto asked apprehensively. The mother of the rose and queen of the night sky did not sound pleased. Naruto gulped. Do you have any idea what you just did? You got the attention of Sheogorath. Sheogorath. He's never going to let me have any peace, annoying bastard. Who the heck is this guy? Naruto yelped, Azura's anger frightening him. The Daedric Prince of Madness, Azura groaned, utterly insane and a complete nuisance. I wish you weren't so good at attracting the attention of the Lords of Oblivion. Well, tell him I only have one boss, namely you, and if he wants my help, he needs to beat the crazy out of himself first. Come to think of it, if he's such a pain, I'm sure the rest of you would be glad to help with literally beating the definition of sanity into him. Naruto told her. I see. Well then. We other Lords of Oblivion have wanted to beat him senseless for a long time now. My thanks, my champion, Azura said, sounding as though she were about to break out into a cackle. Then her tone suddenly shifted to being more serious. But all jesting and pleasantries aside, I have a few warnings for you, Naruto. First of which, beware of the vigilance of Stendar. They claim to serve the god of mercy, but are more like that Pain character before you reawakened his morality. They go after any of those viewed the way you were when you were younger. Vampires. Werewolves. Daedric champions. The Vigil offer them only the mercy and salvation of death. Naruto's thoughts turned to Sarana and he felt his protectiveness flare. He wasn't sure if he knew any werewolves, but if he did, it only gave him another reason to oppose these Vigil characters. Got it, and the other one? He asked Azura. This is important. The one who created the tyranny of the sun prophecy which that Harkon vampire was so obsessed with is still alive. Your daughter of Cold Harbor companion is at risk as long as this individual remains alive. Naruto nodded, while he didn't know what a daughter of Cold Harbor was, since the queen of the realm of Moonshadow mentioned Harkon, it had to do with Sarana. He wouldn't allow threats to his Yuru Ojo to exist, not a single one. Thank you for all this information, Azura. I'll deal with all these things, count on it, he said, then noticed the Dunmer looking at him. My boss lady was giving me a heads up. Azura made me her champion before any of the others even noticed I existed, like I told Nocturnal when we were going to take that oath. I was doing her a favor free of any form of charge because of her sister, he said with a shrug. Carlia nodded, her own mistress had been utterly delighted to gain something for free from the blonde. I understand. Thank you, Dragonbane. Now all that remains is to return the skeleton key to its rightful place in the Twilight Sepulchre. That's it, he tugged back his hood, frowning. That's it, she sounded hollow. Empty. The man who'd killed the love of her life was gone, and his body was rotting somewhere beneath them. Yet there was no relief in her eyes, only pain. Shaking his head, Naruto turned to follow her, whatever you say. And there you have it, Naruto X Carlia is a very real possibility here. Not my best take on the world of Skyrim, I know, but it is my first. And definitely one of the most amusing. As you can see, I took a sharp turn from the norm here, as Naruto is openly interacting with Carlia, trying to keep her off the path of vengeance, only to find even more trouble awaiting him at every turn. And what business is this with Ayla? If you think his interactions with the Dragonborn were funny, you're going to love the next few chapters. Any ideas, folks? I'm more than willing to hear you out. Who knows what might happen? College of Winterhold and High Hrothgar next chapter. Here we go. Chaos is set to ensue as of next chapter with more Dangard, Daedra, and the Thieves Guild abound and galore. Let's not forget the College of Winterhold. I hope you're looking forward to it as much as I am, and of course, there's still so much more to come. The College of Winterhold, not to mention finding Isabel's mother and the Daedric weapons. Thieves Guild. The Companions, the Dark Brotherhood, and more. We'll finally get to see just what Dragonborn is up to during Naruto's adventures across the whole. I'm open to ideas. Look forward to it all, readers. So, in the immortal words Atlas review, would you kindly, and naturally, enjoy the preview? I'm sure you'll love it. Preview. Oof, Naruto grunted, the air rushing out of him in a mighty oomph as someone in heavy steel plate slammed into him with all the force of a mammoth, almost bowling him head over heels. He very nearly slipped on the 7,000 steps leading up to High Hrothgar, nearly took an angry tumble down the mountain before righting himself at the last instant. Then his sword snapped up, caroming harmlessly of a hardened shield even as it swung at his head. Metal clashed against metal, the ebony blade grinding angrily against the nigh impenetrable shield. However, that left him with a free hand. Even as she swung down at him with her blade, so too did he swing upwards, the Rasengan smashing his foe full in the chest, shattering the breastplate like so much glass. An indignant shout graced his ears as the spiraling sphere dashed her body against the mountainside. He thought he was prepared for that much. He was not, however, prepared for her to stand up again. You insufferable bastard. Naruto balked. Oh, he knew that voice. By sure, you never make things easy, do you? Just look what you've done to my armor. She tore off her helmet with an angry shriek, glaring emerald daggers at him. With the language barrier now torn away by the power of Asura, that voice was possibly the most beautiful thing he'd ever heard in all creation. It also terrified him beyond belief. Naruto. Isabel. You impudent girl. Hey, why are you aiming at me? Naruto nimbly ducked as a spellbolt shot over his head, singing a few hairs in its passing. So much for the peaceful approach. Isabel had gone and said something foolish again, inadvertently angering the one who was supposed to be teaching her. That said woman looked remarkably like her was something he'd also commented on and gotten a fireball for his troubles. Isabel gathered herself up, prepared to zap the elder mage to oblivion and back, and then, just like that, she froze. Mother. Naruto glanced from one side to the other, baffled. Alright, I'm totally lost here.